A little under 2 years ago, I decided to delve into my channel backlog and pull out every single video I'd ever made about a hero of Greek mythology so I could stitch them together into a single feature-length director's cut, where I put them all into a rough timeline order, gave a little bit of bonus context, and potentially annotated anywhere it turned out I'd goofed up. It was an emotional hoist. I had 9 years of channel content to cover, and there was a pretty wide spread of quality in there, because I managed to somewhat improve my craft in that span of time, thank fuck for that, and it's always somewhat humbling to remind myself of what the best I could do used to look like. After all, I'm fallible, easily distracted, prone to slipping up on the details, and not always the best at showing my work. I see how far I am from perfect, and even as I improve as an artist and a storyteller, it feels like that gap continues to widen just the same. I am, like so many others, only human. But that's not the case for the protagonists of our tales today. Where the heroes of Greece were fallible mortal champions eking out a challenging living in a world far larger and grander than them, today we're gonna flip that coin over and take a look at the gods on the other side. After all, Greek mythology is inextricable from its pantheon, and the gods are arguably the most important characters of all, especially if you hear them tell it. And while the gods are less subject to linear time than the heroes they helped and harmed, there's still a timeline to be found in the misty golden ages of mythic yore. So today we're gonna supplicate ourselves before Apollo and the Muses and take a crack at compiling everything I've got on the gods themselves. And of course, where else to start but the very beginning? When it comes to gods, a family tree is the same thing as a cosmology, and Hesiod's Theogony is firmly supported by both columns A and B.
You know how urban fantasy writers really like doing that all myths are true thing, so they try really hard to find some way to make sense of every world mythology being real all at once? And how sometimes it works okay, but sometimes it just comes across as really busy and incoherent? Well, I'm gonna let you in on a little secret about Greek mythology. Hesiod did it first. See, Greek mythology isn't internally consistent, because no mythology is, but that didn't stop Greek writers like Hesiod, a contemporary of Homer and one of the earliest sources we have, from trying to make consolidated narratives out of every random regional myth they could get their hands on. In Hesiod's case, his efforts famously produced the Theogony, an attempt to outline the genealogy of every single Greek god. I'm not talking the Big 12 here, I mean all of them. You want to know the names of all 50 Nerites? All 3,000 Oceanid nymphs? Well, Hesiod maybe can't give you all 3,000, but he's more than happy to rattle off 41 of them. Ever wonder what specific combination of titanic boinking produced the Oneiroid, the Ash nymphs, the Hesperides? Well, don't you worry, Hesiod has it down. Everyone's got a place in the family tree. Everyone. So yeah, on a scale of 1 to American gods, Hesiod's ranking maybe a 3.5 on the actually making this interesting meter. That said, the Theogony is more than the world's most pompous flashcard set. Scattered haphazardly through its endless lists of meaningless names is a genuinely fascinating narrative of gods and monsters and the creation of the ancient Greek world we all know and love. So let's set aside the genealogical aspect for now and focus on the fun part, the ancient Greek creation myth. So, in the beginning there's nothing but chaos, a vague entity representing some sort of primordial emptiness pre-anything happening. But it's not alone for long, as soon enough Gaia, Tartarus, and Eros pop out of nowhere, representing the primordial earth, abyss, and existential concept of love, respectively. Chaos takes a cue and spoots out Erebos and Nyx, darkness and night respectively, and then I guess goes and takes a nap because that's the last we hear of it forever. While Nyx and Erebos are off bumping abstract concepts and creating the day-night cycle, Gaia crafts herself a partner, an equal and opposite in the form of Uranos, the sky to her earth. The two of them promptly get busy and crank out 3 sets of siblings, first 12 titans, then 3 cyclopses, and finally 3 hecatoncheires, ludicrously powerful giants with 50 heads and 100 arms each. Now the titans, cyclopses, and hecatoncheires have their differences, but they're united in their complete and utter hatred of Uranos for seemingly no reason at first, although it rapidly becomes justified when Uranos takes to imprisoning his more monstrous-looking children in secret locations under the earth. Gaia gets fed up with Uranos' shenanigans and comes up with a plan to knock him down a peg. She forges a sickle out of gray adamant and calls up her Titan children, asking them to help her take down Uranos so they can take his place ruling the universe. The Titans are a bit skittish, but the youngest, Kronos, Titan of the Harvest, accepts the task and ambushes Uranos, castrating him with the sickle. And in case you were wondering what happened to the balls, don't you worry! Hesiod's world-building rule is waste not, want not. They fall into the ocean and start foaming, and from that foam arises none other than the radiant Aphrodite, who presumably spent the next few millennia showering with a 1,000-yard stare. So Kronos supplants Uranos, and Uranos officially dubs him and his siblings Titans, which apparently means stretchers, the idea being that they stretched beyond their means in order to overthrow him. So this is officially when the Titan Age begins. Coincidentally, this is also around the time a whole bunch of death and destruction gods and classic monsters start popping out of the woodwork. So Kronos takes his sister Rhea as a wife, and they start cranking out kids. But Gaia and Uranos warn Kronos that he's fated to be overthrown overthrown by one of his children. So as a safety precaution, Kronos swallows each of his children as soon as they're born. Bit extreme, but I guess the god of safe contraceptive measures didn't exist yet. After losing Hestia, Demeter, Hera, Hades, and Poseidon to Kronos' exceedingly inefficient air disposal method, Rhea asks Gaia and Uranus for help keeping her sixth kid, Zeus, alive. And Gaia spirits the baby away to a secret location in the mountains while Rhea replaces him with a blanket-covered rock. So young Zeus is raised in secret by Gaia, and somewhere along the line decides the thing to do is supplant his father Kronos and take his place as ruler of the universe. So with the help of Metis, an Oceanid nymph with a serious talent for cunning plans, he slips Kronos a poison that causes him to throw up the kids he ate. Zeus, now allied with his 5 siblings, gives himself an additional edge by freeing the 3 Cyclopses from their prison, and in gratitude they forge him his lightning bolts. Zeus, now geared up with weapons and allies, rallies support from the frankly ridiculous number of minor gods running around at this point, and goes to war with the Titans. The conflict lasts for 10 straight years until Gaia suggests that Zeus could maybe free the Hecatoncheires too, and it turns out the ridiculously strong 50-headed, 100-handed rock-chucking giants were exactly what he needed to turn the tables and finally overthrow Kronos. Kronos and his allies are thrown into Tartarus, and Zeus takes his place as king of the cosmos, after a short interlude where he, Poseidon, and Hades draw lots to determine who exactly gets to lord over what bits of the universe. So Zeus marries Metis and she gets pregnant, but Zeus is warned by Gaia and Uranus that Metis is destined to bear thoughtful children more cunning than Zeus, first a daughter and then a son who will eventually overthrow him. Determined to stay super cool god emperor of everything forever, Zeus reacts by eating Metis, but not in like a murder way, in like a subsuming her essence into himself so she can provide him with wisdom and advice kind of way. Is that better? Still a huge dick move. Also really ironic considering Metis helped him overthrow Kronos by making him puke. Guess the lesson here is never do any favors for Zeus. In the meantime, Zeus marries Hera and she has Ares and Hephaestus. Then he has a fling with Leto that produces Artemis and Apollo, and then one day Zeus develops an absolutely splitting headache. And when he responds extremely literally by actually splitting his head open to relieve the pressure, Metis' daughter Athena pops out of his forehead fully grown and ready to kick some ass. Turns out absorbing your pregnant wife can have unforeseen medical consequences. Ask your doctor if absorbing your pregnant spouse is right for you. Side effects may include migraines, dizziness, and childbirth. Anyway, rounding out the Olympian roster, Zeus has a fling with the Pleiad Maia, producing Hermes, and lastly, a complicated fling with the mortal Semele, producing the equally complicated Dionysus. Zeus, having successfully dodged the destiny of being supplanted by his own kid by learning the lessons of history that his father failed to internalize, proceeds to flagrantly bang his way across the entire Mediterranean, secure in the knowledge that this could literally never go badly for him. Ever. Nope. Zeus's divine down-unders are a consequence-free zone. Except that one time where he had to specifically not bang Thetis because she was fated to bear a son stronger than his father. But other than that, no worries, right? Seriously, why keep tempting fate? Just bag it up if ruling the cosmos is so important to you.
Zeus's incorrigibility truly is the stuff of legend. More on that later. For now, the Theogony does a good job of laying out the divine family tree, but a family tree is really just a roadmap right now. There's a lot more detail to be found under every single one of these big names. And while time, and more specifically seniority, can be kinda hard to nail down with a posse of ageless immortal beings, Hesiod was at least pretty clear on one thing. After the children of the Titans overthrew their parents, the first of the new generation of gods was none other than Aphrodite. So that's as good a place to start as any. So I've talked about a lot of Greek myths on this channel, and I don't know if you guys have noticed, but Aphrodite kind of shows up in a lot of them. It's actually a little weird if you think about it. She's this fickle, temperamental force that just kind of shows up and causes chaos. She's a bit of a ditz who would literally murder people to maintain her OTPs and no-TPs. She's a doting mother, an unfaithful spouse, a benevolent boon granter, and a really sadistic punisher of perceived slights. She's confusing is what she is. What the heck is her deal? So before we go trekking through historical context to try and figure out why she's like this, let's put together everything we know about Aphrodite at this point. Aphrodite's most well-known birth story involves her spontaneously arising fully formed from the sea foam kicked up by Uranus' castrated balls and drifting ashore onto the island of Cythera, which she then made her home. It's generally agreed on that Aphrodite was never a child, as she represents adult love and sexuality, so she just spontaneously appears all grown up, which is good because the alternative is pretty gross. Grosser than the balls thing. Now first off, Aphrodite has a big role in the Iliad, as she's almost single-handedly responsible for kicking off the Trojan War. For those unfamiliar with the premise, Eris, the goddess of discord, gets pissed when she's not invited to Achilles' parents' wedding, so she hucks a golden apple at the Olympians and says it's for the hottest goddess. Aphrodite, Hera, and Athena got all hung up on the competition, and recognizing that there was no safe answer to that particular question, Zeus fobs the responsibility off on this random Trojan kid, Paris. The three goddesses appear at Paris and tell him to choose which of them is the fairest, and to sweeten the deal, each goddess also also offers him a gift/bribe. Hera offers to make him the ruler of all of Europe and Asia, Athena offers him wisdom and heckin' sweet battle tactics, and Aphrodite says she'll give him the most beautiful woman in the world. Paris picks the hot lady option, Aphrodite claims her prize, and gives Paris what she promised him, Helen of Troy, who happens to be married already to the volatile Spartan king Menelaus, and is additionally the subject of a giant tree ordering pretty much every Greek king under the sun to side with her husband if anything bad happens. So this divine kidnapping unsurprisingly kicks off the Trojan War and puts Hera and Athena firmly on the opposing side from Paris, which, let's be real, having the goddesses of rulership and battle tactics opposing you in a war is not a good thing. So at this point, Aphrodite has claimed a hottest trophy by throwing a cute couple together with no regard for the potential repercussions and kicked off a war as the direct result. Great, this portrays her as flighty and impulsive with a general disregard for consequence. Aphrodite plays Aphrodite may be a protective mother, but she's far from a loyal spouse. Though technically married to Hephaestus in most myths, she has a well-known habit of sleeping with Ares, because Hephaestus is all grody from having been thrown off Olympus and hitting every branch on the ugly tree on the way down. So Aphrodite's not big on marital responsibility. She also has a habit of taking mortal lovers she thinks are cute, which is how Aeneas happens. Aphrodite's terrible at managing her own relationships, but she does like helping other people with theirs. In the myths of both Pygmalion and Atalanta, Aphrodite responds to the prayers of a pining dude unlucky in love and blesses him with something to help him. In Atalanta's case, she gives Hippomenes the enchanted golden apples he uses to win the race, and in Pygmalion's case, she brings his statue waifu Galatea to life. But on the flip side, Aphrodite is really unhappy when people actively avoid relationships, which shows up most strongly in the myth of Hippolytus, a rare male hunter of Artemis who did the classic Artemis hunter thing of staying single and refusing to mingle. This pissed off Aphrodite so much that she made Hippolytus' stepmother Phaedra fall in love with him, and when he rejected her advances, she told his father Theseus he had assaulted her, then killed herself. Theseus calls in a favor from Poseidon and has Hippolytus killed in retribution. It's a really nasty situation. Now, there's a ton of myths about Aphrodite I haven't talked about, but they all generally fall into one of these categories. Aphrodite sleeps around, Aphrodite gets pissed and ruins someone's life, Aphrodite thinks a ship is cute and makes it canon no matter the consequences, and Aphrodite is a very overprotective mother. So now that we've got something of a concrete feel for where Aphrodite's character was at by the time of classical Greece, let's start talking about how she got that way. Now, like I talked about in the Dionysus video, before ancient Greece got going around the 700s BC, there were two major historical intervals that are relevant to this kind of thing. Mycenaean Greece between the 1600s and 1100s BC, and the post-Bronze Age collapsed Greek Dark Ages filling in the centuries in between. We don't have any written records from the Dark Ages, but in that intervening period, all the gods got shuffled around, Poseidon got demoted from head god and Zeus got to be in charge, and the Mycenaean syllabic script, Linear B, was replaced by the basically Phoenician Greek alphabet. Linear B only got properly translated in the last few decades, but using that, we've been able to find written records of a lot of the Hellenistic gods from Mycenaean Greece, like Zeus, Dionysus, Persephone, etc., meaning they predated ancient Greece and were worshipped in the precursor culture of Mycenaean Greece and carried over through the Dark Ages. Again, like I mentioned in the Dionysus video, Mycenaean Greece was the ancient Greece of ancient Greece. Ancient Greek culture deliberately presented itself as a successor to Mycenaean Greece, with the Iliad and the Odyssey codified in the 700s BC in ancient Greece but set in Mycenaean Greece. There was a lot of rollover, and as we discussed, Dionysus was one of the rollover gods. He was worshipped in an obscure cult capacity in Mycenaean Greece and carried on through the Dark Ages into ancient Greece proper. But if we go looking for Aphrodite's name in ye olde Mycenaean inscriptions, we come up empty. Aphrodite is not a Mycenaean goddess. So where did she come from? Since Aphrodite isn't Mycenaean but is very relevant in the Iliad, one of the oldest ancient Greek texts we have, this gives us a concrete interval to look in for when she first showed up and or when she became an established member of the pantheon. She can't have been very relevant before the 1100s, and she can't be newer than 700. Honestly, she really can't be newer than 900, as Homer didn't write the Iliad, he just wrote it down. It had most likely already been codified in oral tradition for a century or two. So let's put a pin in this for a minute and talk about the Phoenician goddess Astarte. Astarte is a Phoenician goddess of fertility, sex, war, and the planet Venus. References to her name first appear in the port city of Ugarit between 1450 and 1200 BC, and there's evidence that her cult moved out along Phoenician trade routes, which reached the eastern tip of Crete. There was also a Phoenician settlement on the island of Cythera sometime in the 1400s BC, and if the name Cythera is ringing any bells, it's the mythological realm of Aphrodite and the home to her oldest temple, as well as the place she supposedly first came to shore after being born from sea foam, making it a very simple leap to suppose that this is a mythological representation of her cult coming from across the sea and making landfall there. Also, like I mentioned right at the beginning, the Phoenician alphabet was brought to Greece sometime around the Dark Ages, and it's not so unreasonable that the Phoenicians might have brought some other info with them, like a nifty cult for example. So the general consensus is that the Phoenician cult of Astarte came to Greece, specifically Cythera, most likely in the 1400s. Astarte became Aphrodite, and in the intervening centuries her worship spread until by the time the Iliad was being taught she'd been firmly emplaced as a member of the pantheon. Sure, that's cool. Astarte is also Ishtar. Ishtar is the Mesopotamian goddess of love, sex, fertility, beauty, war, justice, political power, the planet Venus, and a bunch of other stuff. She was worshipped from 4000 BC onward and saw a major jump in popularity around 2300 BC. You may remember her from her appearance in the Underworld Myths video, where she quests into the underworld to retrieve her boyfriend Tammuz and comes into conflict with Ereshkigal, the queen of the underworld. So it might fascinate you to know that Aphrodite has a very similar myth. In the story of Adonis, Aphrodite finds the orphaned infant Adonis and gives him to Persephone to be raised in the underworld. That part is pretty unique. Crazy, by the way. Tammuz had his own cult, and it got imported to Greece under the name Adonis. This is a legit connection. So Aphrodite, a goddess of sex, love, beauty, and the planet Venus, comes from Astarte, a goddess of all of the above plus war, and Astarte comes from Ishtar, a goddess of all of the above plus justice and power. That's not too crazy. Astarte makes landfall in Cythera when her cult travels up along the trade routes. At this point, we've got a couple questions presenting themselves to us. Where did her cult go next? And if Ishtar and Astarte are so strongly war goddesses, then why is Aphrodite totally not a war goddess? I'll answer both those questions at once. The next place she went was Sparta, and she was absolutely a war goddess. So Cythera is this little island right about here-ish. Sparta is about here-ish. Unsurprisingly, given their proximity, Sparta had a habit of intermittently claiming Cythera as a territory, and equally unsurprisingly, some of that OG Phoenician cult attitude seems to have leaked through whenever Sparta was in the area. Sparta is also one of the oldest cities in ancient Greece, so when you put that all together, you get the fact that Sparta pretty much got the first good look at this brand new goddess, and judging by the statues they carved and the way she was worshipped, Aphrodite was a full-on war god back when she first made landfall. Now, unsurprisingly, a goddess of beauty and sex simultaneously being a goddess of war was unlikely to bother the Spartans, because, you know, Spartans. But the rest of Greece didn't seem too keen on the concept. Apparently, it was considered an inherent contradiction in values. The warlike Aphrodite is found almost exclusively on Cythera and in Sparta, and it's worth noting that in the Iliad, Zeus explicitly tells Aphrodite that she doesn't belong on the battlefield, which is the kind of overt character interaction that contemporary writers like to use to make firm political statements on controversial subjects. The fact that it needed to be stated at all implies it might have been something of a debate at the time. Anyway, this warlike Aphrodite, while probably the oldest Aphrodite, isn't the most popular Aphrodite in ancient Greece. As her worship spread, her image changed, which wasn't uncommon, but is still very interesting. But before we go further in that direction to explore how she was worshipped, we gotta talk about two things: mythological inconsistencies and divine epithets. See, here's this problem. Homer and Hesiod were contemporaries, and they both wrote about Aphrodite's birth, but their accounts are contradictory. In the Iliad, Homer says Aphrodite is the daughter of Zeus and the Titaness Dione, but in Hesiod's Theogony, Aphrodite is supposedly the motherless child of Uranos, born from the sea foam around his severed testicles after Kronos overthrows and castrates him. Also, fun fact, this is an adaptation of another Ishtar myth, where in one Hittite story of her birth, the god Kumarbi overthrows his father, the sky god Anu, and bites off his testicles, then becomes pregnant with and gives birth to Ishtar. Amazingly, the bath bomb ball sack is the less disturbing version of the legend. Anyway, obviously these birth stories disagree. So what's an ancient Greek philosopher to do to resolve the conflict? Well, if you're Socrates, Plato, or Xenophon philosophizing in the 300s to 400s BC, you solve the problem by codifying two distinct Aphrodites. This is where the epithets come in. A little bit of Monica. Now, most gods have epithets. Pallas Athena and Phoebus Apollo are well-known examples. And most gods also had regional epithets, where in specific areas they'd have these epithets appended to the deity's name to describe describe what capacity they were being worshipped in. Consider Hera Alexandros, an epithet meaning defender of men only used in Sicyon that reflects a side of Hera that's very rarely seen in the general narrative. Anyway, in Aphrodite's case, she had 3 major epithets that, instead of being regional variants, almost got treated as 3 distinct gods. The first of those is Aphrodite Aria, the warlike Aphrodite worshipped in Sparta and to a certain extent Cythera. The others are 2 of a pair, Aphrodite Urania and Aphrodite Pandemos. See, that whole contradictory Aphrodite birth story thing seems like it should be a real pain in the butt, but it actually lent itself well to an elegant solution to a few problems with Aphrodite. As we've already covered, Aphrodite is not the most internally consistent character personality-wise. Sometimes she's benevolent and kind, sometimes she's petty and cruel. This is not unexpected from a divine representation of something as fickle and potentially both amazing and thoroughly miserable as love, but a lot of 5th and 4th century BC philosophers weren't content with Aphrodite being a sort of nebulous, internally inconsistent entity. They wanted something concrete, so they split her in half. The benevolent, more quote-unquote divine half of her character went to Aphrodite Urania, who also got the motherless child of Uranos birth story. Aphrodite Urania was presented as an embodiment of celestial love and beauty without all that yicky physical attraction stuff lumped in with it. Although take this description with a grain of salt, as it was partially codified by Christian interpreters who had a habit of distancing sex from divinity and highlighting purity as a divine trait in contrast with profanity, so it's not clear how much of this is the legit Greek angle and how much is Christianity lumping her in with the Virgin Mary, which, yes, is a thing they did. It seems a little more likely to me that any personality-splitting Aphrodite Urania experience probably fell along Greek love lines, like the separation between Eros, Storge, Philia, Mania, etc., rather than distancing physical sexual attraction from pure divine love, but who knows. Aphrodite Urania was widely worshipped in various cults, but she almost never turns up in the mythology proper. There aren't really many stories about her. Now here's a very interesting thing to consider when examining Aphrodite Pandemos. It was actually very rare for an Olympian god to be worshipped by everybody. Looking back on ancient Greece as though it were a cohesive unit, it's easy to think that because it had a concrete pantheon, everyone worshipped everyone. But in practice, most of the gods were fairly specialized. They'd be honored on their festival days, obviously, but, well, for example, unless you're a blacksmith or craftsman, Hephaestus is unlikely to be super relevant to your everyday life. Zeus is the major exception, as evinced by his Pan-Helenos epithet denoting him as a god of the whole Hellenistic world, but Aphrodite is pretty much the only other god who seems to have been relevant to almost everybody. And it makes sense, there aren't many people for whom love, sex, and beauty don't matter. So Aphrodite Pandemos is in this rare divine position of being directly relevant to nearly everybody, and this didn't go unnoticed by the greater Hellenistic world. One of her explicit divine qualities was the ability to bring large groups of people together. And if you think that seems like it could be a politically useful divine quality, you'd be right. Aphrodite Pandemos' everyman appeal was mythically leveraged by Theseus during the founding of Athens, as he used her influence to unite scattered and disconnected townships under one banner. Aphrodite Pandemos was worshipped in Athens as a result, but her pseudo-leadership position didn't end there. See, around the 200s BC, a little something called the Roman Empire started getting really important, and in case you forgot, Aphrodite's son Aeneas was pretty instrumental to that whole debacle, mythically speaking. And that means Aphrodite, or Venus as the Romans called her, syncretizing her with a local small-time fertility goddess, was from a certain perspective the mother of Rome itself, known as Venus Genetrix. Julius Caesar was big into the cult of Venus and even claimed to be descended from Aeneas himself. So suddenly, Venus has all this motherhood symbolism attached to her, along with a lot of political clout. And this flowed backwards from Venus's characterization to Aphrodite, who the Greeks began portraying with maternal symbolism as well as rather more militaristic and political clout than she'd had before. This is also around the time that Eros began to be portrayed as her son. In earlier myths, he was one of her attendants, but they weren't outright related until it began to fit her new image. Aphrodite's mythical role as protective mother was firmly established around this time, and since Rome was also in the process of eating Egypt, she was occasionally syncretized with Isis and Hathor, both goddesses with themes of motherhood, fertility, and political power. Aphrodite ended up with a lot of political and military clout pretty much by accident. A few centuries down the line, in roughly the 300s AD, Rome decided it didn't like paganism anymore and kinda threw Aphrodite and all her icky sex symbolism under the bus, wrecking a few of her temples. But you're not fooling me, Rome, we both know Genetrix knows best. Gotta say, I do think it's really interesting that even though Aphrodite had her Ishtar-based war connections pretty aggressively stripped away when she arrived in Greece, she still ended up kind of gaining them back through Rome, and also made her debut in the first place by being directly responsible for the biggest war in Greek mytho history. I guess you can take the war out of the goddess, but you can't take the goddess out of the war. Ugh, I love the deep dives, but they are so hard to make. Trying to reconcile the loose, implied timeline of the mythological order of operations with the real historical timeline of narrative and religious changes that shaped these myths and the gods themselves makes things pretty brain-hurty, which is bad news for us if we're trying to make this video a timeline. But rather than tying ourselves in knots trying to lock down a birth order, let's just keep things alphabetical and bring in the twins. In the field of mythology in general, and Greek mythology specifically, fraternal twins, where one is a boy and the other is a girl, are very unusual. Twins in general aren't. Castor and Pollux, Helen and Clytemnestra, Heracles and Iphicles. If you get late enough in the myth cycle, you even get Romulus and Remus when Rome rolls into town. But fraternal twins of different genders are quite rare, not just in Greek mythology, but in mythology overall. You do get Freyr and Freya over in Norse mythology, but in general, the identical twins far outnumber them. Even in the pantheons that share hypothetical Proto-Indo-European roots with Greek mythology, the only twins we really run into are identical. The Ashvins in Hinduism and their twin sons Nakula and Sahadeva, Lugalira and Meslamtaea in Babylon, the Dioscuri in Greece. The always identical divine twins are even a reconstructed Proto-Indo-European god archetype, so take that with as many grains of salt as you want. But the bottom line is, mythology in that slice of the world is loaded with identical god twins and very sparse in the fraternal god twin department. In the mortal cases, Greek mythology is fond of having twins where only one of them has a divine parent, but in the case of twin gods, they are almost always all the way identical and function basically as two copies of the same guy. Which brings us to a perhaps rather obvious line of inquiry: where did Artemis and Apollo come from? We've discussed in previous deep dives how the roots of different Greek gods can be traced through the historical record, with varying degrees of accuracy, certainty, and success to paint a possible picture of where these gods geographically and culturally originated, how they changed and moved over the centuries, and what social pressures or changes may have affected their characterization over time. Aphrodite's glow-up is one of the more dramatic and obvious, as her central role in Rome's mythological origins helped keep her very solidly documented over the centuries, and her Phoenician origins are pretty well agreed on in the scholarship around her. But some gods are trickier to track, and right out the gate, Artemis and Apollo are giving us trouble, because when we go looking for likely candidates for where they might have come from, we find nothing. There are no convenient brother-sister twin pairings in any of the surrounding areas, certainly none that match their divine domains of archery, medicine, hunting versus civilization, etc. But this lack of information does actually give us one very important clue right out the gate. Artemis and Apollo may have their origins in non-Greek cultures, but they don't seem to have started out as a matched set. Now, this is not actually the weirdest thing in the world. We have to remember that gods are not people, and their genealogy is not set in stone. Hermes seems to have started his life as an offshoot of the god Pan, and was later written to be Pan's father, and Persephone's parentage oscillates between Poseidon and Zeus depending on where and when you're asking. So it is not too bizarre to consider the possibility that Artemis and Apollo did not start their divine existences as twins, but were two initially unrelated gods that became twins over time. For one thing, if we go looking in the Linear B inscriptions from the pre-Greek Dark Age Mycenaean civilization, we can find Artemis in the ledgers of Pylos, but we cannot find Apollo anywhere. This does not categorically mean that Apollo, or a god who would become Apollo, did not exist in Mycenaean Greece. It's possible he just had another name. For instance, we actually can find two names that later became epithets of Apollo, Smintheus and Paeon, attested at Knossos. But it does mean that Artemis and Apollo were not, at this point, two of a pair. Their names or epithets aren't listed in the same areas, and it's not even clear if Apollo exists yet, while Artemis's worship was solid enough that it has an actual archaeological record to back it up, with artifacts from as far back as the Greek Dark Age found at the temple to Artemis Orthia in Sparta. Again, a lack of information gives us information. With Artemis attested in Linear B, we can pretty solidly assume she was a Mycenaean god, and if she has foreign origins earlier than that, we don't really have a chance of figuring out what they are. But Apollo's absence is interesting, and suggests he might have a more far-flung origin. This is potentially supported by the fact that the etymology of his name is uncertain, and there's no obvious Greek root for what it means, though Apella has been suggested, which would mean wall or fence or place where people gather, which could potentially match up with his role as a god of civilization in contrast with Artemis's stewardship of the wild, but it's disputed and possibly nonsense, so who knows. So there is still a pretty hard limit to how much information we can get from no information. Now, while Apollo's place of origin isn't known, it is interesting that he has an awful lot of myths about coming to Greece from somewhere else, most of which are discussed in his Homeric hymn. To start with, he and Artemis are born on the comparatively far-flung island of Delos because Hera used her goddess powers to forbid their mother Leto from giving birth anywhere closer to home, giving a plausible mythological reason for why Apollo would have had to join the pantheon late and from somewhere else. Reinforcing that theme, in Delphi, Apollo's major cult center, he was mostly revered for slaying and usurping the Python, described in the hymn as a monstrous dragon and the offspring of Typhon. So in broad strokes, Apollo is born outside of Greece, comes to Delphi, seizes control of Python's place of divine power, and takes his place as the local god. That looks like an analogy for a new god rolling up in the neighborhood and finding his niche in the pantheon, by force if necessary. The hymn also describes Apollo wandering the world for a while, looking for the perfect place to establish his center of worship, and at one point abducting a crew of Cretan sailors to be his worshippers. We'll get more into this later, but it paints a picture about how the Greeks might have thought of Apollo by the roughly 500s BCE, which is when the Homeric hymn to Apollo was supposedly written. They seem to have thought of him as a well-established and broadly well-respected deity who, nonetheless, came to Greece a little bit late in the game. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's stick to the timeline and see what we can find that way. After the Greek Dark Ages, the first big source we have on hand is, of course, Homer's Iliad and Odyssey. And lucky for us, Artemis and Apollo are major players in the Iliad. But interestingly, they're both firmly on the antagonistic and non-Achaean Trojan side. Now, admittedly, so is Zeus, so this doesn't mean the Trojan-favoring gods were automatically being framed as foreign, scary bad guy gods or anything, but they were on the same side as Aphrodite, who we know was a Phoenician import god, still kinda getting her legs under her, and Ares, a god the Greeks seem to have generally disliked. And the way these two are characterized in the story is a little odd when you compare it to their later portrayals. Not everything is weird. A lot of their very consistent character traits are established. While they aren't explicitly referred to as twins in so many words, they are full siblings. And Artemis is a great huntress and archer and the patroness of wild beasts with a habit of divinely smiting people for wrongdoings, disrespect, and possibly shits and gigs, while Apollo is the lyre-playing leader of the Muses who is also an expert archer who strikes down mortals on the regs, and he's already established as a major god in Troy, as Agamemnon disrespecting his priest is what kicks off his direct intervention in the war. Achilles at one point describes Apollo as the most malicious of all gods, but Achilles is explicitly pretty biased, so we don't need to take that as 100% factual or representative of the popular attitudes at the time. Artemis and Apollo are both also described as healing various combatants, making them stronger and cooler looking, and other general god things that are pretty much par for the course. But while all this sounds pretty much in line with what we expect, elements of their characterization seem a little bit off from their more well-known versions. For one thing, despite Artemis being described as a powerful hunter goddess and the mistress of wild beasts, when the gods square up to fight each other, Hera literally beats the crap out of her with her own bow and sends her crying to Zeus. This doesn't really line up with her strong and wrathful goddess of the wilds thing, though in fairness, Artemis might be suffering from the Worf effect, especially since Hera is the most powerful goddess in the pantheon, and this scene specifically is dedicated to proving that, and more broadly to proving why the gods don't fight each other directly. But while Artemis is literally spanked and sent crying home to daddy, Apollo is portrayed a little more respectfully. He's still framed as a bit of a terrifying dread god, but he's also smart enough to not pick a fight with Unky Poseidon and subsequently get his ass beat, so he comes out of the whole situation looking less arrogant than his sister, which could have been intentional. We can't read too far into this, and this is just me conspiracy boarding again, but if Artemis was already a well-established and powerful Greek god at this point, but Apollo was a slightly newer addition to the pantheon, one way to give him credibility would be to explicitly portray him as superior to his sister, wiser and on better terms with the other gods. This isn't the only time the Iliad makes an explicit statement about a newly integrated god, as it also goes out of its way to declaw Aphrodite's apparently pre-existing war associations when Zeus firmly and blatantly tells her she has no place on the battlefield. And also, it would be pretty disingenuous to not acknowledge that the ancient Greeks had some strong opinions about gender roles that might possibly be being reinforced here. The gods are much less centralized in the Odyssey, so the only references we get to Artemis and Apollo are distant and reverent rather than personal godly exploits, and the main theme is that they seem to be credited with causing sudden, unexpected deaths with their divine arrows. Again, not their most friendly look. One common interpretation of this is that Artemis and Apollo's arrows represent illness and corresponding sudden death, which would make this an early instance of their incidental association with medicine. When a god is in charge of killing you in a specific way, you might pray to them specifically to not do that. Another important player referenced in the Iliad is Artemis and Apollo's mother Leto, who is, like her children, on the Trojan side of the conflict. During the big god fight where Artemis gets whacked, Hermes is squared off against Leto, but respectfully refuses to fight her and asks her to tell everyone that she beat him fair and square. Then she gathers up Artemis's dropped bow and scattered arrows and goes off to comfort her after her vicious ass beating at the hands of Hera. And it is interesting that while Artemis and Apollo are framed as kind of terrifying and antagonistic, Leto is afforded only the highest respect by both the gods and the narrative overall. We don't get much more about Leto here, but we do get a little bit more in the Theogony by Hesiod, which was written around the same time as the Iliad and the Odyssey, and is again one of our earliest post-Dark Age written sources. The Theogony says that Leto and Zeus were together before Zeus married Hera, and thus Artemis and Apollo are Zeus's kids from a previous relationship with no explicit drama involved. It also, again, only says that Artemis and Apollo are the children of Zeus and Leto. It does not say whether or not they are twins. This no-drama family picture severely contrasts with the version we get a few centuries later in the Homeric hymns, which give us a very different and more familiar rundown of the circumstances of Artemis and Apollo's birth. Of course, it's not immune to its own weirdnesses. For one thing, the Homeric hymn to Apollo describes Leto giving birth to Artemis on the island of Ortygia, the location of which is uncertain because it could be referring to a half a dozen places of the same name, including one all the way at the boot end of Italy. And then Leto gives birth to Apollo on the island of Delos. Now I know they're gods, and I know the rules are different, but I'm counting this as evidence for my "these guys were not always twins" theory, because giving birth to twins on different islands seems wildly impractical. And in fact, the Homeric hymn does not call them twins. Now, perhaps they are still implied to be twins by the fact that they both seem to be the result of the same vaguely defined one-night stand with Zeus, and it's biologically unlikely otherwise, but they're gods, man! The rules are weird! Anything can happen! Anyway, the hymn explains that Leto is having an absolute bear of a time trying to find a place to have her baby/babies, in large part because of Hera, who is very angry at this whole situation. And while the causality is not directly stated in the hymn, fear of Hera's wrath is implied to be a large part of why all the places Leto tries to settle down to have her baby kick her out again. The only exception is the island of Delos, which is pretty crappy by island standards and devoid of all the classic appeals of a hunk of rock in the middle of the ocean, and Leto swears on the river Styx that her glorious golden son will skyrocket the property values with his biggest and baddest temple if Delos will let her have her baby already. And the island agrees. But Hera does not, and keeps Aletheia, goddess of childbirth, on a short leash for 9 days and nights until the other goddesses fire off a message to kick her out of bed and she zips down to help Leto out. Apollo is finally born, and everyone is really impressed with how cool and badass he is, and he declares that the lyre and the bow will be his symbols and he will speak the will of Zeus. In celebration, Delos blooms with golden flowers, and true to his word, no matter how many temples Apollo gets, his shrine at Delos is always the best. And Artemis is presumably also there, but the Homeric hymn barely mentions her, so whatever. The hymn to Pythion Apollo goes into more detail about some of the shenanigans Apollo gets up to, and the singer recounts a short list of some of Apollo's many lovers before settling on the story of how Apollo found the perfect place to sit his oracle. After a very scenic Mediterranean grand tour, he settles on the area of Crissa, lays out the foundations for his temple, and then casually scoots over to a nearby spring currently populated by a terrible dragon, Python, and kills it, gaining the epithet Pythian and naming the place Pytho in one fell swoop. Then, of course, Apollo decides his fancy temple needs people to work at it, spots a nearby trading ship from Crete, and decides those are just the guys he needs. Obviously looking to win first place in the Simple Solution Olympics, he turns himself into a dolphin and launches himself onto the deck of the ship, furiously shaking and rattling the boat whenever they try and throw him off, so they have no choice but to leave him flopped on the deck while he summons the winds to steer them way off course. When they finally go to ground near Crissa, Apollo zips off the ship, gets the temple all shiny for the new visitors, and strolls out in all his glory to give them the good news. To honor his heroic exploit of kidnapping a ship full of sailors while shaped like a dolphin, the area is given the name Delphi. The Homeric hymns to Artemis are a lot shorter and a lot less morally whack somehow. They mostly praise her prodigious hunting skill, her virginity, and how she loves nothing more than racing through the mountains, firing arrows in every direction, except when she wants to unwind, when she scoots back to Delphi to party with her brother and the Muses to sing about how they're the greatest gods in the entire pantheon. Hubris. It's okay when the gods do it. Now, it's worth noting that at this point in the timeline, Artemis and Apollo really haven't changed all that much. They've been remarkably consistent since the Iliad. Apollo is an extremely well-respected god of archery, prophecy, and music, with hints of healing thrown in the mix. Artemis is a more wild goddess of archery and the hunt. They are explicitly full siblings, even in the stories that don't specify in so many words that they're twins, and they are overall very well-liked gods whose many feats are a credit to their divine mother Leto, even if those feats do involve killing an awful lot of mortals for often very flimsy reasons. Hesiod's Astronomia, another early source from the 700s-ish BCE, around the same time as the Theogony and the Homeric epics, lists a number of constellation myths that Artemis is involved in, giving us another look at her early post-Dark Age characterization. Artemis appears in the myth of Callisto, hunting wild beasts in the mountains before transforming Callisto into a beast herself. Orion is described as a hunting companion to Artemis and her mother Leto before being killed by a monstrous scorpion sent by Gaia and turned into a constellation at Artemis and Leto's behest. Later, in the 300s to 200s, Aratus' Phenomena does the same, describing a different version of the Orion myth where Artemis kills him herself for trying to assault her. Apollo is less common in the constellation myths, but significantly more common in myths about his lovers and the resulting kids. Pindar wrote the Pythian Odes in the 400s BCE, which reaffirm Apollo's status as the leader of the Muses, but also starts getting into his tumultuous love life. For instance, Pindar describes the birth of Asclepius, son of Apollo and hero-turned-god of medicine. The gist is Asclepius' mother Coronis sleeps with someone else while pregnant with Apollo's kid, and Apollo gets big mad about it and sends Artemis to do some vengeance, but crucially doesn't tell her when to stop, so Artemis' divine smite leaves a lot of collateral damage, which does support the idea that Artemis and Apollo's arrows sometimes take the form of a plague. Apollo saves the unborn Asclepius from his mother's funeral pyre and gives him to Chiron to raise. Asclepius later uses his medical skills to bring someone back from the dead for money, and Zeus strikes him with lightning about it. This is probably one of the earlier instances of Apollo being associated with medicine, indirectly through his son, but other than that, this story mostly reaffirms what's already been established. Apollo has powerful oracular omniscience, a strong musical bent, and a propensity for sharing the stage with the Muses, while his sister Artemis is terrifying. However, there is one little crucial shift that we find around this time. Along with the hot goss of the Pythian Odes, Pindar is also the first writer I can find who explicitly states that Artemis and Apollo aren't just siblings, they're twins. He says as much in a fragmentary papyrus describing the story of their birth from yet another angle where they're both born at the same time, which makes sense. By the 400s BCE, Artemis and Apollo were officially twins. Things start to shift more seriously when Rome becomes more of a thing closer to the tail end of the BCEs. The Romans made my life personally a lot more difficult by enthusiastically syncretizing their own gods with the Greeks, and Artemis is no exception. The Romans seem to have just taken Apollo wholesale, with temples popping up in Etruscan Italy as early as the 500s BCE, and a cult of his manifesting in Pompeii around the same time, hitting Rome proper in 431 BCE with a temple dedicated to his healing aspect. And the fact that Apollo evidently didn't already have a similar Roman equivalent knocking around is pretty solid evidence for the idea that he's a quite late addition to the region, which is most likely why he's the only major Greek god whose name remains unchanged by the syncretism. But when it came to Artemis, they did have a deity they could conflate her with, their own hunting goddess Diana. Around 200 BCE, the Roman poet Ennius listed the 12 major Roman gods in his Annales poem, now preserved only in fragments, and two of them are Apollo and Diana. A couple centuries later, Virgil gives us a much better preserved text in the Aeneid, and name drops the twins' Roman editions on the regular. Virgil describes Diana as chaste, accompanied by similarly chaste followers, and majestically leading a dance of nymphs while armed with her trusty quiver. In short, Virgil's description of Diana lines up very well with the Homeric hymn's description of Artemis, right up until it doesn't, when he casually drops the idea that Diana is a triple goddess like Hecate, a deity very commonly represented with three distinct faces and aspects, and divine power over three-way crossroads, where Hecate's three-faced statues, the Hecatio, were commonly found. Virgil also references Diana alongside Night, Erebus, Chaos, and other extremely witchy gods in the context of Dido doing some very spooky magic, and he references her in brief retellings of older Greek myths, but uses the epithet trivia, meaning triple. None of this triple symbolism was in the mythology or the iconography of Artemis, so this seems to have been a strictly Roman addition. The epithet trivia, the triple nature, and the association with spooky chthonic gods. This is quite a shift, and a very cool one. Diana doesn't have as much triplicate statuary as Hecate does, but Roman coins from the last years of the BCEs show a tripled Diana, a recreation of a cult image to Diana Nemorensis from a sacred grove turned temple dedicated to her in the region of Nemi, Italy, that had seen continuous use since the 500s BCE, meaning that Diana's triple status was centuries old by the time the Romans started conflating her with Artemis. The Aeneid, meanwhile, mostly refers to Apollo as Phoebus, the epithet meaning bright, while Diana is described as a dark counterpoint to him. They're referenced together more often than not, and Aeneas is at one point urged to do a sacrifice to each of them, reinforcing their characterization as a matched set. But there's one part of their characterization you might have noticed we haven't found yet, and that is their astronomical side. After all, Apollo is famously a god of the sun and Artemis of the moon, but we've gone through more than 800 years of myths without even a hint of their most iconic symbolism. So when and where did that crop up? Well, surprisingly late. It doesn't come up at all in the pre-Roman myths, even in the places where it would make sense to bring it up, like the various constellation myths Apollo and Artemis are wrapped up in, where their celestial counterparts would be very easy to loop into the narrative. The first clear evidence we have of the connection is as late as 45 BCE, when Cicero's Nature of the Gods says outright that Diana is the goddess of the moon, while Apollo is the god of the sun, and further links Diana's moon association with pregnancy and childbirth, something that's been in Artemis's extended purview since the early myths, where in some versions she assisted in her own twin brother's delivery, which is a hell of a visual. It's a nice connection that lines up well with their divine domains, so it makes sense that it would catch on, but it also makes sense why it wouldn't have been a thing before the Romans started mashing gods together, because there were already Greek gods of the sun and moon, Helios and Selene, referenced as early as the Theogony alongside their sister Eos, goddess of the dawn. Helios turns up in the Odyssey, and Selene and Helios are the subjects of their own Homeric myths, meaning they were clearly distinct deities for a while. The sun and moon are probably some of the easiest natural phenomena to assign gods to, so it's not too much of a stretch to assume that Helios and Selene are some of the oldest gods in the pantheon, or even the pre-Greek theoretical Proto-Indo-European pantheon scholars like fist-fighting each other about. But when Rome rolled up, with their habit of syncretizing gods left and right, the similarly and yet very different fraternal twins, Apollo with his bright associations and Diana with her dark wild ones, must have made very tempting targets for just a little more divine conflation to give them command over nature's own similar and yet very different celestial phenomena. By the time of Cicero, Apollo Apollo is solidly the god of the sun, and Artemis/Diana is the goddess of the moon. Of course, once the Romans roll up, we start looking for old reliable Ovid right around the start of the CEs, and Ovid has gossip plenty about the twins. This is where we find a detailed retelling of the story of Niobe, who brags about having more children than Leto and therefore being a better mom, at which point Leto's 2 children slaughter Niobe's children and she turns into a rock about it. This is Ovid's version of a myth that was referenced as far back as the Iliad, so this is pretty classic stuff. Ovid also recounts a few of Apollo's ill-fated romantic exploits, including Daphne, who turns into a tree to escape him, and Hyacinthus, who's into the relationship and then dies anyway. Meanwhile, Artemis, or Diana, is less of a major player and is instead portrayed as a bit of a distant force of nature. For instance, she sends a massive boar to ravage Calydon when its king fails to honor her with the other gods. And this appears to be her default method of conflict resolution / conflict escalation, because according to some footnotes, there are versions where Diana also sends a boar to kill Adonis because Ares, or Mars, was jealous of how much attention Aphrodite, or Venus, was giving him, which is honestly kind of a bro move on Artemis's part. Ovid's version of the myth of Callisto features Zeus / Jupiter taking Diana's form and seducing Callisto that way, at which point Diana exiles Callisto for violating their virgins-only policy. Diana is also referenced at several points in the tale of the unfortunate nymph Arethusa, who is pursued by the extremely horny river Alpheus. Diana does several acts of divine intervention to facilitate her escape, and ultimately turns her into a freshwater spring to get her out of there for good. Ovid tends to mark the point in the timeline where the gods have reached their final consistent characterization, and all things considered, Artemis and Apollo have an interesting developmental curve. Artemis is thoroughly ancient, pre-classical antiquity minimum, and seems to have been worshipped in the wild, dark places and feared when she gets mad and encroaches in the civilized ones. But Apollo seems to have come out the gate swinging as an instant beacon of power and civilization, creativity and the arts, appearing in the Homeric era with a cavalcade of myths about coming from a far-flung exiled birth. Apollo continues to serve as a god of music and the arts, leader of the Muses and a dealer in creativity and inspiration. But he also stays firmly planted in the city centers, with oracles and priests and power and a long list of superpowered lovers and heroic offspring, while Artemis's power over the wilderness and its wild creatures and the people who choose to leave the structure of civilization to forsake love and partnership and join her in the hunt is only exacerbated when she gains Diana's chthonic triple goddess crossroads symbolism and later power over the moon. Apollo is a god of civilization, Artemis of the uncivilized wild. Together, they cover basically everything the average ancient Greek is liable to deal with on a daily basis. It's almost unsurprising that they slowly absorbed more and more symbolism. If Apollo is the god of light and civilization, why wouldn't you also tie him in with the daylight, the time where civilization gets most of its civilizing done? And if Artemis is a goddess of navigating the wild and dangerous wilderness, why wouldn't you give her power over the moonlight that casts the world in shifting, uncertain shadows, that commands the nighttime when the animals she hunts are the most active? Artemis and Apollo fit together. Narratively and aesthetically speaking, they're just plain fun. And they're also dangerous, fickle, and unpredictable. Their divine domains contain multitudes, and those multitudes contradict. Artemis is a defender of young women, and also the goddess whose job it is to kill them. She helps hunters and gives people who don't want to marry a career option in divine protection, and she also unleashes wild animals on innocent towns whenever she's provoked, and kills any hunter that gets too hubristic about their own skill. Apollo is a god of music and creativity who leads the Muses, mistresses of inspiration, and one way to interpret his many mortal lovers is a metaphor for creative inspiration, striking at random and often to devastating effect. And another way to read it is that Apollo's disastrous love life is a nightmare because he does not take no for an answer, making his relationship with Artemis, the protector of young women who intercedes when they're attacked, a very blatant conflict. And that can make my flavor of storytelling difficult. I mean, how are we supposed to like these guys? How can we be cutesy and fun about these people that have done so much fucked up stuff? Well, there's a problem in our premise. At the end of the day, when we analyze any god, we have to remember that they are not people. These contradictory characteristics, blessings and atrocities doled out in equal measure, protections and injustices inflicted on hapless mortals, these are not moral actions being taken by human beings. Artemis and Apollo are gods that existed through a civilization for nearly a millennium, and in that time they were the subject of many stories. Why are the Greek gods so fickle? Why don't they always help the people they care about? Why does the mistress of the hunt both protect and kill her hunters? Well, probably because sometimes hunters live and sometimes they die. Sometimes arrows rain down from heaven and the people they strike get sick, and sometimes they just as randomly get better. And if you worship gods that represent those realities, those gods are not going to be entirely benevolent. If you tell a story to explain the world, especially if you tell that story over 1,000 years, the story is probably not going to be entirely happy. And I think that's what makes the story so interesting. When we unravel one of these gods, we are getting a glimpse of centuries of civilization and generations of people making sense of the world around them. That civilization is long gone, the people are long dead, the world they lived in a very real sense, no longer exists. But the stories they told about the world and each other are still here, and two of those stories happen to be named Artemis and Apollo. These deep dives are hard to put on the timeline on account of how they span 1,000 years of real history and also include quick references to myths that are going to show up later in this video, but I'm doing the best I can with what I got. This cast of characters has already gotten big, but we're not even close to done. And luckily for us in our timeline, the ever-effervescent god of thieves and travelers is, in at least one story, officially established to be younger than Apollo, which means now is as good a time as any to bring him in.
What's the Greek god you see the most influence of in your everyday life? Wrong, it's Hermes. Hermes. Kinda hope you're not dealing with that daily, but still Hermes. Hermes, known to the Romans as Mercury, was the ancient Greek god of roads, journeys, merchants, thieves, athletes, trickery, and a handful of other related things. He was predominantly recognized as a messenger god, but he was also revered as an underworld god and a psychopomp responsible for guiding the souls of the dead. He also pulled a triple shift guiding dreams and had a hobby on the side of helping out mortal heroes when they got wrapped up in sticky situations. With that many jobs, it's no wonder he's so widespread these days. What a millennial icon. So before we start in on the whole historical context, character development thing, let's do a quick rundown of where exactly Hermes stands in the mythology of ancient Greece. Hermes is very young by Olympian standards, only Dionysus is canonically younger. He's born to the Pleiad Maya in the mountain in Arcadia, and is unsurprisingly the son of Zeus, like roughly 7% of all of ancient Greece. But Hermes sets himself apart from the other Olympians by getting his shenaniganery underway literally the day he's born. According to the Homeric hymn to Hermes, the first thing he does after being born is find a tortoise, kill it, and turn its shell into a lyre. Then he gets hungry, so he does the only rational thing and steals 50 of Apollo's sacred cattle. Oh, but what if Apollo notices they're missing? Well, obviously Hermes reverses their hooves first, so it looks like they're walking backwards. Duh, you guys. Anyway, Hermes stows the cows and starts a fire so he can sacrifice some meat to the gods, including himself, of course. And then he scoots back home and puts on a helpless baby act, but his mom isn't buying it, so instead Hermes explains to her that this is all part of his cunning plan to put himself on the Olympians' radar so he can get them both the respect and honor they deserve, instead of, living in a cave. Meanwhile, Apollo has finally noticed his cows are missing, and after a little detective work, he tracks down Hermes in Maya's cave. Apollo interrogates Hermes, who insists he's just a widow baby who doesn't know anything about any cows, so Apollo brings him to Zeus, who thinks this entire situation is absolutely hilarious. Zeus tells Hermes to guide Apollo to the cows, and on the way, Hermes wins Apollo over by playing the lyre for him. Apollo is so enchanted that he promises Hermes will be the messenger of the gods, and he and his mother will be honored among the Olympians. He trades his role of herdsman for Hermes' lyre, and the two of them return to Olympus, and in exchange for Hermes promising never to rob him again, Apollo also gives him his caduceus, a small staff with two snakes coiled around it, usually seen as a symbol of messengers and heralds, but it's also very specifically a symbol of Hermes. So Hermes makes his debut as a trickster underdog wrangling an improbable victory through cunning and trickery, and despite winning untold power and fame in the process, somehow still manages to come across as a tricksy underdog for centuries to come. Neat trick. Hermes makes regular appearances in the mythology, playing a supporting role in both the Iliad and the Odyssey. In the Iliad, though he was allied with the Achaeans for the majority of the book, he also protected King Priam when he traveled to the Achaean camp to retrieve the body of his son Hector. And in the Odyssey, Hermes provided regular help and advice to Odysseus, including helping him confront Circe to break her enchantment on his men, and later guiding the dead souls of the suitors to the afterlife. This extra special deific assistance might have been because Odysseus is actually his great-grandson, the grandkid of his son Autolycus, who was a notorious bandit, trickster, and shapeshifter. Runs in the family, I guess. One of Hermes' most well-known accomplishments is killing the 100-eyed giant Argus. In the myth of Io, for somewhat complicated reasons, the nymph Io ends up getting turned into a cow and kept under the watchful guard of Argus. Zeus asks Hermes to free her, so Hermes disguises himself as a simple shepherd, lures Argus to sleep with a long and boring story about the creation of the panpipes, then cuts off his head. To commemorate the occasion, Hermes is most frequently referred to with the epithet Argefontes, meaning Argus Slayer. Hermes has a handful of other appearances in popular Greek mythology. He frequently helps out errant heroes like Perseus and Orestes by giving them the means to sneak around invisibly or fool their enemies. In fact, this trickery is a major characteristic of Hermes. Hermes is the god of liars and thieves, along with all the other stuff in his purview. And while these may seem like kind of unheroic qualities for a god to instill, actually most Greek heroes were tricksters or underdogs on some level. Even Heracles, who was the best equipped person on the planet to solve all his problems with sheer brute force, still had to be clever on occasion, like when he tricked Atlas into taking back the sky. So even though Odysseus got a bit of a bad rap for being all trickery all the time, in practice trickery was a well-respected heroic trait when used in moderation, and it was thanks in large part to Hermes' influence. Now before we get to the history, there's one wacky thing to know about Hermes that we're gonna look into a little more later, and that's these things. These are called herms. They were boundary and border markers found along roadways. They usually had Hermes' head, although that varied, and they always had a dong. I don't know why the dong is non-negotiable, but yeah, with Hermes being a god of boundaries and borders, it kinda makes sense that he'd be on most of these road markers, but at the same time, it's still a little weird, and not just because of the dong situation. So let's hold off on investigating that for a bit and get to the history. So, first things first, Hermes used to be Pan. Let me
Explain. Now, the Greek god Pan is a mysterious figure. Not purposefully, he's just really old, so there's not much clear information available about his origins or development. Pan, as he was characterized in the era of ancient Greece, is generally considered to be a rustic wild god. Officially, he's the god of forests, mountain wilderness, fertility, shepherds and flocks, but he's also got a bunch of other wacky characteristics on the side. His worship was almost exclusively found in the mountainous inland region of Arcadia, which is also Hermes' birthplace. And Arcadia was known for being inland, forested, and very old compared to the rest of Greece. Pan, as a wild god, wasn't really worshipped in built structures. He was worshipped in natural caves and only ever had 2 constructed temples, one of them in Peloponnese. In the mythology, Pan is considered older than the Olympians. He's credited with having gifted Artemis her hunting dogs and Apollo his gift of prophecy. He's most commonly known for 2 things that both bear his name: panpipes and panic. Pan created the syrinx, or panpipes, when a nymph he was chasing turned herself into reeds to escape, so he turned her into a musical instrument he could put his lips all over. Bit twisted. Now, panic, we all know, describes a kind of fear so intense that it borders on madness. Pan is specifically credited as being responsible for panic. He would yell in the woods, and anyone who heard it would be inflicted with panic. He could supposedly rout entire armies with it. Now, we know some stuff about Pan, but there's a lot about him that's very vague and fuzzy. His parentage, for example, is incredibly vague and varied, suggesting he's very old, because that's the kind of myth that takes a while to drift. And in fact, Pan is probably older than Mycenaean Greece. See, those comparative mythology scholars working to reconstruct the Proto-Indo-European religion that spawned off the Vedic, Norse, and Greek mythologies theorize that Pan is an offshoot of the Proto-Indo-European pastoral god whose only other known offshoot is Pushan, a Vedic pastoral deity. The Rig Veda, which mentions Pushan, might be as old as 1700 BC, so if Pan is an offshoot of the same god, he most likely predates the Mycenaean age that started in 1600 BC. Now the thing is, due to a lack of written sources, we don't know much about how Pan was characterized before ancient Greece. But Pushan can give us a lot of information by proxy. Pushan is the Vedic deity of journeys, roads, travel, pastoralism, herding, and a handful of other things. He's also a psychopomp. Did you notice these are all things Hermes is a god of? So the theory, and it's not actually my theory, this is generally accepted these days, is that way back, in or before the Mycenaean age, Hermes was split from Pan, and before that, original Pan was very similar to Pushan, a liminal god of navigating between places like roads, the general wilderness, and the journey to the afterlife. When this original Pan was subdivided, Pan retained his pastoralist and herding connotations, but all the roads and journey stuff went to Hermes, leaving Pan quite reduced. And it's worth noting that Hermes also has some herding associations. Now, this theory isn't just based on the fact that Hermes has general similarities to a Vedic deity. Pan and Hermes also have some other weird connections. For one, their origins are both in Arcadia, as are their centers of worship. For another, in some versions of the mythology, Pan is Hermes' son? Now that's a damn weird connection, but it makes sense to link them in a backwards kind of way. And, surprisingly relevant, Hermes and Pan are both mythically notorious for having some serious dongage going on. So let's circle back to the Herms. Now, the word Herm literally means piled stones. It's not a name. Hermes' name is not a name, and Herms are a very old concept in that region, older than ancient Greece, and older than Hermes. Before they were sculpted statues, roads were demarcated with heaps of stones, but the lack of human features didn't make them any less sacred. Herms were revered. It was customary to throw a stone on the heap or anoint it with oil if you were feeling particularly devout, and messing with them or later defacing them was seen as this horrible affront. And Pan, as the old deity of roads and journeys, was probably the god revered through the Herms. Now remember back in the Aphrodite video when I mentioned divine epithets and how they described the capacity a god was being worshipped in? We don't actually know for certain, but it seems very likely that way back in the day, Pan had some kind of Herm-related epithet describing him as Pan of the piled boundary stones. And also way back in the day, this epithet got separated from him into its own deity, Hermes. Now, this all happened very early, so we don't really know why Hermes separated from Pan. It might have been because Pan was a fairly specialized deity and his worship was having trouble expanding beyond the more rustic wildlands, so they peeled off this brand spanking new deity with so much mass market appeal he's literally still showing up on brand labels. Whatever the original reason, we know Hermes is attested in Mycenaean Linear B inscriptions, or at least a word that sounds like Hermes, and that means Hermes split from Pan well before we have any sort of proper records. By the time the 800s hit and Homer starts writing his epics, Hermes is firmly established, as evidenced by his role in the Iliad, and Pan has already been reduced to a simple wilderness god. Oh, before we move on, here's a fun fact about Pan. Some of you who are well acquainted with Greek mythological esoterica, or just read the Percy Jackson books, may have heard that Pan is canonically dead. According to Plutarch, writing around 100 AD, a mere handful of decades earlier, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, a divine voice called out from the Isle of Paxi to a sailor named Thamos and told him to tell everyone that the great god Pan was dead. Thamos obliged, and everyone was slightly bummed to hear that Pan was dead. However, Pan didn't actually seem to be dead in any meaningful sense. His shrines were still frequented, his worship still happened, so what was all that about? Well, this whole thing might be a hilarious misunderstanding. Do you remember in my old Underworld Myths video I mentioned that Ishtar had a dead boyfriend named Tammuz, and in my Aphrodite video I elaborated that Tammuz had his own cult and it had been brought to Greece? Well, in ancient Greek, the sentence, Thamos, the great god Pan is dead, is read as Thamos pan megas tethneke. But there's this funny little thing in Greek. Pan, along with being the god's name, is a prefix, meaning all. So this sentence could be, Thamos, Pan the Great is dead. Or it could be, Tammuz the All-Great is dead. So this whole thing about Pan being dead might have been the result of some sailors overhearing the cult of Tammuz praising Tammuz for his sole accomplishment and thought they were hearing them tell some dude named Tammuz that the god named Pan had died. Anyway, I thought that was the funniest thing in the world when I learned it. You're welcome for that wacky anecdote to share at parties. Back to Hermes. Now, in the early days of ancient Greece, Hermes didn't actually look too dissimilar to Pan. In the Archaic Age, between 800 and 500 BC, Hermes was always represented as an older, bearded man. In classical and Hellenistic Greece, his image changed to the one we recognize now, an athlete, young, beardless, and mostly naked. Dionysus also underwent a similar transformation. Maybe the Romans just weren't into older dudes. Speaking of, we should really talk about Mercury, the Roman version of Hermes. Now, most Roman versions of Greek gods started off as fully developed deities in their own right. For example, Mars, the parallel to Ares, was originally an agricultural deity as well as a war god, and most notably wasn't treated with anywhere near as much contempt as Ares was within his own pantheon. For the most part, the other Roman gods were also full-fledged deities, though sometimes they got a little confused and accidentally mashed other gods together, like Pluto, Hades' Roman equivalent, who was accidentally both the underworld god Pluton and the wealth god Plutus. But Mercury? Mercury didn't exist. The name Mercury has uncertain etymology, but probably derives either from the Latin root of merchant or from an older word for boundary. Either way, the name is a literal descriptor of one of Hermes' divine duties, and has no history beyond that. Mercury did seem to absorb a handful of minor Roman deities called the Dei Lucri, a collective of minor gods of profit, specifically immoral profit that comes from bad sources, but basically Mercury was literally just the Roman name for Hermes. I'm not sure why they bothered, they didn't make up a Latin name for Apollo, but it is what it is. Now, during the Roman era, Hermes/Mercury was incredibly popular. Since Rome was all about that expansion, Hermes' status as the god of trade and merchants saw a lot of use. He turned up on the coinage, his sculptures are all over Pompeii, and there's one other quirk of his that made him so popular. See, Rome had this policy that whenever they subsumed another culture, they treated that culture's gods as their own. Literally, they found the Roman god that most closely resembled the local god and insisted they were the same. First they did it with the Greeks, and then when they dealt with the Celts, this led to Mercury being syncretized with Lugus, known in Ireland as Lu and in Wales as Flu. Lu. Also Lu? I don't know, man, I'm sorry, Wales. Who was broadly seen as a big stonkin' deal, as in the creator of all arts, along with being a badass warrior hero, king and stuff. The Romans saw him as a patron of commerce, so he was equated with the commercial-friendly Mercury. And if that's not wacky enough for you, when the Romans dealt with Germanic peoples, they equated Mercury with motherfucking Odin. Was it because they were travelers? Was it because they were psychopomps? Was it that style and hat staff combo? Unclear! But the Romans were certain that the Germanic people worshipped Mercury as Odin. The Ptolemaic Greeks also syncretized Hermes with a few different gods, including Thoth and Anubis, Thoth because of their mutual cleverness and I guess tendency to write stuff down, and Anubis because of their shared psychopomp duties. Hermes was all over the place, which is honestly very appropriate. Hermes also turns up in a lot of Aesop's fables for some reason. Don't know what's up with that. Hermes is a versatile god, but I can't say for certain why he's so literally iconic. There are some possibilities. Maybe his speed and mobility resonates well with our modern high-speed society. Maybe he's one of the few Olympians to combine likable character traits with a general lack of distractingly awful character flaws. Maybe it's just because medicine, communication, and capitalism are kind of central to most societies, and they're also central to what he represents. I don't know. Whatever the reason, Hermes' liminal status helps him get into the cracks of almost any society and then just stay there forever, turning up in unexpected places centuries down the line. He's got this certain je ne sais quoi, keeping him in the popular consciousness long after the rest of his pantheon faded into novelty or obscurity. I mean, I get it. He's just fun. I always like the trickster gods. What do you want from me? Keeping the merch plug and the mega compilation feels weird, but it also feels like the most Hermes honoring thing I could possibly do, so here we are. Anyway, Hermes has quite a lot of time shenanigans wrapped up in his origin with Pan, and it's pretty clear that when it comes to timeline funkiness, the weirdest thing that can happen is when an old god shows up late to the party. But there's one god that can never resist a party, especially one he wasn't invited to. So for the last of this wave of deep dives, let's delve into Dionysus.
Dionysus, god of wine, life of the party, known primarily for being drunk and having some pretty intense fangirls who killed Orpheus that one time. Wears lots of leaves, not a fan of pants, spends most of the day draped in grapes and turning dudes into dolphins. Is there really more to him than that? Oh, is there? Is there ever? But we'll get to that. For now, let's start simple and cover the basics of the backstory. The official story of Dionysus begins with Zeus, who at this point may as well change his deific designation to god of one-night stands, carrying on a semi-secret affair with the mortal woman Semele. Hera, as is her wont, catches wind of their business and decides that she's tired of just outright killing Zeus's children and girlfriends, and for this particular murder she's gonna mix it up a little with some disguises. Hera transforms into an old woman and ingratiates herself to Semele, who trusts her immediately and confides in her that her boyfriend is Zeus himself, and not only that, she's actually pregnant with his son. But Hera's like, come on, every guy pulls that I'm really Zeus stunt to get a little mortal action. How do you know for sure he's being honest with you? And tells Semele she should make him prove his god status by showing her his true form. So the next time they meet up, Semele makes Zeus promise her a favor, then demands he drop the mortal shape and reveal himself in all his glory. Zeus isn't one to go back on a promise, so he gods it up a little and immediately vaporizes Semele Ark of the Covenant style. But good news, sports fans, the mom may be dead, but the baby lives. Zeus takes little demigod baby Dionysus, oh yeah, that's who the baby is by the way, and sews him into his leg so the kid can finish growing. A few months later, Dionysus is born for realsies and his exploits can really get started. Keep an eye on that initial theme of rebirth. It's central to some very interesting aspects of his character I'll explore later. But first, shenanigans! Dionysus is of course wildly unsafe on Olympus on account of Hera, so Zeus sends him away to be raised in secret. Exactly who raises him varies from telling to telling, with foster parents ranging from Hermes, the titan Astraea, the mortal king Athens and Queen Ino who raise him as a girl, and even Persephone. Let's also make note of his connection to Persephone in this version. This is all going to come together later, I promise. So Dionysus grows up to young adulthood and begins his classic godly exploits. He starts off by discovering how to make wine, but before he can spread this knowledge to the rest of the world, Hera drives him temporarily crazy, and he wanders around for a while before Rhea fixes his brain. Then he gets on that whole teaching the world how to make wine thing, and wanders pretty far afield. There's a story that Alexander the Pretty Alright stumbled on a town called Nyssa during his journeys along the Indus River, which they told him was founded by Dionysus during his meanderings. Dionysus is also a major cutie, which gets him in a spot of trouble when he gets abducted by sailors for unsavory purposes. Of course, they get more than they bargained for, and Dionysus responds by turning the mast and oars into snakes, filling the ship with ivy and the sound of flutes, and possibly turning into a lion. This obviously terrifies and/or maddens the sailors, who leap overboard and are promptly turned into dolphins. You may be wondering, hey, how did the cheerfully drunk god of wine do all that stuff you just said? What does feral wildlife and crippling insanity have to do with a fine Chardonnay? Don't worry about that for now. We'll get there. While it's generally accepted modern canon that Hestia, goddess of the hearthfire, gave up her seat as the 12th Olympian to Dionysus and established his godhood, there's actually no mythological precedent implying that ever happened. Listings of the 12 Olympians will generally include either Hestia or Dionysus, but not both, so people kind of assume he supplanted her, but it's not really clear or established anywhere. He also gives Midas his golden touch, which turned out not good. That was a not good thing that happened. So, now that we've established some canon for Dionysus, forget all that because there is no canon. There is only an endlessly deep well of mysteries and fragmented mythology, and Dionysus is much older and weirder than he seems. To start our dive down this well, a little historical context. Ancient Greece, as we generally conceive of it, got going around 700 BC. Before that, the civilization in the area was Mycenaean Greece, which existed between 1600 and 1100 BC. After it fell apart in the late Bronze Age collapse, there were a few centuries of Dark Ages where nothing really got written down, and then city-states started popping up and Greece got its act together over the course of a couple hundred years, starting around 900 BC. Mycenaean Greece and Ancient Greece had a pretty interesting dynamic, since although they were, practically speaking, different cultures, Ancient Greece really seems to have thought of itself as a successor to Mycenaean Greece. Classics like the Iliad and the Odyssey were written in the 700s BC, but explicitly set in the legendary past of Mycenaean Greece. So it's like Ancient Greece squared. There was also linguistic rollover. Mycenaean is considered an early form of Greek, but was written in Linear B, a syllabic script which was replaced around 900 BC by the basically modern Greek alphabet, which in turn was derived from the Phoenician alphabet. Anyway, this is important because the majority of the Hellenistic pantheon originated in Mycenaean Greece, and we know this because we found their names in Linear B inscriptions. Dionysus is one of those gods. In most cases, we know very little about what roles they played in the Mycenaean religion, although they seem very different from their classical Hellenized characterizations. Poseidon, for example, example, seems to have filled the role of head god, and he was treated more as a god of earthquakes than a god of the sea. We do know that the Mycenaean religion seems to have put a stronger focus than Hellenism did on worshipping chthonic gods, deities with connections to the underworld, and that Poseidon's Earthshaker epithet designated him as a chthonic god and might have been why he was considered so important, while Zeus, in contrast as a sky god, was barely acknowledged. There's also, fun fact, no Mycenaean equivalent to Hades, although Persephone and Demeter are both Mycenaean in origin. Anyway, regardless of who they used to be, by the time ancient Greece as we think of it got going and we started getting written records again, all those old Mycenaean gods were pretty solidly locked into their new Hellenized characterizations. Poseidon got nerfed and sidelined and had his chthonic connections minimized, chthonic gods in general were shunted to the background, sky god Zeus got to be the most important dude on the block, and everyone adjusted pretty quick. Well, everyone except for Dionysus. See, here's the thing. In the early days of ancient Greek historical analysis, everybody knew that Dionysus was a latecomer to the pantheon, although exactly how late is hard to pin down, but nobody really knew why. Before Linear B was deciphered, the theory was that he was an import god, since a lot of his documented myths had him coming to Greece from somewhere else, or wandering far afield before returning. But after finding his name in Mycenaean Greek inscriptions, that theory went out the window and a replacement was proposed, that Dionysian worship predated ancient Greece and was deliberately suppressed for several hundred years before undergoing modification and being allowed into the Hellenistic pantheon. Since ancient Greece had kind of a known habit of not exactly promoting equality for all its citizens, this wasn't too crazy of a notion. In essence, what distinguishes Dionysus from the rest of his pantheon is that his character development didn't happen during the Greek Dark Ages, but several centuries after everyone else got with the program. Which is actually pretty appropriate for a guy whose most consistent character trait at this point in history was chronic drunk. But why was he so late to transition? Well, to understand that, we have to understand his cult. And to understand his cult, we have to understand who Dionysus was before he got Hellenized. So let's talk about that. First of all, let's define some names. Dionysus is usually the name used for the Hellenistic characterization we've already established. Orphic Dionysus is the scary, older version embraced by the religion of Orphism, a characterization that puts the focus more on themes of death and rebirth. These two have notably different backstories. Confusing matters, Orphic Dionysus has been equated with another figure called Zagreus, and it's unclear whether this was a later syncretism or an early case of multiple names for one god. Orphism, side note, was a 6th century BC religion that basically boiled down to an attempt to understand life and death. It mostly worshipped gods or figures that entered the underworld and left alive, like Orpheus, hence the name Orphic. Other noteworthy figures of worship included Persephone, for fairly obvious reasons. But working from this definition, it's unclear why Dionysus would have caught the attention of a cult focused on death and rebirth, when it seems like the farthest we can stretch his characterization at this point is drunk and rowdy. What connection did Dionysus have with the underworld that would cause an Orphic cult to favor him? Let's talk about an older story of Dionysus' birth. The first difference between Orphic Dionysus and plain vanilla Dionysus is that he's the son of Zeus and Persephone, while in older fragmentary myths, Zagreus is instead the son of Hades and Persephone. Whichever way the parentage swings, Orphic Dionysus is slated to inherit Zeus' status as king of the gods, which enrages Hera, who gets a bunch of titans to murder baby Orphic Dionysus by ripping him apart and eating him. Athena saves his heart, and with Zeus' help gets him reborn, either by doing the leg implant thing again, or sticking the heart in Semele so she can grow a baby around it. Either way, Orphic Dionysus gets reborn after being ritualistically shredded and gets on with the whole being a god thing. This myth predates his Semele parentage and possibly predates ancient Greece overall, since the Mycenaean characterization also featured this theme of dying and being reborn early in life. It handily contextualizes both his theme of rebirth and his weird connection with Persephone that we touched on earlier, as well as giving him an unexpected link with the underworld that we don't see much of in his later characterization. This is strengthened by his Zagreus epithet. Zagreus in his earliest references isn't explicitly connected with Dionysus, but he is strongly linked with Hades and the underworld in general. In his earliest references from around the 600s BC, it's not even clear if he and Hades are different entities, and he's hugely important in the underworld hierarchy. Zagreus as a standalone entity seems to have been a very important chthonic god, and by appending his name to Dionysus, Dionysus inherits his strong underworld connections. Going back as far as we can, the Mycenaean inscriptions we have confirm that Dionysus' death and rebirth, as well as his status as a son of Zeus, were original elements of his characterization, not later additions by his Orphic cult. He's also got some themes of being abandoned by humanity and raised by nature, which might play into his later nature and animalistic associations. So this gives us something of a starting point. Dionysus enters the ancient Greek world as a god of death and rebirth with strong connections to the underworld. Those underworld connections appeal to the later Orphic religious movement, causing his characterization to get a bit schizophrenic as they put focus on an element of his characterization otherwise largely being left behind. Anyway, this alternative birth myth gives us something of a feel for where his characterization started, but doesn't really explain why he would have been excluded from the Hellenistic pantheon. And we also haven't put together where his wine connection came from yet. So now let's talk about what his personal cult can tell us about the rest of his characterization. The cult of Dionysus was, unfortunately for us, a mystery cult, meaning its exact rituals and practices were kept secret from outsiders, but we have pieced together the basics. For one thing, it predates ancient Greece by a wide margin, and might even predate Mycenaean Greece in one form or another. It also most likely started off less as a Dionysus cult and more as a wine cult, worshipping the state of intoxication and the liberation from societal inhibitions that came with it, because wine predates Mycenaean Greece and consequently Dionysus, and the wine cult is very focused on wine and the effects thereof, with the Dionysian aspect almost seeming secondary. It's even possible that the wine cult originated around the same time wine did, aka 6000 BC, making it very old. Old as balls. If this is true, it also probably originated in this place called the Zagros Mountains, which, yes, does sound a lot like Zagreus. This would be a really convenient etymological link if the two words were actually connected, but sadly they are not. Still a neat coincidence. Anyway, if this theory holds, the cult probably followed wine export routes to wind up in Egypt and then Minoan Crete, and then Mycenaean Greece where it scooped up Dionysus and made him its own. Really, for our purposes, it doesn't matter where or when the wine cult started, just that it wound up in Mycenaean Greece one way or another. The short of it is, a wine-centric cult popped up in the area, and one way or another, Mycenaean Dionysus got wrapped up into it, turning it into a localized Dionysian cult, and potentially affecting his early Mycenaean characterization to incorporate the invention of wine in the first place. We don't really know though, since the records are limited, and to a certain extent we're playing around in the recordless Dark Ages, but it would make sense. So by the time the Dark Ages wrapped up, the cult of Dionysus was firmly established and centered on the Dionysian Mysteries, which was this ritual that predominantly focused on getting crazy stupid high. Whoa, Dionysus, the 70s called. They want to know if they can borrow some of your stash. See, intoxication was at this point considered a form of possession by Dionysus' spirit, which in turn allowed the cult members to theoretically tap into his divine power, along with the primordial, inhibitionless subconscious mind that Dionysus' madness could release. There was also some pretty hefty symbolism linking the transformation of living grapes into fermented wine with Dionysus' transformative rebirth. Anyway, the whole point was liberation, catharsis, and a connection to the divine, as well as drunken insanity, crazy music and dancing, and symbolic recreations of Dionysus' death and rebirth. A lot of dismemberment happened. Like a lot. Mostly to bulls because they were symbolic of Dionysus, but it also happened to other stuff. Ever wonder why Orpheus got ripped apart by those ladies that one time? It's this. He died for a sweet literary reference. He was an artist, it's what he would have wanted. Unsurprisingly, Dionysus' cult attracted a lot of marginalized people, like women, slaves, and non-citizens, because it gave them the opportunity to reject the societal constraints getting dumped on them. Double unsurprisingly, this cult wasn't very popular with the society that made those constraints, which led to several centuries worth of attempts from various ancient Greek governments to outlaw the cult altogether, which never ever worked because wine and parties and sticking it to the man, will never die. So after this had failed enough times, eventually Greece settled on trying to control it a little bit, resulting in the establishment and gradual acceptance of the more chilled-out Hellenistic Dionysus we all know and love. It's tricky to put dates to this sort of deific character evolution, but we've got a few concrete milestones to work from. To start with, Dionysus is explicitly not in the Olympic pantheon during the 8th century BC, because that's when the Iliad and the Odyssey were written, and Dionysus is notably nowhere to be found. He and Hestia are the only ones of the traditional 12 Olympians to not be referenced, so this is a very noteworthy exclusion. Dionysus was officially integrated into Athens somewhere between 561 and 527 BC, because that's the duration of the reign of famous tyrant Pisistratus, who first brought the Dionysia to Athens. The Dionysia was a formerly rural celebration honoring Dionysus and celebrating the cultivation of wine. When Pisistratus imported it to Athens, it grew to incorporate a competition of performances and plays, which eventually produced the field of Greek theater overall. At this point, however, one gets the impression that Dionysus still wasn't fully popular with the Athenians, as Pisistratus justified the importation of the Dionysia with a myth that outlined all the horrifying things Dionysus could and would do to the dongs of the Athenians who rejected him. This is not a joke, and is also why the Dionysia would feature a parade of people carrying sculpted junk. Contemporary imagery of Dionysus also usually recalled an older visual, where he sported a beard and had an overall mature look, so at this point Dionysus has landed in Athens but hasn't fully transitioned to his popular young drunk hippie characterization yet. The next milestone comes to us from Euripides, who provides us with a literary missing link in the form of the Bacchae, first performed in 405 BC at the Dionysia festival. The Bacchae shows us a Dionysus in roughly the middle of his transition from terrifying god of uninhibited madness to party guy, as he returns to Greece from a globetrotting exile with an army of Maenads to claim his divine status and take revenge on a king who outlawed his worship. This Dionysus is the child of Zeus and Semele, born prematurely, roughly in accordance with the Hellenistic version we discussed earlier, but in this case the people of Thebes refuse to believe his divine origins, so he drives them crazy and claims them as his followers. After a sufficiently large number of shenanigans involving natural disasters and plagues of madness, Dionysus begins to warp King Pentheus' sanity, who begins to see through Dionysus' mortal disguise and notices that he has horns, another holdover from the older, scarier characterization that didn't make it to the Hellenized edition. King Pentheus winds up getting dismembered by Dionysus' Maenads, including some of Pentheus' female relatives, and it's a happy ending. or at least a cathartic one. This mid-transition Dionysian characterization shows us a Dionysus with a mortal mother, no explicit death and rebirth, a serious temper, no regard for the social structures that reject him, an army of crazed followers, the ability to induce madness and hallucinations in whoever he wants, and horns. Despite the absence of his dismemberment and rebirth in his Bacchae backstory, the theme is still held on in his worship, which is why Pentheus is dismembered in such a familiar way despite lacking the immediate mythical context. It also shows us that by 400 BC, Dionysus was basically considered an Olympian, even if his characterization wasn't quite all happy fun drunk just yet. I should probably just make the Bacchae its own video. But even though Dionysus has attained a level of chill deemed acceptable by polite Athenian society, he's still not really recognizable as the party dude we all know and love. He's getting there, but he's not there yet. So what's next? Well, here's the deal with that. The century after Euripides, a little something happened to Greece called Alexander the Great Gets All Up in Everyone's Business, during which time Alexander the Alright conquered his way through Persia, the Levant, and Egypt, radically expanding the ancient Greek world and paving the way for centuries of luxury for the kings that ruled this expanded Hellenistic world. These kings focused on two things and two things only: power and parties. And wouldn't you know it, there was an Olympian all set and ready to embody both of those things. Post the 300s BC, Dionysus' popularity exploded as the ruling class began embracing his extravagance and unrestrained party vibe, with the convenient undertone that Dionysus had been characterized as a conqueror for the past couple centuries, leading these kings to embrace his image even more strongly. Some of them even acted like they were Dionysus, but like, incarnated or something. A cult that had previously belonged largely to marginalized communities that threatened the ruling class was suddenly being embraced by that ruling class, because frankly, the cult of Dionysus threw the best parties. And what with all the wealth and power they had to throw around, the Hellenistic kings didn't really want to do anything but party. And with that, Dionysus completes his transformation from death god to party animal. Thanks to the nationalization of his cult during the Hellenistic period, Dionysus, or Bacchus as he was commonly called at this point, settled into his recognizable modern-day characterization, leaving the majority of his more alarming character traits behind. But this goes a long way towards explaining the lingering idiosyncrasies in his characterization. Dionysus probably had one of the most radical transformations in the entire pantheon, and while the toned-down recognizable version was mostly chill, he never completely lost the old-school death and madness god he used to be worshipped as. To torture a metaphor, both Dionysus and Greek wine were watered down for potability, but that didn't make them lose their inherent intoxicating properties. This also goes a long way to explaining why a pantheon of gods with concepts as big as war and wisdom and the entire ocean would bother having a god on the prayer roll whose entire job was being drunk.
Whew, I feel like I gotta hydrate after that. Like I said, I love the deep dives, but they're hard. So much research goes into them compared to the average myth summary, which is usually as easy as find a translation I like and then say it again but shorter. For the deep dives, I gotta go digging through so many different sources, connecting dots, looking into the actual physical archaeology rather than just the cleanly collated myths. It's tough to do and easy to mess up, and no matter how many times I say that I'm a funny haha YouTube channel and not a rigorous academic source, I still feel it like a punch in the gut every time I learn I messed something up. For instance, this next little myth turned out to be the victim of cytogenesis. When I was scripting it 7 years ago, I didn't dig far enough in the sourcing to catch that a whole plot beat was, as far as I can tell, someone's original character do not steal. Mortifying. Let's take a look.
So I think most people would agree that it's a bad idea to date most Greek gods. There's just so much drama, so many complicated family feuds, and the odds of you getting vaporized, shot, or turning into a plant are pretty astronomical. The threat is somewhat reduced if you happen to be a deity yourself, but even with that precaution, it's probably a good idea to steer clear of the more risky deities, like Aphrodite, who classifies everything anyone's ever done as either flirtation or deadly personal insult, or Poseidon, who wouldn't recognize consent if it jumped up and bit him in the trident. So let me introduce you to Nerites, a minor ocean deity and absolute madman whose only claim to fame is that, depending on the narrator, he dated both Aphrodite and Poseidon and actually survived. So, much like the story of Narcissus, who exactly Nerites is in love with varies from telling to telling. There's two versions of the story, one where the SO in question is Aphrodite, and the other where it's Poseidon. We'll talk about both versions in this video, but first we gotta talk about Nerites. Now, the two main things about Nerites is that, number one, he's the beautiful son of Nereus and the sea nymph Doris, and number two, he's young. Like, really young. In the ancient Greek world, this was a thing called pederasty, where adult men would have sexual relationships with adolescent boys, in an alleged effort to teach them how to be men. In the modern world, this is known as pedophilia, and it is very, very not okay. However, Nerites is also an immortal god, so he's kinda more like the ancient Greek male equivalent of those prepubescent anime girls who are actually 1,000-year-old dragons or elves or whatever, so it's really okay that we're using them for so much fan service, you guys. So if that makes you feel better about these romances, that's It's cool, I guess. It's always fun when a story from another time and place really drives home how different that society was by smacking you in the face with some hardcore moral dissonance. Anyway, moving on to the actual stories. Don't get comfy, they're pretty short. So, in this version of the myth, Aphrodite, before she rises from the ocean, drifts to the shores of Cythera, and becomes an Olympian god, is spending her days chilling under the sea when she meets and falls in love with Nerites, and the two of them carry on a vague but probably adorable whirlwind romance. But eventually Aphrodite decides to leave the ocean, and she asks Nerites to come with her. But Nerites doesn't really want to leave the ocean, since that'd mean leaving his family behind, and even when Aphrodite offers him a nice pair of wings, he refuses. So Aphrodite, with her characteristic level-headedness in the face of rejection, turns Nerites into a shrimp, gives the wings to her son Eros, and takes off for Olympus. But if you were expecting this story to have a classic Greek tragedy ending, think again. Nerites' sorry state is discovered by his sister Neria, who begs Poseidon to reverse his shellfish condition. Which Poseidon does. Happy ending, I guess. In the other main version of this myth, Poseidon and Nerites have been carrying on a pretty sweet romance, and in fact are so in love with each other that their mutually supportive relationship produces a whole entire deity, Anteros, the god of requited love. Nerites also serves as Poseidon's charioteer, and wows all the creatures of the ocean with his impressive speed and skill. But one day, the sun god Helios, for unspecified reasons, turns Nerites into a shrimp. Maybe he was jealous? Either way, Neria finds Nerites, asks Poseidon to turn him back, and he does. Happy ending! For extra comedy points, I like to imagine that both versions of the myth happen sequentially, and Nerites just gets turned into a shrimp for various reasons, like every other week.
Ugh. At this rate, I'm gonna turn into a shellfish. But honestly, I am so glad that when I tell you guys these stories, you look them up for yourselves. And sometimes that means you learn that I goofed. And then I get to learn I goofed. And once I get over the inescapable horrible torment, I get to be way more careful next time. When I retell these stories, it's not because I'm an authority on them. It's because I think they're really cool and I want to share them with everyone who's interested. I do my best to get everything right, but my degree is in math, a field of binary right and wrong where achieving an objectively correct solution is the entire thing we're good at. This is great for instance, mapping out all the ways astronomical myths are correlated to the actual stars in the actual sky, or for teasing out the connections and common themes that bind together an otherwise disorganized soup of stories. But I have to recognize that my ironclad sense of provable truth derived through logical steps doesn't always gel with a field that is literally 100% made up. It's tough for me to make my way through a space where there is no way to be 100% right and a million ways to be wrong. But the egg on my face aside, this fun little god squabble can be seen as a bit of a herald of things to come. When the gods have no one to fight, they tend to fight each other. And the one time they did have someone to fight, shit got absolutely crazy.
Ah, Zeus. You were so promising back in the day. Freeing your siblings, overthrowing your tyrannical father Kronos, casting the Titans into Tartarus, becoming Lord of the Heavens, and ruling the ancient world with wisdom you got from absorbing your first wife. That's such a strong start for the heroic king of the gods. And sure, you married your sister, but that was traditional for gods. It could have been way worse. And then you spent centuries screwing with humanity, punishing Prometheus for trying to help them out, commissioning Pandora specifically to screw them over, and systematically having sex with as much of the female population as you could manage by any means necessary. I mean, you're the king of the gods, Lord of Thunder. You have a killer aesthetic. I want you to be cool. You have so much going for you. But there's only so much I can respect a god who routinely turns himself into livestock specifically for the purpose of boning unsuspecting humans. Some days I just really want to see you get your ass kicked. So in the early days of ancient Greece, Zeus and the fam had just overthrown Kronos and cast the Titans into Tartarus, and by all accounts, Gaia wasn't too happy about her last batch of children getting slam-dunked into the underworld sewage outflow pipe. Now, because the modern image of Mother Nature is generally positive and nurturing, it can be easy to forget that personality-wise, Gaia covered all of nature. You know, storms, volcanoes, earthquakes, landslides. There's plenty of nice, happy tree stuff happening on the side, but in Greek mythology, Gaia mostly makes monsters, and this story is no exception. With Tartarus itself as the father, Gaia gives birth to the monstrous Typhon, a kaiju-sized eldritch abomination with loads of heads, flaming eyes, and just a whole bunch of snakes. Now, Typhon is unironically the biggest threat in Greek mythology. While primordial titans like Gaia and Uranos were physically bigger, they also had a lot less agency and didn't tend to directly oppose the gods. And while there were monsters aplenty, most of them were small enough that they could be taken down by one hero at a time, with maybe the bare minimum of divine assistance or the occasional flying horse. Typhon is in a weight class of his own. Physically huge and incredibly powerful, Typhon is more like a force of nature than a monster. He also plays into the Greek mythological succession cycle, where each ruler of the cosmos is successively overthrown by a new generation of gods. With Kronos defeating Uranos and Zeus defeating Kronos, Typhon is next in the lineup to take down Zeus and become the new ruler of the world. But before he starts off on any of the god fighting, the first thing he does is he goes and shacks up with the monstrous half-beautiful nymph, half-giant snake called Echidna.
It's not her fault, guys. It was her name first. Anyway, Typhon and Echidna have a bunch of monster babies, including the Chimera, the Hydra, the Sphinx, the Nemean Lion, and Kerberos. With that out of the way, and plenty of antagonists established for future generations of heroes to fight, Typhon marches towards Olympus to smack down some gods. Now, in a couple versions of the story, the Olympians are so spooked by this fire-breathing Godzilla-sized snake monster that they shapeshift into animals and run away all the way to Egypt, which is a little random until you notice that Artemis turns into a cat, Hermes turns into an ibis, Zeus turns into a ram, and yeah, basically, this is a little bit of early syncretism. It's specifically the ancient Greek explanation for why the Egyptians worshipped animal gods. As far as they were concerned, Bast was cat Artemis, Thoth was ibis Hermes, Amun was ram Zeus, etc. Pretty neat. But Zeus waits just long enough for the Egyptian artists to get his good side before turning back and hucking some lightning bolts at Typhon, driving the monster back before getting in close with an adamantine sickle. But when Zeus goes in for the kill, Typhon surprise grapples him and turns the tables by ripping out his tendons like he's a misbehaving chicken leg. So with Zeus's strength now roughly on par with a spaghetti plate, Typhon tosses him into a cave along with all of his loose tendons, and sets the half-beautiful nymph, half-enormous f*** you dragon Delphine to guard it. Surprisingly, she's apparently got no relation to Echidna, the other half-lady, half-snake thing in the story. Anyway, then Typhon wanders off to presumably do giant monster things like knocking over buildings and breathing fire. But luckily, unlike every other overthrown king of the cosmos, Zeus doesn't need to languish for long, as Hermes and Pan sneak into the cave, retrieve his tendons, and restring him like the world's horniest ukulele. Now back at full power and presumably very annoyed, Zeus charges off after Typhon and a truly epic battle commences. Earthquakes, volcanoes, fire everywhere, thunderbolts and lightning, very, very frightening me, you know, the works. Eventually, Zeus's thunderous assault wears Typhon down, and when he tries to run, Zeus responds with his characteristic sportsmanship and drops a mountain on his head. This produces the famous Mount Etna, one of the world's most active stratovolcanoes, and supposedly also the home to Hephaestus's forges, which seems like a bit of a workplace hazard, I'm not gonna lie. Takes a lot of work to beat out the inherent dangers of working in an active volcano, but an imprisoned mega kaiju in the next room over manages it pretty handily. Anyway, Typhon's imprisonment is used to explain why Mount Etna is always getting the rumblies, and he's also credited with being responsible for the world's ill winds that cause bad weather or bring storms. And fun fact, despite what one might assume, this is not actually the origin of the word typhoon, since while the etymologies are similar, typhoons don't happen in Europe, only in Asia. The word itself seems to have originated with the Chinese word for big wind, then been reinforced by the Arabic word for cyclonic storm, and finally lightly spiced with the Greek word typhon when it made the jump into English. I think the lesson here is that the real monster was the English language all along.
One of the really fun things about Greek mythology is its cyclic nature. Children overthrow their parents almost habitually, and it seems like half of what Zeus does for his job is frantically holding back that cycle from ever catching up to him. While plenty of antagonistic forces try to take their turn on the Great Wheel, none of them ever manage to win, and while Typhon definitely put on the most impressive showing, the giants also did manage to come kinda close. And while the Gigantomachy will not be making a showing in this mega compilation, we do have the next best thing.
Apparently, it doesn't take much to be the Olympian family disappointment. I mean, when you consider the competition Ares deals with from his siblings, you know, the drunken parties and the felonies and the constant murders, it's kind of impressive that Ares is the only one who seems to be actually disliked. Zeus is definitely the kind of parent who, like, conspicuously brags about only some of his children. Like at the family reunion, he'll be all like, "Hey Athena, how's my favorite war god doing?" And Ares is just like one chair over. It's almost unfair, but it's also hilarious. Now, mythologically speaking, it's a little hard to tell why Ares takes so much crap from everyone. The general theory is that Ares embodies the brutality of war, the violence, the suffering, basically all the ugly, unpleasant parts. Meanwhile, Athena gets to represent the more noble parts of war: strategy, tactics, leadership, etc. A handful of smaller gods covered other aspects of war, like Nike, goddess of victory. And while in some versions Ares is Nike's father, which is a positive connotation, on the battlefield Ares only brings 3 gods: his sons Phobos and Deimos, aka Fear and Terror, and his sister Enyo, war goddess of discord and strife. Ares brings all the bad stuff with him. And from this perspective, it makes sense why Ares would be vilified, but still worshipped. All of these bad aspects of war are non-negotiable. You don't like them, but if you want a war, you're gonna get them. You can't have a war without the ugly parts. Etymologically, Ares' name might even mean ruin or bane, which I guess would make him a necessary evil. That joke would have killed it 8 years ago. Anyway, Ares gets surprisingly little press in the mythology. He doesn't really make many appearances. I mean, he's in the Iliad, but he's not exactly the leading man, and he doesn't really come out looking very good. He most commonly shows up cameoing in other stories, or in his seminal role as Aphrodite's boy toy, and there aren't really that many stories about him. That's not to say he wasn't well liked in certain circles. The Spartans loved him, unsurprisingly, and the Homeric and Orphic hymns paint a pretty flattering picture, praising his glorious strength and indomitable spirit. which is gonna make this myth pretty embarrassing. So our story begins far from Olympus in the region of Thessaly, where two giants, Ephialtes and Otis, are weaving a very sinister plan. Now, Ephialtes and Otis aren't your garden variety giants. They're sons of Poseidon by a mortal woman, Iphimedeia, who also happens to be married to this dude, Aloeus, and in honor of their stepfather, the giants are called the Aloidae. Now, the Aloidae are sometimes credited as being bringers of civilization and were hailed as founders in the regions of Naxos and Askra. But none of that particularly matters right now, because the more important thing is that they're planning on kidnapping some goddesses to be their wives. Ephialtes has his eyes set on Hera, and Otis is enamored with Artemis. And I'm not here to critique anyone's kidnapping plans, but of all the goddesses you could have chosen, way to pick ones who are 100% guaranteed to not be down with it. Anyway, the main problem the Aloidae are currently dealing with is that Olympus is pretty tall and hard to climb. And while the timeline is a little screwy, the last time a bunch of giants tried to storm Olympus, they all died, mostly from getting shot and hit by lightning. Tactically speaking, charging uphill is always a little dicey, and Mount Olympus kinda cranks that up to 11. But the brothers hatch a plan to level the playing field a little, and the Olympians are very surprised one morning to find a whole stack of mountains on their front lawn. The Aloidae are piling mountains on top of each other to reach the summit of Mount Olympus. Obviously, the Olympians aren't down with that, and there's a bit of a scuffle, but when the dust settles and the giants run off, the gods notice that someone's missing. The giants have kidnapped Ares. Well, this is terrible. Awful. We have to do something. In 8 to 13 business months. Presumably not sure what else to do with him, the giants chain Ares up and lock him in a big bronze jar for an entire lunar year before their stepmother Erebos quietly contacts Hermes to let him know that Ares is stuck in her basement. I assume there's no other way to file a divine noise complaint. Anyway, with nothing else on their schedule, Hermes and Artemis embark on a rescue mission to the Aloidae's lair, and while Hermes sneaks around the back to find Ares, Artemis awkwardly props an elbow on the door and goes all, "Hello, boys. Looking for me?" So, after first getting over their shock at the presence of a real live girl in their man cave, Otis is overjoyed that his waifu of choice has made an appearance, but Ephialtes is jealous because his waifu hasn't, and the brothers start fighting. As the battle escalates, Artemis transforms herself into a deer and jumps between them. Not in a "boys, please, there's enough of me to go around" kind of way, more of a circular firing squad situation. When they throw their spears at her, she nimbly dodges out of the way, and they kill each other. With that problem handily solved, she and Hermes bust Ares out of the jar and head back to Olympus, presumably to roast him for the next 100 years. While the hero myths are very character-forward in spotlighting the unique strengths and flaws of the main guy so we can really get a feel for them before their inevitable horrific downfall and painful tragic death, the role humanity plays in the god-centric myths tends to be a little more broad strokes. After all, a lot of these stories are creation myths used to explain why the world the ancient Greeks lived in was like that. And of course, nothing required more justification and explanation than the existence of that most mysterious and elusive creature composing a mere 50% of everyone on Earth. Of course, the humble woman.
You know, mythology and folklore as a whole is a really incredible field to study. There's so much creativity and wonder, and it's really fun recognizing story elements that have persisted to the modern day or been adapted in one way or another to stories we actually recognize. But sometimes you find a myth that really reminds you that you're studying a different culture from a different time and place, and that culture from a different time and place might have held some pretty nasty attitudes towards your demographic specifically, and they didn't hesitate to document those attitudes for posterity, and that can kinda sting. So, this is the story of Pandora, the first woman whose entire gender was created by Zeus specifically to be evil and sexy and make men's lives worse. I'd like to apologize in advance for what the comment section is going to look like. So Pandora's story is told by Hesiod in the Theogony and Works and Days, and it begins in the Greek Golden Age, a time before women existed, when mankind had just recently been sculpted from clay by the Titan Prometheus, or possibly Zeus. Whatever the case, life was pretty swell. People were immortal, technology was alright, life was good. Now Prometheus apparently really liked humans, and he was always trying to look out for them wherever he could. So when he realized that they kept having to burn all the best bits of their meat as offerings to Zeus, he decided to do something about it. So he went to Zeus with two possible offerings: a nasty-looking ox stomach that was secretly full of prime beef, or a bone wrapped in delicious-looking fat that looked a lot tastier than it actually was. Zeus picked the tasty-looking option, and accidentally set a sacrifice precedent where humanity got to keep all the best bits of the cow and just burn bones and fat. So Zeus is pretty pissed, both because of the disappointing sacrifices he's getting, and Prometheus' sneaky subversion of his own supposed omniscience, and he decides to confiscate humanity's fire access as punishment. So this sucks for everybody, and Prometheus, again, decides to do something about it. So Prometheus sneaks up to Olympus and steals some fire, storing it in a fennel stalk while he brings it back to Earth and gives it to humanity again. Zeus spots the fire in the distance and gets crazy pissed at Prometheus, and decides to punish him first before he deals with humanity. Prometheus, rather famously, is chained to a rock, and his liver is ripped out and eaten by an eagle meal once a day. Of course, being an immortal titan, his liver also grows back every night, so the cycle can continue ad infinitum. Lucky Prometheus. So now this brings us to Pandora. Zeus decides to inflict a lasting punishment on humanity for reacquiring fire, and he conscripts all the Olympians to help him out. He has Hephaestus sculpt a beautiful body from clay and brings her to life with the four winds. Then Athena dresses her in fancy clothes, Aphrodite gives her a sex drive, Hermes gives her a brain and teaches her how to lie, and basically all of Olympus gets in on the action, giving her all kinds of nifty presents and character flaws. Hermes names her Pandora, meaning all gifted, or all giving depending on the translation, to represent the fact that every Olympian gave her a gift of some sort. The end result is that Pandora is a beautiful, alluring creature, but secretly she's also cunning and sly. You see, she's pure evil because she lures you in by being hot, but then, she's secretly a person underneath. That's right, Hesiod's vision of evil is hot, but not dumb. Pandora also, rather famously, has a Pythos with her that contains a whole mess of interesting evils to unleash on humanity. And interestingly enough, there's no implication in Hesiod's telling of the story that she's unaware of this, which doesn't really line up with later characterizations that paint Pandora as an insatiably curious dupe. Remember, this Pandora is specifically not an idiot. That's what makes her so evil. So Zeus presents Pandora to Prometheus' dumber brother Epimetheus, and despite having been warned by the forward-thinking Prometheus not to accept any gifts from Zeus, Epimetheus is a being of pure hindsight, and accepts her. This is a bad call, as Pandora promptly dumps out the contents of her jar full of evil, and humanity is immediately stricken with all kinds of nasty things, like natural lifespans and childbirth and Swedish fish. Only one thing stays in the jar: hope, representing the fact that humanity will always have hope. Greece, I love you, but come on.
The timeline of creation myths is always confusing, but in Greek mythology, the various contradictory narratives do still tend to agree on one thing. The world used to be easier. Before all those evils got let out into the world, before Kronos was overthrown, before the world got complicated and hard. The concept of a bygone golden age is absolutely everywhere, and we'll get back to that idea in a little more detail later on, but first there's a pretty famous foundational myth that locks in another little tidbit of mortal hardship we've all been dealing with: the turning of the seasons. And even if you've only ever dabbled in Greek mythology, there's a strong chance you've heard this tale before, or seen one of its 10 million reimaginings. It's the last of our deep dives, and we're gonna have to delve pretty deep for this one. Okay, let's not kid ourselves here. Relationships in Greek mythology are almost unilaterally really bad. Zeus and Hera get some flack for Zeus's non-stop adultering with extremely unwilling mortals, and Hera subsequently punishing the innocent mortals involved, but that's got nothing on the story of their actual marriage, which I will not be recounting here because it is so far from consensual there is no way for me to be funny about it. And far from consensual is a recurring theme in the mythos. Zeus, Poseidon, and Apollo especially tend to default to kidnapping when a pre-mortal catches their eye, sometimes combined with their whole divine shapeshifting dealio to trick or coerce those mortals into banging them. If the mortal is lucky, they survive the process and gain some superpowers or kick off a lineage of heroes. If they're not, they usually die horribly. Some of Apollo's famous lovers die tragically after a fulfilling personal relationship with him, but most of them die tragically trying to outrun him. That is straight up fucked, and everybody knows it. Check almost any Olympian god's list of lovers, and you'll usually find at least one character who super didn't want to be on that list. Yes, even your favorite. Yes, even Olympian soft boy Dionysus. And I will be the first to admit that I gloss over a lot of this stuff in my videos, and I do that because it makes me incredibly uncomfortable. Can you blame me? It's not like I'm the only one. I grew up with a freaking picture book that told me Zeus was a cool guy who had a lot of cool kids that did cool stuff. I watched a Disney movie about these people. I don't have an easy time reconciling the fact that these shining heroic figures that inspired so many incredible stories were characterized as absolutely garbage in several very key ways. And when I do talk about that stuff, it feels disingenuous to talk about anything else, as if that first thing isn't very much a deal breaker for finding the characters heroic or compelling. Basically, every modern retelling or reimagining of Greek mythology heavily sanitizes the stories in one way or another. The Greek pantheon gets given the same treatment as most beloved problematic celebrities. We love it for the stories it gave us, and we pretend not to notice the part where it won't stop assaulting underage fans, because that behavior doesn't fit the image we have of it. And that's because we, as a collective audience, are primed to think of gods as good guys. And good guys don't do that kind of thing. That'd make them bad guys. And that is exactly why only one Greek god gets consistently held responsible for these problematic behaviors. None other than Hades, Lord of the Dead and unjustified Satan analog. Because of our social biases, most of which come from a pop culture understanding of Christianity, which is the same source for our gods are necessarily good thing, a modern audience starts off primed to hate this guy. Lord of the Underworld? We all know what that means. Cartoon Lucifer, King of Hell, token evil divinity, blatant bad guy, easy peasy. And he kidnapped his wife? What an asshole. No wonder nobody hangs out with this guy. Man, what a jerk. Anyway, I just love Apollo. He's the hottest thing since hotness. And isn't it tragic how many of his true loves die? Wonder where that keeps happening. When retelling or reinterpreting ancient stories in a modern context, we almost always end up cherry-picking the parts that make the most sense to our modern worldview and sensibilities, and working around the parts that suffer from the worst of the culture clash. Ancient Greece was pretty cool about a lot of stuff, but women, for example, were not on that list. So from a modern perspective, when we look back at these original tellings, it's very difficult to see Zeus doing his thing and conclude anything other than that the king of the gods is an omnipotent serial rapist who leaves a trail of shattered lives and bastard children in his wake, and this pantheon is a fucking nightmare. But that is not the perspective a contemporary Athenian would have had, it's not the impact the contemporary storytellers would have wanted to produce, and it is not the image most modern writers want to attach to their Skyfather King of the Gods hero character. The idea that gods are supposed to be good is comparatively new. For the ancient Greeks, gods were reflections of what was true rather than what was ideal or morally right. Ancient Greece was terrible to women, so that was reflected in the gods. But to us, and our pervasive pop culture Christianity, deities and divinity-adjacent figures are thought of more like paragons, idealized representations of goodness and virtue. So when we try and apply that moralized perspective to the Greek gods, we get some serious cognitive dissonance. So the adaptations usually end up buffing it out. Sure, in all but the most squeaky clean versions, Zeus is usually still cheating on Hera, which from our societal perspective is typically seen as a much more forgivable crime, especially if you also rewrite Hera to be as deliberately unlikable as possible, the Romans. But most of Zeus's trysts get rewritten as affairs of the heart, because those are almost universally seen as significantly less bad than the non-consensual alternative, a distinction that did not exist in ancient Greece. Among other things, ancient Greek art used a lot of stock poses to signify major story beats, and there was literally no distinction between the stock pose for kidnapping and for marriage. Same result, same concept. What registers as an unforgivable crime to our eyes wasn't even recognized in the culture it came from. This specific culture clash is pretty significant, which is why this is the part that mostly gets ignored, sanitized, or otherwise rewritten for modern audiences. I mean, unless you're Hades. Because fuck him, right? We already hate that guy on principle. There's no need to clean up his image so a modern audience will like him. In fact, maybe it's better if we make him deliberately worse, just so people know who they should be rooting against. So, with that lengthy and spicy preamble out of the way, let's talk about Hades and Persephone. Now, these two show up off and on throughout the mythology, but their best-known myth, the story of how they got married, is recounted in the Homeric hymn to Demeter, written sometime around the mid-600s BCE. This is pretty much the only detailed source we have for this myth, although references to Persephone's abduction pop up in broad terms in the Theogony and the general folklore. The hymn begins with Persephone chilling in a flower field when the ground splits open, Hades erupts from the earth in a chariot, grabs her, and dives back underground. The narrator helpfully informs us that this abduction was sponsored and ordered by Zeus, Persephone's father, because Hades was in love with Persephone, but Zeus didn't think Demeter would approve, so he told him, just kidnap her, never fails for me. Demeter, of course, panics when she realizes Persephone's gone and tears off in a fury looking for her. Nobody has any idea where she might be until Demeter runs into Hecate, the chthonic goddess of magic, who tells her she didn't see anything, but she heard Persephone being abducted. The goddesses continue searching together and eventually seek out Helios, titan of the sun, who, from his lofty vantage point, conveniently saw everything. He tells Demeter that Persephone was taken by Hades, but the blame is all on Zeus, who approved the kidnapping and gave Persephone to Hades as his wife. So this isn't really a kidnapping so much as it is an arranged marriage. Demeter is furious, but Helios tells her, hey, she could do a lot worse for her son-in-law. Hades is a pretty cool dude, and as king of the underworld, his divine domain is nothing to sneeze at. As firstborn son of Kronos, the world was his by birthright, and even if there's a bit of a delay, everyone becomes his subject eventually. Hades is basically the best husband Persephone could ever hope for, but that's pretty cold comfort for Demeter, who evidently didn't want Persephone getting married at all. She takes a bit of personal time off and disguises herself as an old woman, and ends up getting a part-time job as a nurse to the royal family of Eleusis. Fun fact, a major cult center of Demeter and Persephone that we'll talk about more later. Demeter cares for the baby prince Demophon in her own unique way, by setting him on fire. Don't freak out, it's totally cool. She's just burning away his mortality little by little, making him more and more godlike as he grows. But one unlucky night, his mother Metanira spots Demeter setting her baby on fire and freaks out, disrupting the ritual and pissing off Demeter something fierce, which at this point is becoming a running theme. Demeter reveals her true identity and orders them to build her a temple as an apology, and when they do, Demeter takes up residence in her fancy new chateau. But she's still really pissed off and sad about Persephone, so she sits back and has a nice little sulk about it for a while. It's okay, sometimes you just gotta get it out of your system. One little problem though, Demeter is responsible for all plant growth, grain, fruit, vegetables, the works. Livid at the loss of her daughter, Demeter stops the plants from growing, shrouding the world in eternal winter and straight up killing quite a lot of people. Now, I think we can all agree that people are very important. After all, without people, we wouldn't have any divine sacrifices. So the Ice Age and the mass casualties draw the attention of Zeus, who notices Demeter seems really upset for some strange reason. He sends Iris, goddess of the rainbow, to summon Demeter, but she ain't budging. Zeus realizes this might be a problem and sends the other gods to try and convince Demeter to stop, with offerings, gifts, anything. But none of those things are Persephone, so Demeter is unmoved. Desperate to escape the consequences of his actions, Zeus sends Hermes to Hades to see if he can convince him to let Persephone return return to the surface. Hermes scoots down to the underworld and finds the couple. Well, this part of the text is a little bit garbled, but basically Hades and Persephone are hanging out, and Persephone seems kind of bummed out and missing her mom. Hermes explains the whole Demeter murdering everyone situation, and Hades is like, oh balls, that doesn't sound good. Yeah, no, Persephone, absolutely go and talk to her. He also takes a minute to ask Persephone not to be sad. As his wife, she'll be a queen of queens, ruler of the dead and highest among the goddesses, and meanwhile, he will work to be the best husband he can be for her. Overjoyed, Persephone prepares to leave for the surface and see her mom again. But before we pat Hades on the back too hard, he does get worried that Persephone might never come back to him, so he sneaks her a few pomegranate seeds to bind her to the underworld. How that works exactly isn't really explained, mostly because this part of the only manuscript that preserves this hymn is actually torn. Gotta love those primary sources. Anyway, when the signal fuzzes back into focus, Hermes and Persephone are explaining to Demeter that Persephone can't permanently leave the underworld, presumably because of the whole pomegranate situation, so she'll have to split her time between Demeter and Hades. Demeter's just happy to have her back and stops the whole killing everybody thing, producing spring for the first time. Zeus, finally having the audacity to show his face, confirms that Persephone will need to spend roughly 1/3 of the year in the underworld. The exact fraction varies from telling to telling, but broadly, when she's not around, Demeter gets all bummed again and stops letting the plants grow as a fun callback to that time she nearly killed the entire planet, explaining the seasonal cycle very handily. With our status quo firmly established, the hymn ends. Now, there's a few surprising things about this story. For one thing, the hymn itself goes out of its way to absolve Hades of all responsibility except for the pomegranate bit. Everything else is on Zeus as father of the bride and authorizer/orderer of the kidnapping. Hades as wicked villainous kidnapper is a later interpretation unsupported by the original framing. And perhaps more surprisingly, Persephone's role in the coming of spring is fully incidental. It's Demeter bringing the world back to life, which means, functionally, Persephone isn't the goddess of spring. Spring is Demeter's job. The only thing Persephone is explicitly the goddess of is the underworld. And if we go looking through the rest of the mythology, we only find more evidence for this. The Theogony refers to the couple as stalwart Hades and dread Persephone. The Iliad does the same thing. Hades gets a few anecdotes, but is mostly referred to obliquely when the text calls the underworld the House of Hades. Meanwhile, Persephone gets name-dropped as dread Persephone on the regular. In the Odyssey, when Odysseus travels to the underworld and is tormented by ghosts, he assumes Persephone must be responsible for their actions. None of this lines up tonally with innocent flower goddess dragged into the underworld. Persephone is a straight-up queen of the dead, and if we dig a little deeper, things start looking even weirder. First of all, when we do our standard dive into Mycenaean records, we find that we have no actual evidence that Hades predates ancient Greece. And that's weird, because we have plenty of evidence that Demeter and Persephone do. Both of them are referenced in Mycenaean Linear B texts under various titles, including the collective Wanaso, meaning the two queens. And remember that, we'll come back to it later. Zeus and Poseidon also have clear Mycenaean counterparts, but not Hades. And that wouldn't be super weird if it weren't for the fact that the story of Persephone's descent into the underworld also seems to predate ancient Greece, and by extension, Hades. Now, just because we cannot find his name in Linear B does not strictly mean that Hades didn't exist in some form, but we do know that in the Mycenaean inscriptions we have, the role of king of the underworld was filled by Poseidon, which would have made Hades' role redundant, and Poseidon is frequently referred to collectively with the Wanaso with the epithet Wanax, meaning the king, implying that Mycenaean Poseidon, Demeter, and Persephone were worshipped together in some form of trio capacity. So even if the kidnapper figure wasn't Hades back in the Mycenaean days, Demeter and Persephone were still mixed up with the king of the dead. Anyway, the Homeric hymn is the main written account we have of the abduction myth, but it was also ritually reenacted every year at the Eleusinian Mysteries, an initiation rite for the cult of Demeter and Persephone at Eleusis. We don't know what exactly they entailed, because the whole thing with mystery cults is that they kept their exact rites secret, but the theory is that it was originally derived from an agrarian Mycenaean religious ritual that predates the Greek Dark Age. The central theme of the mystery seemed to be the three-part journey of Persephone, her descent into the underworld, staying in the underworld while Demeter looked for her, and her ascending out of the underworld to reunite with Demeter. Hades had a part in the mystery as it was practiced in ancient Greece, but if it's as old as the theory believes, Hades might not have existed when it started in the Mycenaean age. And he's not as central to the narrative structure as Persephone and Demeter. He's basically just a walking inciting incident to get Persephone into the underworld in the first place. He might not have been strictly necessary in the Mycenaean version, which is good because as near as we can interpolate, he can't have been in it, or at least not as the character we recognize later. And on top of that, the whole descent into and ascent out of the underworld thing is a very common story structure in Indo-European mythology, as we've talked about with Ishtar, and that base story format does not require an abduction. And that's not the only instance in the mythology where Hades takes a back seat. Persephone and Demeter are central to a very ancient Arcadian mystery cult that doesn't seem to factor in Hades at all. In Arcadia, Demeter and Persephone are collectively referred to as Despoinai, meaning the mistresses, which you may note is quite similar to the Linear B Wanaso Two Queens title. In Arcadia, Persephone was also individually called Despoina, the mistress, and this gets a bit confusing because Despoina is sometimes described as distinctly separate from Persephone, and by sometimes I mean exclusively by Pausanias in the 200s AD, fully 800 years after the Homeric hymns, and apparently by nobody else. Other than him, basically everyone seems to recognize that Despoina is Persephone, but it's hard to say for certain, both because mystery cults keep their secrets, and because Despoina's whole deal was that her true name was forbidden. Only those initiated in her mysteries were allowed to know or speak it. So it might have been Persephone, but we're not allowed to know. The Arcadian mystery cult of the Despoina is theorized to straight up predate the Greek-speaking immigrants to the region, so Demeter and Persephone might have originally been the Greekified version of a very ancient duo of spooky eldritch goddesses. Also, fun fact, in Arcadia, Despoina is seen as a child of Demeter and Poseidon rather than Zeus, and more confusingly, everyone involved in that particular story is shaped like a horse. Demeter turns into a horse to outrun Poseidon, Poseidon turns into a horse to chase her down, they have a beautiful horse baby who later grows into Despoina, aka Persephone. That is too many horses. Put those back. But it also does parallel that weird connection we noted between Poseidon and the queens in the Mycenaean version. There's also more confusion about Persephone's name specifically, because in some parts of the mythology, usually when discussing the time before her abduction, she's referred to as Kore, meaning maiden. Now, unlike Persephone, Kore does occasionally get specifically referenced as a nature goddess. But the other weird thing about that is that Kore is a really vague title. Maiden is the classy translation. It's equally valid to say it just means girl. And that sounds a hell of a lot like a vague pseudonym you use when you can't say their name, like in the case of Despoina, and more notably, Hades. See, underworld gods were scary as hell, pun intended, and it was generally believed that calling them by name was a really good way to get their attention, which was a scary bad thing. So rather than saying Hades' name outright, he'd mostly get called by epithets or euphemisms, like the one with many names, or the one who receives many guests, which has the bonus benefit of sounding raw as hell. So we've got Persephone, which is, as near as we can tell, her actual name, but we've also got two extremely vague but very distinct titles, Kore and Despoina, that seem to have been pseudonyms originally arising from people specifically playing it safe and trying not to get her attention. Pre-Socratic philosopher Empedocles actually calls her Nestis, which supposedly means the fasting one. All these vague nicknames and pseudonyms lend some pretty significant credence to the idea that Persephone's oldest version, whatever it was really, really scary. Like, don't speak her name, you might get her attention scary. And the fact that Persephone has potentially over 1,000 years of secret mystery history, while the first concrete confirmation we have of Hades' existence is the Iliad, is actually kind of reflected in how they're characterized in the actual mythos, because Hades doesn't actually do much. He rules the underworld and shows up whenever someone visits, but he doesn't, go out and do stuff. He's pretty passive most of the time. Even in his own core myth, he takes a backseat to the core mother-daughter drama. Persephone and Demeter have so much going on, we literally can't tell how many other goddesses and chthonic rituals might be caught up in their personal mythology, but Hades is exactly what it says on the box. He feels simpler. Now, this might be because the underworld kind of creeped the ancient Greeks out, so they avoided talking, thinking, or writing about it in case they attracted its attention. But while that would explain Hades' broadly inoffensive and generally lawful characterization, it wouldn't really explain why Persephone, also a dread underworld deity, is disproportionately so much more complicated than him. Now, it's impossible to be sure about almost anything about this, but my guess, and this is just me theorizing, is that Persephone as dread queen of the underworld is probably her oldest characterization, and all her other names and versions came from the deliberate vagueness people used when talking about her because of how scary she was. The flowery Kore spring goddess stuff seems to have been a later retcon to give her some pre-underworld lore that wasn't reflected in how she was actually worshipped. And if I can get a little wilder in my speculation, I think Hades might have started off as an offshoot of Mycenaean Poseidon. Now, as we've discussed, Mycenaean Poseidon was king of the underworld, and he had an unclear but definitely extant connection to Demeter and Persephone. In fact, in some Minoan and Mycenaean cults, there was a very widespread duality between the paired figures of a god of the underworld and a goddess of nature, and in the Mycenaean version, that god of the underworld role was filled by Poseidon, and the goddess of nature seems to have been Demeter, although there is some debate over that. The parallels keep popping up, but after the Greek Dark Age, Poseidon was definitely not the king of the underworld anymore, and that connection to the Despoinai was mostly lost, and Hades got it instead. So this might be another Hermes situation, where Hermes started off as a specialized epithet for Pan before getting carved off into his own god. If Poseidon's king of the underworld duties got peeled off during the Dark Age and formed a new god filling an ancient role, that'd account for the discrepancy and why Hades is curiously absent from the pre-Dark Age sources, and barely factors into the Homeric stories either. It'd also potentially indicate that in the pre-Dark Age roots of the abduction story, Poseidon filled some variation of the role that later belonged to Hades. This is 100% my own crack theory, though. I cannot find anyone else making this connection, and there is no ironclad textual evidence to support this. We are fully in the thumbtacks and string zone here. But if there's one thing that we can definitely take away from this, it's that this is a uniquely snarled part of the mythos. There's a ton of moving parts, epithets, and pseudonyms making everything confusing. This is not helped by the fact that there's also a lot of widely accepted misinformation about the story in general and Persephone specifically. On one side, there's the misinterpretation that Persephone's abduction was a horrifyingly violent assault, which stems from the fact that the ancient word for kidnap has taken on much more unpleasant connotations over the centuries, which was not its original application in the story. And on the other end of the misconception spectrum, there's the fairly modern idea that in the original version of the myth, Persephone willingly walked into the underworld and the kidnapping thing was a later retcon to strip away Persephone's agency and girl power. I trace this telling all the way back to the archaic era of 1978, when author Charlene Spretnak wrote Lost Goddesses of Early Greece, a collection of pre-Hellenic myths, which was intended to make the mythology more palatable for her young daughter since she didn't want to expose her to all the kidnapping and sexual assault. This book attempted to interpolate what a theoretical pre-patriarchal no-kidnapping version of the myth might have looked like, but it has no sources because there are no pre-Hellenic pre-kidnapping sources for this story. We just don't have them. They don't exist. So this is fanfic. And that's fine. People have been writing Greek mythology fanfic since before there was Greek mythology, but it is definitely not the original version because we straight up do not know the original version. At this point, we'll probably never know the original version. This book was then later adapted by Marjorie Graham, without crediting Spretnak by the way, into a beautifully illustrated retelling that advertised itself as the much older, pre-patriarchal version of the myth, and what is thought to be the goddess-worshipping Bronze Age version of the tale, which is the nice way of saying that this is completely unsourced and I hate it. See, this is how misinformation spreads, people. This is cytogenesis in action. Cite your sources or admit you don't have any. But myth conceptions aside, at its core, the story of Hades and Persephone is surprisingly compelling. They are 100% the most functional canon relationship in Greek mythology. Among other things, Persephone is in the extremely rare position of sharing equal power and authority with her husband. They also never cheat on each other, and whenever someone tries to intrude on the relationship by kidnapping or seducing one of them, the other one does something really nasty to the intruder. This is all just canon. We don't even need to sweep any indiscretions under the rug. It's just there. And that's why this story is so incredibly popular with modern writers. There are at this point dozens of reimaginings of their relationship, and while some of them lean into the Hades as Satan angle for some easy villainy, most of them focus on the strange and contradictory beauty of the ultimate pastel goth love story. Their relationship started with an arranged marriage, kidnapping, and a near apocalypse, and seamlessly transitioned into the most functional love story in the entire mythos. That is a fascinating scenario for writers to explore, from Lore Olympus reframing the controversial parts of their love story as a matter of unreliable narrators, to Supergiant Games as Hades, painting Hades and Persephone as deceiving the other gods with the story of the original myth, to Hades Town playing up how strained and tragic their love has become over the years. There's tons of complexities to explore. This story has the worst rep out of any Greek myth because of the whole Hades is bad guy bias we start with, but when we pull back the curtain of societal preconceptions and look at the real story as the ancient Greeks told it, we find a very strange and surprisingly loving relationship between two very different people. It's beautiful, and it's basically the only relationship in Greek mythology that is actively less horrifying when you read the original version. But all justifications and recontextualization aside, don't kidnap your loved ones. Not even if their dad tells you to. We know better now. One interesting thing about Greek mythology is that while everyone agrees that the world used to be better, there are a lot of competing theories as to why. Inventing bullshit seasons instead of just letting the weather be nice all the time is a pretty compelling reason, but way back in the day, Hesiod proposed a different trigger for where it all went wrong: the downfall of Kronos. According to the model of the 5 ages of man, everything was great until Zeus showed up and ended the thriving golden age where mortals automatically lived long, happy lives. That's a rough review, my guy. But then again, Zeus's siblings basically spent that golden age as Omelas kids suffering in vague digestive torment while Kronos kept that golden age running topside, so maybe it was okay and even perhaps understandable for them to burn it to the ground a little bit. But one goddess didn't seem to think so, and her name is Astraea. I'm not an expert. This is one of my favorite things about myself. I love learning new things. I'm not so good at continuing to learn old things. When they coined that phrase about being a jack of all trades, master of none, they were talking about me. But even though I'm not an expert, being, as they say, in the sauce about Greek mythology for the better part of a decade has inadvertently given me something of a feel for the terrain. So when I'm out in the wilds of the internet hunting down fun new stories to tell, sometimes I get a little bit of a whiff, you know? Just the faintest smell of bullshit. Every field of art has its forgeries, works that their creators thought wouldn't be impactful enough if they were presented on their own merits, so instead they have a whole historical context stapled onto them after the fact. This painting isn't just nice, it's a lost Da Vinci. This story isn't just a fun little tale, it's an ancient Native American legend. This bite-sized anecdote isn't just a slice of good advice, it's an ancient Chinese proverb or something. There are so many of these, and they make me so mad. Not just because their supposed ancient origins are frequently blatantly chosen for their tropey exoticization to make them seem foreign and mystical and hard to contact the supposed source to corroborate, but mostly they make me mad because they're lies. They muddle an already extremely complicated field to research, and if I get duped by one, which has happened, I end up perpetuating misinformation. So I've developed a bit of a spidey sense for when a story feels a little too new to be true. The time-traveling goatfish we discussed back in the Zodiac video, too many bits of that story that just did not fit the tone of the classic Greek greats. The Greek goddess of torture and punishment that Tumblr made up for funsies smelled that spiral-bound notebook doodle OC a mile off. But I'm not an expert. And that means sometimes I stumble into something that sounds too good to be true, and when I go digging, it turns out to be real. And that is such a rare joy for me that I cannot wait to tell you about this one. So today let's talk about Astraea, the goddess of the constellation Virgo, which is now available in our Crowdmade shop as the latest installment in our glow-in-the-dark Zodiac enamel pins collection. Get them while they're gettable. To start our journey, I'm gonna do the one thing you're never supposed to do. I'm gonna read you a few lines from Astraea's Wikipedia page. I just want you all to understand why I started off suspicious. Astraea is the virgin goddess of justice, innocence, purity, and precision. Astraea, the celestial virgin, was the last of the immortals to live with humans during the Golden Age, one of the old Greek religion's 5 deteriorating ages of man. And last but not least, according to myth, Astraea will one day come to Earth, bringing with her the return of the utopian Golden Age of which she was the ambassador. So, this is fine. Everything here is totally plausible. Except it's got this vibe that a lot of fake lore, which is what it's called, which I love, shares, which is this sort of surprisingly modern set of tropes. For one thing, Astraea's godly domain is extremely thematically coherent while still covering a decent amount of ground. A god of both justice and innocence makes a lot of sense. Those two things are connected, and looping in purity plays well with the rest of it too. The thing is, real mythologies frequently do not do that. Zeus is a god of the sky and storms, but he's also the god of divine hospitality and the maker of heroes. Poseidon is the god of the ocean, and also earthquakes and horses. In Greek mythology, it's very common for gods to either have about 1 million seemingly unrelated divine characteristics, or to have one single concept as their entire deal. For instance, Eos is the goddess of the dawn, and that's basically all she does. But modern-day fictional deities in fantasy settings are purposefully written and world-built to cover a single, neatly partitioned slice of the universe, and they usually get given a tightly woven set of godly duties that all thematically resonate with one another, or a singular gimmick that gives them a nice, simple personality to play with. A quick scroll through the gods in D&D communicates that pretty cleanly. You want a god of justice? Human-shaped or dragon-shaped, we got you covered. You want a god of the sea? We got like 3 of them. If you don't mind a bit of a crowd, we can bring in all our gods of war. So Astraea's extremely thematically clean divine domain was a little bit sus, and the thing about her being the last immortal to still live with humanity was also, to my eyes, suspiciously modern. It implied, again, some hard world building that just generally isn't found in classical mythology, which was built up slowly over the course of thousands of years of changing generations of people. In Greek mythology, the gods aren't walled off from humanity. The only time a no interference clause comes up explicitly is in the Trojan War, and even then it's constantly ignored. Throughout the entire rest of the corpus of Greek mythology, the gods are constantly dealing with humans, popping in to help out directly or sire more kids or spawn a few monsters in case everyone was getting a little too cozy. So this idea that the rest of the gods had dipped out of the mortal world early on, while Astraea, this pure, wonderful goddess of goodness, had lived with humanity through their waning morals but had eventually reached her breaking point and reluctantly turned her back, it felt, to me, very unusual. In fact, what it really felt like was reminiscent of some of the stuff Tolkien got up to in the Silmarillion. That's right, bitches, I've actually read it now. It's fine. Anyway, I was getting big Fall of Numenor energy off this bit, and I wanted to know more. So, of course, the first thing I did was go looking at the sources, and to my genuine surprise, all of this stuff is mythologically supported. So it probably had Tolkien energy because Tolkien had read the same things I did. Aratus's Phenomena, a book of constellations and general astronomy information written between 300-ish and 250 BCE, lays it out pretty clearly, with a few bonus details provided by Ovid's Metamorphoses a few centuries later. Astraea, an immortal goddess, makes the unusual choice to live among humans in their earliest days, a pastoralist golden age where the land is bountiful, conflict is non-existent, and everything is wonderful all the time. Hilariously, one explicit way the writers communicate that this is a simple age of boundless idealism is that nobody has even considered building a boat. Don't go into the ocean, everyone! That's where the sin lives! Ovid adds the detail that this golden age was when the Titans ruled the world under Saturn, aka Kronos, father of Zeus, who of course overthrows Kronos and ushers in the Age of the Gods, which embarrassingly is considered a downgrade from a golden age to a silver one. Zeus nixes the eternal springtime and introduces a seasonal breakup, forcing the fledgling humans to start constructing homes to shelter during extreme temperatures and invent agriculture to not starve. Astraea is not super happy with the events of the Silver Age, and she's disheartened that humanity is becoming increasingly more conflicted. Her primary godly move is to advocate for mercy and understanding when justice is called for, but she's not happy with the Silver Age, and she likes its sequel even less. The Bronze Age, quickly followed by the Iron Age, sees humanity discover the evils of war and money, which from Aratus' perspective is just war with extra steps. Disgusted with humanity's newfound penchant for violence and, even worse, seafaring, Astraea finally turns her back on humanity and retreats to the heavens above, becoming the constellation Virgo. And that's all fine and dandy. Ovid's source alone is good enough for me. He may be biased, but this isn't the kind of story he tended to dubiously embellish from nothing, and Aratus' source just adds even more legitimacy, proving that Astraea wasn't just a Roman concept and dated back to ancient Greece. Plus, these stories have some fascinating implications about the vibes the writers were living through. Aratus and Ovid both were firmly of the opinion that they were living in the shitty, terrible Iron Age. The world had once existed in this beautiful, primeval, pastoralist state where the land provided everything humanity needed without requiring any work. But a divine overhaul and a tragic downfall into petty selfishness and greed had left humanity constantly at war with itself, miserable and hungry and cruel. And sailing! Are there no depths to which we won't sink? And there's a lot here that I think is super interesting. Like, again, getting back to the trope perspective, when a modern Western writer wants to communicate that an empire is unimaginably powerful and decadent and wealthy, they make it look like Rome. Aesthetically, we associate it with an empire at the height of its glory, and the writers from that civilization were like, this is disgusting, I wish we could go back to eating berries in the woods. Amazing. I guess the grass is always greener on the other side of the course of empires. But okay, we've got that settled. Astraea was a real deity, she was associated with justice and innocence and purity and stuff, but it was really that last bit about Astraea that made me profoundly suspicious. You know, the prophecy. See, there are some mythological prophecies that perpetuate out into the modern day, but there are not many of them. Most of them take the form of this true king is buried in this mountain and he will rise again in his country's greatest hour of need, which is conveniently self-non-fulfilling. When, in response to whatever current crisis is rearing its ugly head, the dead guy fails to bust out of his mausoleum with sword in hand, it just kicks the greatest hour of need down the road and implies he won't wake up until things find a way to get even worse. So these prophecies can hang around in cultural perpetuity without too much trouble. In myths, prophecies are usually short-term tragedy bait, whimsical little bites of the near future that only exist to doom their hapless protagonist into meeting their destiny on the road they take to avoid it. Prophecies are one of those things that modern writers cannot get enough of, but they are, in my experience, very unusual in mythology. I mean, you can tell, because I haven't used that "the prophecy" musical sting joke in 8 real years. That's a good bit, and I just never get the chance. And the reason why this mythical figure has an ongoing prophecy about them is especially suspicious is because it's the kind of thing people love co-opting to support whatever social, cultural, or political agenda they think they can most convincingly staple it to. Especially one as vague as, her return will signify the dawn of a new golden age. Bitch, that could mean anything. But shockingly, this bit is also real. Virgil's 4th eclogue says it in plain Latin. Virgin Justice, aka Astraea, returns, and with her the reign of Saturn, again Kronos, and an accompanying golden age. Even more than that, Virgil's funky little prophecy, credited to the Cumaean Sibyl, says that this ringing in of a new golden era will be accompanied by the birth of some amazing kid who will personally lead this world to paradise. And he was coincidentally writing this around 40 BCE, so within a few scant decades, this little tidbit was going to reach its first pile of people really eager to explain how it totally applied to their personal choice of Messiah. The popular read, for the record, is that Virgil was actually writing about the predicted future kid of Mark Antony and Augustus' sister Octavia, a union that would have handily stitched 2/3 of the triumvirate back together, but this is what happens when your prophecies are vague. They get Jesused, which, not to criticize, I feel like a good oracle should have probably seen coming. And it somehow managed to get even vaguer. See, once the Renaissance started and there was a whole crop of powerful queens popping up across Europe, it became extremely hip and cool to conflate every single one of them with Astraea, returned in the form of this one lady to usher in that new golden age everyone was talking about, and to prove conclusively that their empire was just as amazing and wonderful as the great empires of the ancient past had been in the glory days. The Holy Roman Empire hasn't fallen off, guys. It's just as good as it used to be. And now it's got holy in front of it. Anyway, the short of it is, I was right to be suspicious of this prophecy thing, not because it wasn't a real part of the early mythology, but because its prominence in the story of Astraea is 100% the consequence of it being so politically and religiously useful so many times, which is also dishonest, but the classy kind of dishonest that cites its sources and makes me even angrier. So the world this mythology is shaping is starting to look kind of familiar. We've got fire, that's pretty handy since now we've also got winter. We've got evils plaguing humanity, that seems about right. The gods are pretty well established. They've weathered some trials and tribulations. The bleeding hearts that think maybe they should be nicer to the mortals have handily turned themselves into stars and fucked off, and we're about locked into the Olympian pantheon we've been expecting. If the gods are officially sorted, it sounds like it's a great time to start playing games with the lives of men. And what better place to start than the best city that's ever been invented, according to the deep thinkers and phenomenal poets of the completely unbiased third party that is Athens.
When studying the ancient world, it becomes very clear very quickly that Athens is the archetypical shining city on the hill and the singular foundation of the greatest civilization in history, according to Athens. If you ask anyone else, of course, the story is very different. The fact is, for the majority of ancient Greek history, Athens was one of the smaller potatoes rattling around. It gets the barest of mentions in Homer's epics around the 800s BCE, where Athens is brought up once in the infamous boat list chapter of the Iliad, and its sole representative hero, Theseus, isn't even mentioned and didn't really start getting any major press till the Romans rolled up around the turn of the millennium. Athens only scraped together the barest possible claim to fame in 490 BCE when they won the Battle of Marathon, and spent the next few decades gradually building up momentum before taking their place center stage starting in the mid-400s. After that, the first priority appeared to be making up for lost time, and Athens was pretty quick to start constructing narratives where they were actually always the coolest kids on the block and everybody knew it all along. We've touched on this in some earlier videos, like how in the mid-300s BCE, Plato spent the bulk of his dialogues Timaeus and Critias talking about how the ancient empire of Atlantis was single-handedly defeated thousands of years prior by the totally real ancient Athenians by virtue of how totally rad and Athenian and real they were. But Plato was far from the only one, and the most illustrative example of this retroactive spotlight hogging is probably Athens' official founding myth. Now, before we talk about the government-issued founding myth written after Athens became actually important, let's briefly touch on what the Athenian founding myth looked like before Athens hit it big. Don't worry, it's short. In the Iliad's boat chapter, Athens is referred to as a well-built citadel and the land of great-hearted Erechtheus. Now, that's all we get about Athens at this point, but Erechtheus, sometimes also called Erichthonius, the culture hero slash first king of Athens, is a fairly interesting figure who has a little more detail. For one thing, he's autochthonous, meaning born from the earth. Essentially, he's one of Gaia's direct offspring. Gaia is mostly known for giving birth to monsters, and Erechtheus isn't entirely an exception. He's frequently described as having serpentine or draconic features, in some versions having warped or snake-like legs that make him difficult for him to walk. But he's also not just Gaia's kid. The actual story of his birth is, well, frankly, pretty gross. Basically, according to Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca, Athena decides she wants some new weapons, so she goes to commission Hephaestus for some, but instead of just taking the commission, Hephaestus is struck by her beauty and tries to assault her. This obviously doesn't work out so hot for him, given that she's a war goddess and his legs don't even work, but as a result of certain icky parts of the process, Erechtheus is conceived by Hephaestus and born from the earth itself, and Gaia hands off the baby to Athena. Sources vary on how Erechtheus' childhood went, but TLDR, he ends up as the king of Athens, erects a statue of Athena in the Acropolis, founds the Pan-Hellenic Games, and, most interestingly I think, invents the chariot to help compensate for his own limited mobility. It's not really surprising that Erechtheus is the offspring of Hephaestus. Being a disabled inventor is pretty on brand. This myth is also interesting because sometimes Athena was credited as the first charioteer when she was referred to with the epithet Hippia, meaning of horses. A lot of modern pop culture Greek mythology says that she and Poseidon invented the chariot together, but unfortunately that apparently isn't sourced anywhere. Athena as first charioteer is corroborated with the epithet, but if there was ever a more detailed myth about this, it unfortunately doesn't seem to have survived beyond a single anecdotal epithet. So that's pretty neat, but it's not really about Athens, is it? It's just about this cool king of Athens. And that's about the coolest story Athens had to offer until BAM! It's the turn of the 5th century BCE and Athens just invented democracy and kicked some Persian ass. Now they're a big deal and it's time everyone started acting like it. So Athens has its glow up and becomes important, and fun fact, one of the first things they did around this time was make the official statement that all Athenians were autochthonous just like Erechtheus. Not to say that they all individually sprouted out of the ground just like that, but that their ancestors did. The Athenians didn't settle Athens, they were born from it. Molded by it. They didn't see anything that wasn't Athens until they were already a man, and by then it was nothing to them but nowhere near as cool as Athens. So yeah, autochthonous pride was not what I was expecting to find researching this, but it's still pretty dang nifty. Anyway, now that Athens is a big deal IRL, it's time to give them a big deal founding myth that reflects how much of a big deal they are. One with gods and heroes and really important stuff like that. No other city did this, by the way. Sure, you'd get mythical founder kings bouncing around setting up cities and naming them after stuff, but it didn't usually get much fancier than that. Not so for Athens. In the 1st-ish century CE, Pseudo-Apollodorus writes his Bibliotheca, a compendium of Greek myths and legends derived from earlier works, mostly from around the 300s BCE. And in this Bibliotheca, he tells us the new and improved founding myth of Athens. For one thing, Erechtheus is no longer the first king of Athens. That honor goes to Cecrops, another autochthonous founder king who is also part snake. What a coincidence. He rules the Attic Peninsula, which he names Cecropia after himself, and is by all accounts doing a good job when the gods decide it's time to start divvying up the planet and the problems begin. See, Cecropia is just such a prime piece of grade A real estate that both Poseidon and Athena want a piece
piece of it. Poseidon gets there first, and to mark his territory, he strikes the ground with his trident, producing a saltwater spring, and according to some later Roman writers, also a horse. Then Athena shows up, calls Cyclops over to make sure he's watching, and plants a nice little olive tree. Athena and Poseidon start butting heads over who gets the city, so Zeus intervenes to break it up. Sources vary on who exactly makes the final judgment, but the popular attestation is that Cyclops judges the olive tree a more practical gift than a saltwater spring, so the city goes to Athena and is renamed Athens. Poseidon is unsurprisingly butthurt about this and floods the nearby plains in revenge, most likely to explain why Athens was, at the time, located right next to 3 separate rivers. A few kings later, our old buddy Erechtheus pops back up in his old role as super cool king, though by this point they're pretty consistently calling him Erechthonius instead. What's neat about this is that Erechtheus' original name still gets independent press in this telling, since the saltwater spring Poseidon creates is called Erechtheus. It's spelled a little bit differently. Erechtheus also features in a more subtle role. In the Parthenon's massive, now-lost statue of Athena Parthenos, there's a snake behind Athena's shield, and that snake is Erechtheus. Pretty dope. Now, the really cool thing about this specifically is that Athens is not the only snake-centric myth about a god claiming a city. Cyclops and Erechtheus are both offspring of Gaia with hefty amounts of snake symbolism and iconography, and they both play a mythological role in giving Athena control over their city. This story structure also happens in Delphi. See, before Apollo took over as its patron, Delphi and its oracle were ruled by Python, an autochthonous child of Gaia who was, unsurprisingly at this point, a giant snake. Python is supposedly maybe Minoan in origin and was potentially originally framed as a benevolent guardian spirit, though by ancient Greek times Python was a little more antagonistic, in one story being sent by Hera to kill Apollo and Artemis' mother Leto. Regardless of why, Apollo killed Python and claimed Delphi and its oracle for his own. This story is referenced in the Homeric hymn to Apollo in 522 BCE, meaning it's most likely a lot older than that. I don't know exactly how far this Olympian superseding ancient snake gods thing goes, but even if it's just a coincidence, it's a hell of a through line to stumble onto. Can't believe all my mythological conspiracy theorying finally led me to friggin' snake people. All these thumbtacks and string might be getting to me.
Wow, how cool that this completely neutral party got the coolest and smartest and bestest god ever to be in charge. And the really convenient part is they don't even need to change the name on the road signs. But as much as I've got a soft spot for Athena, anyone who helps out my boy Odysseus is a friend of mine, she's still unleashed her share of divine wrath on those who, depending on how you look at it, may or may not have been playing with fire.
It's fun to talk shit on the Greek gods. Oh man, that's Zeus, am I right? Can't keep it in his pants to save the lives of countless mortal women and children. Jeez, that Apollo. He's almost worse than Zeus, because all it takes is him falling in love with you to get a one-way ticket to Deadsville. And oh man, Aphrodite. And we think today's shippers are obsessive. Of course, this all works with the benefit of hindsight, and the fact that, this is a very distant religion to most of us. Broadly speaking, these aren't our gods, and that makes it okay to get a few cracks in. The situation was very different if you actually lived in ancient Greece, and no story demonstrates that better than Arachne. Now, Arachne is just your average Lydian maiden, with one standout quality: she's a hell of a weaver. This on its own isn't too noteworthy, but Arachne decides to up the ante by bragging about how she's such a good weaver, she's even better than Athena. And much like saying you're hotter than Aphrodite, claiming that you surpass the gods in a quality that was presumably given to you by the gods is not a great idea when those gods evidently have a lot of spare time to spend cooking up suitably karmic punishments for your shenanigans. So Athena catches wind of Arachne's boasting and pops down in mortal disguise to gauge the severity of the situation. When she suggests that maybe Arachne should dial back the blasphemy a little, Arachne responds by saying, "Ha! If Athena wants me to stop so bad, she should come down here and make me." Let's file that under things you should probably never say ever, just to be safe. So Athena takes that suggestion, and she and Arachne set up a weaving competition to see who's really the better creator. So Athena weaves a big tapestry primarily showing a different myth entirely, wherein she and Poseidon competed for the honor of naming the city of Athens. You can probably guess that she won, but the tapestry shows how she won. Where Poseidon caused the miraculous creation of a saltwater spring, Athena created a much more practical olive tree and won over the citizens that way. She further embellishes the tapestry with 4 more myths, each one demonstrating how much of a bad idea it is to sass the gods and/or claim superiority over them. Arachne, meanwhile, demonstrates her spectacular lack of situational awareness by using her tapestry to beautifully render over 15 separate occasions wherein Zeus and/or Poseidon dropped everything to bang random women, more than half the time shaped like an animal while they did it. Hilarious, right? Well, not to Athena, who has to live with these people and probably doesn't want to see a graphic visualization of her dad and uncle banging everything that moves. While she admires Arachne's skill and execution, she finds her lack of audience awareness disturbing and responds by destroying the tapestry and whacking Arachne on the head with her weaving shuttle, presumably while yelling, "What were you thinking?" to emphasize the point. When Arachne takes this critique about as well as any artist handles their first really cutting criticism, Athena takes pity on her and saves her life, kind of, by transforming her into a spider. Don't feel too bad, Arachne, you were just ahead of your time. Also, it's maybe not a good idea to show your not-safe-for-work god fan art to one of the only 3 Olympians who explicitly want nothing to do with that business.
You know, even though Arachne hubrised harder than almost anyone alive, I've always thought it was kind of beautiful that she was turned into something that could still create her art. Spiderwebs are complicated, fascinating things, and even though they serve an obvious purpose for the spider, they're still strikingly beautiful. And I kind of love the thought that the question, why does the spider weave so beautifully, inspired a story of an unbelievably talented artist who lost herself but kept her wondrous craft and spread it all over the world, decorating forgotten corners and catching the light in silver strands. Sometimes a divine punishment is an intricate, nuanced, even beautiful metaphor for some potentially rewarding transformation. And sometimes you just get murdered.
When will these people learn not to piss off the gods? Okay, the story of Niobe is very short, and like most Greek tragedies, is an essay on the folly of hubris. But for context, we're gonna need the story of Leto and her twin children, Artemis and Apollo. Yeah, you already know who they are, but their mom is more important in this story, so bear with me. So way back when, the goddess Leto had a fling with Zeus and got pregnant. Hera obviously objected, but because she couldn't do her normal solution and kill Leto, she instead decided to make her life really hard. So she put out some rules. Leto could totally give birth, she just couldn't do it on the mainland, on an island, or anywhere under the sun. And apparently Olympus counted too? Whatever. So Leto found this tiny barren rock called Delos, which wasn't the mainland and didn't count as an island, and set up to give birth. Some versions also say that Hera kidnapped Aletheia, the goddess of childbirth, to keep Leto from having her kids, but any mother will tell you that nothing stops the baby when it wants to get out, so Leto had her children anyway. First Artemis, and then 9 days later, Apollo. So now that we've got some backstory, let's talk about Niobe. So Niobe, queen of Thebes, has a loving husband, Amphion, and 14 children, 7 sons and 7 daughters. Life is pretty sweet. Now Leto has a temple in Thebes, and she's requested that the women of Thebes pay her some respect via incense, pretty much standard godly fare. Well, Niobe shows up to do her thing, and apparently decides that the best way to worship Leto is to try and one-up her. So Niobe claims that, hey, she managed to have 14 kids while Leto only had 2, so who's the real goddess? Well, evidently Leto, as the minute she hears that particular gem, she calls up the twins and asks him to show Niobe who's boss. So Artemis and Apollo gear up and start sniping Niobe's kids, killing all of them. Then her husband kills himself. Sucks to be you, Niobe. Sounds like your mouth was writing checks your nuclear family couldn't cash. Then she turns into a rock. The end.
Artemis is tied in with a lot of these divine wrath stories, actually. Let's throw in one more for the road.
I've talked before about how mythology doesn't really have a single set canon. A culture's mythology is usually tied to a living religion. The stories get told and retold over the generations, and depending on political shenanigans and power struggles, whole batches of gods and heroes can end up reshuffling in the hierarchy to conform to whatever the current socio-political arrangement is. So studying mythology isn't usually about arguing canon, because there's no point. Instead, it's about finding the threads that stayed consistent over time. Comparative mythology has a lot in common with biological phylogeny, tracing how stories evolved and spread over time by tracking what traits those stories consistently had, and where and when their common ancestor might have first appeared. For instance, a lot of Indo-European mythologies feature 2 warring batches of gods that, despite the conflict, intermarry, exchange hostages, and otherwise commingle quite a lot. The Aesir and Vanir, the Fovera and the Tuatha, the Olympians and the Titans, the Asuras and the Devas, it's very consistent across multiple mythologies, implying that it was probably a property of their original common ancestor. Also, Aesir and Ashura are cognate, which is fun, and both the Aesir and the Fovera are ruled by a one-eyed god who tries to forestall a prophecy of his doom. None of this is relevant to this video, I just thought it was way too cool to leave out. But some stories make this easy, because some stories are grounded in a very tangible thing, and no matter how much the myths might drift, that one solid fact stays relevant. In the myth of Orion, that solid real fact is that he's a constellation. No matter what else happens, that's the most important thing about him. After all, the constellation was there first, and it was being recognized as shaped like a dude a full 30,000 years before ancient Greece was even a thing. Star charts are some of the earliest art we have. Now, Orion makes a few sporadic appearances in early Greek mythology. He's referenced as a constellation in the Iliad, one of many that Hephaestus decorates Achilles' shiny new armor and shield with. The star Sirius is also referenced as Orion's hunting dog. He's also mentioned in the Odyssey as having been killed by Artemis, and is cited as one of the giants who tried to attack the Olympians. Odysseus also sees him in the underworld later, hunting the ghosts of animals he previously killed, which to be honest seems wildly unfair to the animals. But despite these little scraps of mythology, Orion's life doesn't get much consistent press, and he's mostly referenced as a constellation because he makes a very convenient timekeeping tool. In that region, Orion first rises in the east around July, which is when you're supposed to start winnowing the grain. He's directly overhead in September, when you're supposed to harvest the grapes, and when the Pleiades drop below the horizon, hiding from Orion, you probably shouldn't try sailing anywhere because that's when the storms start getting really bad. The stories about him make these fun facts easier to remember, but the important part is that he's a constellation very useful for delineating important times of year. And, not so coincidentally, many of his myths involve a never-ending chase of some kind, mapping to his motion across the sky. So the earliest proper story fragments we have about Orion as a person come from a later
lighter summary of a lost work that might have been written by famous astronomer and all-around cool scientist Aristophanes, but then again, he wasn't all that interested in the mythology of the stars he studied, so this author might have just been attributing it to him for literary street cred. Anyway, in this version, Orion is a son of Poseidon and Euryale, either a daughter of King Minos or the second Gorgon's sister. It's not really clear. Either way, Orion is giant and kinda monstery and has the ability to walk on water thanks to his dad. He visits the island of Chios and hangs out with the king Oenopion, but gets drunk and attacks Merope, which is the name of one of the Pleiades, although they don't appear to be officially the same character in this story, which is confusing. The king gets mad and blinds him, and Orion wanders around for a while before bumping into Hephaestus, who gives him a servant, Kedalion, to guide him around. With his help, Orion travels east and meets Helios, the sun, who heals his eyes. Now restored and pretty pissed off, Orion charges back to take vengeance on the king, but Oenopion has taken this time to build himself an underground fortress to hide in, and Orion can't find him, so he wanders off to do something else instead. Now, I can't find confirmation of this, but this myth sounds suspiciously like a beat-for-beat mythologization of Orion's physical movement across the sky over the course of the year. He travels to Chios, which is nearly due east of mainland Greece, presumably when he first rises over the eastern horizon. He attacks Merope, who, if she is supposed to be one of the Pleiades, is represented in a star cluster in Taurus that Orion constantly chases. He's blinded and wanders around, bumping into Hephaestus, which could be when Orion sinks below the western horizon, because Hephaestus's forge was supposedly located in Mount Etna, which is just about due west from mainland Greece. Guided by Kedalion, Orion travels under the earth until he reaches the east again, where the sun rises, and restored by Helios, Orion rises in the east again to continue chasing Merope and Oenopion. Again, I can't find confirmation, and I had to physically look up the maps to see if the locations lined up, but I mean, it's plausible. Anyway, apparently after all this went down, Orion decided to start hanging out with Artemis and her mother Leto, where they broed out over their mutual love of putting arrows and things from several miles away. But in classic Greek hero fashion, Orion gets a little too much of the hubris one day and boasts that he's gonna kill every animal in the world. Gaia, likely perturbed at the widespread ecological devastation this boast would entail, responds with her characteristic subtlety and summons a monstrous scorpion, which stings Orion and he dies. Zeus places Orion among the stars, and then makes the scorpion a constellation too, presumably so Orion doesn't get too comfortable. This is another consistent constellation myth. Orion and Scorpio are on near opposite points of the celestial sphere, so when Scorpio rises over the horizon, Orion nopes out for half the year. Because of this, the scorpion is a very common element in Orion's myths. For instance, one variant says that the Pleiad nymphs are close friends of Artemis, and Orion will not stop pursuing them. Artemis asks Zeus for help, and Zeus responds by turning the Pleiades into stars where Orion can't get to them. Now upset that she can't see her friends anymore, Artemis has Apollo unleash a monstrous scorpion to attack Orion, and when he dies, Zeus turns him into a constellation so he can continue to chase the Pleiades, because Zeus is an asshole. But I bet this all sounds pretty weird, right? Because a lot of you have probably heard that Orion was the only man Artemis ever loved. First of all, no. But more specifically, no. Plenty of artists, poets, and other such creatives have historically loved framing their dynamic as a tragic tale of love lost, because who doesn't love that trope? But this popular interpretation is based on one very specific fragmentary myth dubiously recounted by Hyginus, who tells us that Apollo disapproves of the friendship between Artemis and Orion and worries that he might seduce her with his prodigious bow and arrow skills, which makes me question if Apollo has ever paid any attention to the company Artemis keeps. Anyway, Apollo gets all broy and overprotective and decides Orion has to die, so he challenges Artemis that she totally can't hit that tiny little dot swimming really far out in the ocean, which of course she does, and oops, it was Orion. So Orion's super dead, and Artemis is pretty upset at the loss of her friend, so she places him among the stars as a constellation prize. Anyways, near as I can tell, Orion only ever gets written as Artemis's tragic dead boyfriend because a handful of translators, Baroque artists, and 19th century poets decided it was more dramatic that way, and that the only reason a dude and a lady would ever want to hang out and talk about their mutual interests together is if they also wanted to bone. This single interpretation conveniently ignores that it's vastly outweighed by the number of versions where Artemis kills Orion on purpose for trying to assault her friends, but hey, what are you gonna do? Either way, Orion ends up dead, and Artemis goes back to forswearing forever the company of men and all that entails.
Divine punishments can be remarkably uncreative. And to be clear, that's a good thing, because the creative ones are 10 million times worse than just getting shot from space.
There are a lot of stories with environmental messages. There's been a bit of an uptick since the advent of man-made climate change gave us a whole new form of species-wide guilt to sublimate through storytelling, but the concept of man versus nature is a tale as old as time, and the moral element of nature good or at least not to be messed with is just as old. Modern environmental narratives tend to focus more on how important it is to protect nature and how terrible it is to harm it on a widespread scale, but a lot of those stories are grounded in more modern concepts like nuclear damage or anthropogenic climate change. Sometimes harming nature is its own punishment, and a world critically damaged by foolhardy humans becomes deeply unpleasant for those humans and their descendants to live in. In some other stories, nature takes a slightly more active role in defending itself, or failing that, avenging itself. Whatever the flavor, the general consensus is that it's never wise to pick a fight with the biosphere you live in, since no matter who wins, you eventually lose. And you'll be happy to know that this general concept dates as far back as ancient Greece. So today let's talk about a short,
sweet and ridiculously unnerving tale of what exactly the Wrath of Demeter looks like. Now this story, like many others, is recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it begins, like so many do, with a king. The protagonist of our story is King Erysichthon, and he's kicking things off with a bang by clear-cutting Demeter's sacred grove. The reason behind this questionable choice is never explained, not that it would help, because this grove is like mondo sacred. It's where all the dryads like to hang out and party, and it's like deep wilderness. At the heart of the grove is a massive ancient oak tree covered in garlands and prayer tablets and a big flashing neon sign that says "Do not kill." Erysichthon's workers aren't exactly jazzed about the thought of knocking it down, so Erysichthon grabs an axe and forges in to do it himself, and further paints a target on his back by loudly declaring that not only is he going to cut down this tree, he'd do the same thing even if that tree was Demeter herself. At the first strike of the axe, the tree starts bleeding, which Erysichthon takes as a great sign and keeps chopping. Right before the tree gives up the ghost, it speaks and tells the assembled mortals that it is in fact a dryad, beloved by Demeter herself, and Erysichthon's ass is proverbially grass. The tree dies, the people move on, and the dryads who saw the whole thing book it to Demeter to fill her in. Now Demeter's none too pleased about the loss of her sacred grove and her favorite dryad, so she spends some time mulling over what exactly to do to this idiot, and settles on a particularly unsettling plan. She sends a nymph up to the frozen, barren wastelands of northern Scythia to transmit a message to Limos, the goddess of starvation, whose nature is so antithetical to Demeter that they literally physically can't get near each other. The nymph quickly tells Limos that Demeter's asked her to inflict a curse on King Erysichthon, and then the nymph books it before Limos' divine vibes can starve her skeletal. Limos is always down for a little mischief, so she heads over to Erysichthon's palace, slips in at night, and super casually inflicts him with the curse of eternal hunger. Then she heads home to put on the new season of Bake Off while Erysichthon dreams of magnificent feasts and wakes up absolutely ravenous. Now, as king, Erysichthon has plenty of access to delicious foods of all varieties, but no matter how much he eats, he's never satisfied, and in fact just gets more hungry the more he consumes. In desperation to buy more and more food, he ends up draining his treasury and selling off his possessions. He even ends up selling his daughter Mestra, who's none too pleased about her new situation and calls in a favor from Poseidon as payback for him deflowering her back in the day, which as we all know by now happened with alarming frequency. And Poseidon evidently feels real bad about this one because he grants her the power of full-on shapeshifting, which she uses to escape. Erysichthon sees this as a golden opportunity and makes a pretty solid racket out of selling his daughter over and over again while she uses her shapeshifting to escape every time. But of course this does nothing to help with the actual curse, and eventually Erysichthon is so overwhelmed with his ravenous hunger that he just fully eats himself. Alive. Practical takeaway from this whole debacle? Hell if I know, but this is definitely the anecdote Demeter likes to tell when Hades comes over for family dinner and game night.
Honestly, we should have known Demeter was the scariest god when she triggered that apocalypse that one time. I swear, people see the sheaf of wheat and the diaphanous green robes and their brain jumps straight to unthreatening maternal figure, and they miss the part where she will fully make you eat yourself fingers first. But if Demeter is surprisingly terrifying, her son-in-law, the Lord of the Underworld, is unsurprisingly terrifying, which is another in the long list of reasons why Theseus is not beating the big dumb idiot allegations.
Hades has really gotten a bad rep over the years. People hear King of the Underworld and suddenly all they can see is Satan. The thing is, mythological Hades never did anything to deserve his bad rep. Sure, he kidnapped Persephone, but this was a time when kidnapping your future wife wasn't as frowned upon as it is today, and by all accounts their relationship was remarkably functional. He asked Zeus to stop Asclepius from resurrecting the dead, but it's not his fault that Zeus interpreted that as set the guy on fire. He helped Orpheus reunite with his dead wife, and hey, it's not his fault that the kid did the one thing he warned him not to do. By all accounts, Hades is a really nice guy who loves his wife, keeps his promises, and does his job. Also, there's evidence that Kerberos means spotted, so this enormous dork also named his three-headed hellhound Spot. You gotta love this guy. In his entire run as Lord of the Underworld, Hades has only messed up 2 people, and believe me, they deserve it. These are their stories. So you've probably all heard of Theseus, famous for killing the Minotaur and abandoning his wife on a desert island, but you probably haven't heard of his bro Pirithous because he's pretty much only known for this. So Pirithous and Theseus are egotistical as only Greek heroes can be, and decide that they both deserve to marry a daughter of Zeus. Theseus settles on Helen of Troy, who is only 12 at this point, and they run off and kidnap her. Now of course it wouldn't be appropriate for Theseus to get with a 12-year-old, so the flawless plan is to keep her until she reaches legal banging age. I cannot believe how much crap Helen gets put through. Can you believe people still blame her for the Trojan War? Anyway, as disgusting as that was, Pirithous has an even better idea. He wants to marry Persephone. Did I say better? I meant mind-bogglingly stupid. But amazingly, Theseus goes along with this plan. Take notes, everybody. Friends don't let friends kidnap goddesses. So the bros scoot down into the underworld, where they encounter a slightly livid Hades, who, like any good host, offers them seats at his dinner table. They cheerfully sit down, you know, may as well get to know your future husband-in-law before kidnapping and marrying his wife, whereupon snakes are up from the ground and fuse them to their chairs. Hades sicks the Furies on them and calls it a night. Theseus, you are supposed to be smarter than this. Let that be a lesson, folks. Don't try and kidnap the queen of the underworld when her mild-mannered husband is within earshot. Or maybe, just to be safe, don't mess with Hades. Period.
See, I'd go with the snakes too, but I wouldn't use them as literally as that.
In most of these stories of divine wrath, the gods take a fairly reactive role. They don't go out looking for people who piss them off, they're largely minding their own business when some hubristic mortal too big for their britches rolls up and starts poking the bear. But some gods are easier to poke than others, and sometimes incurring a proper smiting can be as easy as being in the wrong place at the wrong time.
The major well-known figures in Greek mythology are famous for all sorts of things. Heracles for his strength, Odysseus for his cunning, Atalanta for her speed and kick-ass Tarzan origin story, Tantalus and Sisyphus for their unique punishments in Hades, Clytemnestra for axe-murdering her husband. The list goes on. Some are good, some are bad, some are pretty cool, and some are frankly kind of embarrassing. I mean, nobody wants to be immortalized as that guy who got squished by a boat, Jason. But in the tumultuous annals of mythohistory, surprisingly few heroes are remembered only for how they died. In fact, I can only think of one, a particularly unlucky dude by the name of Actaeon. Now, Actaeon is a little tricky to talk about. Instead of being referenced in only one story or source, he's one of those guys who seems to have been kind of a meme in ancient Greece. He gets referenced all over the place, but a lot of those references are pretty light on the details, more of a get a load of this guy than a let me tell you a tale. The most complete version of his story is recounted in Ovid's Metamorphoses, but it pops up in a lot of earlier literature as a cautionary tale, typically framed as don't disrespect the gods or you'll end up like Actaeon. Funnily enough, those early references don't actually agree on what Actaeon did wrong. In Euripides' play The Bacchae, back in the 400s BCE, Actaeon is cited as a hunter who boasts that he's a better hunter than Artemis, and it's a major no-no to do that in general, so he's devoured by his own hounds. But about 100 years later, the poet Callimachus says in his hymn number 5 that Actaeon accidentally sees Artemis bathing, and since it's a major no-no to behold a deity naked, he's devoured by his own hounds. Then, a little after the turn of the millennium, Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca gives us a sprinkling of detail where it specifies that Actaeon is a hunter trained by Chiron who makes the mistake of wooing Semele, girlfriend of Zeus and future mother of Dionysus. This is naturally a bad idea, and at Zeus's command, Actaeon is devoured by his own hounds. Pseudo-Apollodorus does say, however, that this is an unusual telling, and the more popular version of the story is that, like in Callimachus' version, Actaeon's real offense is seeing Artemis bathing, at which point she turns him into a deer, and then he's devoured by his own hounds. The hounds are then confused when they can't find Actaeon and go to Chiron, who figures out the sad story from context clues and carves a statue of Actaeon so the dogs feel better about the whole situation. Now, we're starting to see the faintest hint of a pattern emerging here, but these anecdotal references don't really paint a full picture just yet. For one thing, they don't agree on literally anything other than Actaeon's death. Actaeon is a hunter who pisses off at least one god and is devoured by his own hounds, either explicitly at the god's orders or apparently because that's just a thing that happens. What did he do? Nobody can agree. Which god did he anger? Who's to say? How did he die? Okay, that one we've got down. Now, when discussing Actaeon, most people tend to go with Ovid's version, written in the same general 1st century CE timeframe as Pseudo-Apollodorus' telling, mostly because it is the only version longer than 3 sentences. In Ovid's version, Actaeon is, say it with me now, a hunter. He and his hunter bros have had a long and productive day of hunting, and they're packing it in for the evening and heading home. But unbeknownst to Actaeon, the goddess Artemis happens to have a private grotto nearby where she likes to go and unwind after a long day's hunting with the gals. And unfortunately for Actaeon, he happens to stumble on said private grotto right after Artemis has popped into the water for a nice, refreshing, no-clothes-needed bath. Now, as you may know, Artemis is distinguished in the Olympian pantheon as one of the virgin goddesses whose single status was more than just a personal choice, but also actively sacred. So a dude seeing her naked, accidentally or otherwise, isn't just uncool, it's kinda also sacrilegious. Artemis's nymphs freak out at the intrusion, but Artemis quickly handles the situation by hucking a handful of water at Actaeon and cursing him to silence so he can never tell anyone about this breach of her privacy. The way she does this is by transforming him into a stag, which are famously known for not being able to talk. Actaeon freaks out and bolts into the woods, but makes the rookie mistake of being shaped like a deer at the time, and every hunting dog in the zip code perks up and bolts after him. Actaeon is eventually run down and devoured by his own hounds. What a twist. So, this is one of those cases where the story has a lot of recurring elements, but not every telling has all of those elements, which sometimes indicates that the story underwent an almost organic transformation and evolution over time, starting from a quote-unquote original version before branching and speciating into different versions that each retained individual parts of that original. But it sometimes indicates that the story was always a cluster of other very different stories with only a central point as overlap. To determine which of those things happened here, we need a broader look at the story, one that we can't necessarily find in written works, which we've basically exhausted at this point. Luckily for us, referencing Actaeon was just as popular with artists as it was with poets, and Actaeon shows up in visual media all the time, which can give us a pretty good insight into what elements of the story may have been popular at different times. For instance, earlier versions didn't seem to have Actaeon turning into a deer. In fact, visual representations from the 400s BCE up to the turn of the millennium mostly seem to show Actaeon fully human when he's chased down by his hounds. It's only around the aughts CE that there starts to be an uptick in representations where Actaeon appears to be partially transformed into a deer during the attack. There's a painting of him in Pompeii from the 1st century BCE where he's got little antlers, but before that, he's almost always human. It's not until the Renaissance, a full 1,000 years after Rome, that the artists start leaning on the Actaeon as a deer imagery super heavily, which is also coincidentally when artists started giving us an eyeful of Artemis bathing, evidently missing the entire point of Ovid's telling in the process. Most of the earlier art also only shows Actaeon as a lone figure being killed, with no sign of which god he might have offended to make that happen. A few pieces of the art from that early Roman era feature a woman, probably Artemis, looking pretty cranky but usually, though not always, fully clothed. In some cases, other gods appear to be present, generally disapproving of Actaeon's vibes. In at least one, it looks like Artemis is chasing him down with a spear while other women are bathing nearby. So looking at all this, it seems like the reason we can't find one specific original telling to treat as the real one is because, as is so often the case, there never was one. The only consistent thing about Actaeon was that he pissed off the gods and was devoured by his own hounds. What exactly he did, which god or gods were responsible for his death, whether or not he was deer-shaped at the time, changed. It was most commonly related to Artemis, and more commonly because of the bath, but considering the variety of tellings, it probably only got locked into the cultural zeitgeist as Actaeon copped an eyeful of Artemis's secret maidenhood and she decided not to be cool about it because Ovid's version was the easiest to access and Renaissance artists were weird like that.
Whether intentional hubris or just bad luck, as a rule, tempting the wrath of the gods almost always ends extremely badly. But what they don't tell you is that the affection of the gods can actually be far worse for your health. For instance, here's what happens when the moon turns into your girlfriend.
So here's something fun about Greek mythology. Everyone knows Blue and I like to rag on the Romans for mashing their gods up with everyone else's, but to be totally fair to them, it's not like they were the only ones. I mean, the Greeks did it to themselves on multiple occasions. I think the one everybody knows about, or maybe don't know they know, is how Artemis got mashed together with the goddess Selene, the original Greek moon goddess. Now, her brother Apollo also got mashed together with Helios, titan of the sun, but in his case, the transition was smoother because most of Helios's myths could easily be ascribed to Apollo. I mean, Apollo's primary defining trait was that he liked music and pretty girls, not exactly the most restrictive characterization. Helios's stories have all but been subsumed into his lore, but Selene and Artemis ran into some characterization issues. See, Artemis's thing is that she didn't like dudes. Like, at all. Now, there's no evidence to suggest that she liked girls either. Sorry, internet. See, Artemis is actually pretty textbook from a modern-day perspective. She's never expressed an interest in sex and has only romantically loved one person, the hunter Orion. You may know him as that chunky star guy over the northern hemisphere. So, no sexual attraction, and romantic attraction only blooming after a long and already intimate relationship. Hey, would you look at that? But I'm not here to speculate about the hypothetical orientations of ancient goddesses, no matter how fun it might be. The point is, Artemis's primary defining feature was no boyfriends ever except for that one time. Now this came into direct conflict with Selene, whose only major story involved head-over-heels love at first sight. You're probably familiar with this story in some form, but not its original form because nobody knows what that is. By the time we got a hold of it, it was already fragmented into way too many regional versions to have a true version, but the consolidated one is basically this. So there's this dude, Endymion, who is beyond pretty. So Selene floats overhead every night just looking at this fine honey of a shepherd, or maybe a king, sources vary. After a while, she's like, okay, I can't handle this, and goes to Zeus, asking him to do something about it. When he asks her to narrow it down, she tells him she wants to be able to look at Endymion's beautiful face forever. Which is actually an instance of aesthetic attraction as opposed to romantic or sexual. Though it's a common misconception that aesthetic attraction follows from or inherently leads to romantic or sexual attraction, they are actually completely disparate, a fact that becomes obvious when one notes that your friendly neighborhood asexual is completely capable of appreciating gorgeous people in the same way one might platonically admire a sunset. So Zeus grants Selene's wish by putting Endymion to sleep forever, so that he'll never age and never die, but also never wake up again. Selene is fine with this, demonstrating that her love for Endymion is purely physical at this point. The Greek concept of eros, or passionate love, is characterized as beginning with physical appreciation and growing to appreciate within as well as without. But Selene demonstrates something more closely resembling the Greek concept of mania, manic love, characterized by impulsive acts that prioritize ownership of the loved one over their spiritual well-being. And then she proceeds to have 50 kids with Endymion. Whoa, not cool, lady, he's asleep!
The gods love their mortals, and boy do they hate consent. If Zeus is ever off screen, you can almost always safely assume that he's off ruining someone's life and sentencing them to a short and unhappy stint in Hera's crosshairs. And when that happens, the best case scenario the mortal in question can usually hope for is a permanent trip heavenward, which is not always as bad as it sounds.
If you live in the northern hemisphere, one of the first constellations you probably learned about was Ursa Major, the Great Bear. Or more specifically, you probably learned about the asterism the Big Dipper, which is about 50% of the Great Bear. It's big, recognizable, and actually visible a lot more than most constellations, for one simple reason. This constellation is circumpolar, which means it's close enough to the North Star Polaris that if you're at a high enough latitude, it never actually sets below the horizon. It just spins under the pole star. So rather than only being visible at certain times of year when the sun is in opposition to it, it's technically visible basically year-round. And you have to go pretty far south before the constellation ever completely sets. At most latitudes, you'll still be able to see the top part of the Great Bear, and from the perspective of Greece, only the Great Bear's paws are ever obscured below the horizon. The main body is always visible. And fun fact, the original purpose of the word Arctic was to define the area of the planet where an observer would never see any part of the Great Bear set. Arctic is derived from the Greek Arctikos, literally meaning of the bears. It's a very convenient coincidence that the Arctic is also the only natural habitat of polar bears, which aren't found in the Antarctic. It's just funny how these things work out. Now, Ursa Major has a lot of myths attached to it, and like all constellation myths, they're not particularly consistent. The only through line of a typical constellation myth is that eventually the constellation gets made, because that's really the only part of the story that demonstrably has to happen. But in the case of Ursa Major, there's one other consistent thread in the Greek myths of its creation, that it isn't a particularly happy affair for anyone involved. So today let's tell a few versions of the tale of the nymph Callisto, and how she got screwed over in every possible way. Now this story is retold in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Hyginus's Astronomica, and a few other places, and you know it's gonna be bad when Ovid's version isn't notably meaner than the rest. Our story begins with Callisto, daughter of King Lycaon of the Halloween werewolf video, and follower of Artemis. Like all of Artemis's devotees, Callisto likes nothing more than sprinting through the woods wild and free and hunting her little heart out on all the beasts of the wood. But unfortunately for Callisto, she's a human being in ancient Greece, and thus catches the attention of Zeus, who's tired of Hera spotting all his earthly escapades and wants to stress test the idea that maybe a thin covering of trees will prevent the goddess queen of marriage and familial responsibility from noticing him cheating on her for the 4th time that month. So Zeus zips down to Earth while Callisto is relaxing in a wild and ancient grove, and to further avoid suspicion, Zeus takes the form of Artemis. In this form, he seduces Callisto, which, depending on the version, she may or may not have been super into. Regardless of the specifics, the outcome is the same. Callisto becomes pregnant, and when this is discovered, Artemis is pretty peeved that one of her followers didn't maintain the maidenhood that Artemis is so big on, and kicks her out of the group. This is where the story starts getting very wibbly depending on who's telling it. In Ovid's version, Callisto is exiled from Artemis's followers and gives birth to a son named Arcas. Hera seizes the opportunity to curse Callisto for, the usual reasons, and transforms her into an enormous bear. Callisto, trapped in this form, wanders the mountains, torn between worlds and utterly alone, unable to even petition Zeus for help on account of being a bear. Meanwhile, her son Arcas spends the next 15 years doing normal baby stuff, like pretty quickly not being a baby anymore, and one day, while out hunting, he encounters a bear. A strange bear that looks at him with a very piercing expression and doesn't seem at all inclined to attack him. Even so, a bear is a bear, and Arcas moves to attack it instead. This kicks off Zeus's fratricidal spidey sense, and he finally clocks the situation, and to prevent the tragedy of Arcas accidentally killing his own mother, Zeus thinks fast and raises them into the sky, transforming mother and son into the constellations Ursa Major and Ursa Minor, the nearby Little Bear constellation whose tail contains the North Star Polaris. Spared from inflicting the ultimate tragedy on each other, the two bears spin through the night sky together for all eternity, most likely united in the feeling that there had to be a better solution than this, Zeus. But other versions of the story don't quite play out the same way. Hyginus's Astronomica, for instance, enumerates several ways Callisto has been mythically transformed into a bear, in some versions by Artemis herself, in other versions Zeus turned Callisto into a bear to hide her from Hera, and in some stories Artemis is subsequently the one who unknowingly killed Callisto. In another version, Bear Callisto and her son are captured by Arcadians and brought to King Lycaon to sacrifice to Zeus for trespassing in his temple. Zeus, catching wind of this, zaps them into the stars as constellations. In this one, intriguingly, Arcas is transformed into a different constellation. Instead of Ursa Minor, he becomes the constellation Bootes, which most notably contains the red star Arcturus, whose name means guardian of the bear, and is very easily found and identified by following the arc of the tail of Ursa Major to the nearest bright star. In Ovid's Fasti, it's also explained why the Great Bear never sinks below the horizon. Hera negotiated with Tethys, one of the ocean titans, to keep them away from her waters to make their starry fate just a little shittier for him. Thanks, Hera. Arcas also has a little more going on in some stories. Pausanias' descriptions of Greece lists several of his accomplishments after Callisto was turned into a bear, most notably becoming the king of Arcadia, which wasn't even called Arcadia until Arcas introduced the locals to agriculture, weaving, and the glorious technology of bread. The land and its people were renamed in Arcas' honor, and on top of all that, he supposedly married a dryad named Erato and had several children who later began several lines of Arcadian kings. Pausanias, a practical guy, can accept a legendary king being birthed by a bear and marrying a wood nymph, but draws the line at people turning into stars, and in his telling, Arcas never becomes a constellation, and even Callisto's starry fate is questioned. No matter the specifics of the story, and even no matter which constellations they get ascribed to, a few unsurprising details remain consistent. The unfortunate nymph Callisto is transformed into a bear, and then to sort of make up for it, is divinely transformed into the constellation the Great Bear. Her son Arcas goes on to do other things, but after his death or ascension remains nearby, either as the bear-like Ursa Minor or the more humanoid Buddha's constellation, accompanying and watching over his mother as she slowly turns around the pole star. While it makes sense that the only part of the story that's 100% consistent is the part where the immutable stars take the arrangement they have in real life, it's still a bit of a bummer that we don't have more reliable through lines to trace. Overall, the one thing all the versions agree on is the same thing that everyone always agrees on: it's all Zeus's fault.
Zeus, you've done it again. At this rate, you're giving a bad name to the whole pantheon. But even the actual apparently healthy relationships have a tendency to end in fire, or at least in a discus to the dome.
So Apollo's got a bit of a reputation when it comes to how his relationships generally end. I mean, for a guy with an oracle on his payroll, he was really bad at finding people who would actually date him. I mean, Daphne, Castalia, Cassandra, Acantha, Bellina, Acro, Leucades. Considering how many of Apollo's potential dates flung themselves off of cliffs or turned into various pieces of local flora just to avoid him, it's amazing the poor guy even tried anymore. But surprisingly, Apollo did manage to have a few functional relationships. Kind of. At the very least, there were relationships he was in where he wasn't actually directly responsible for their tragic resolutions. The most famous of these is probably the romance of Apollo and Hyacinthus. Now, Hyacinthus is a young Spartan prince, and his primary defining feature is that he's super pretty. There's also apparently some evidence that he might actually be a pre-Hellenic deity of some sort. Anyway, bottom line is he's majorly cute, and Apollo goes all head over heels for him. Surprisingly, considering Apollo's track record, springing this on Hyacinthus does not send him screaming into the hills or turn him into a plant, and instead they end up getting along famously. So that's cool. Unfortunately for everyone involved, Apollo isn't the only one who noticed Hyacinthus, and the lad actually has another deific admirer in the form of Zephyr, the West Wind. Also, unfortunately, Zephyr has no idea how to express his feelings properly and just ends up stewing in his own jealousy while Apollo and Hyacinthus run around doing cute couple things. Also unfortunately, Zephyr subscribes to the if I can't have you no one can school of romance, so one day when Apollo is showing Hyacinthus how to throw a discus, Zephyr decides to take the opportunity to kill Hyacinthus by shifting the winds and sending the discus into the side of his head. So that sucks. Apollo transforms the dying Hyacinthus into a flower to preserve his life and beauty forever, writes a little bit of emo poetry on the petals, and goes off to cry to Hermes about it. On the plus side, this love interest didn't turn into a plant until after the second date.
While the mortals definitely suffer the worst of the gods' relationship drama, the gods themselves are not immune to a little bit of soap opera shenaniganery. Honestly, that may as well be Aphrodite's official divine domain at this point, because when she's not making it happen for other people, she's doing it to herself.
In the giant spaghettified mess that is the pantheon of Olympian gods, there are a number of relationships that could be charitably described as unhealthy. It is a colossal mess of affairs and love children and plenty of revenge that benefits precisely nobody except Aphrodite, goddess of passion and love who enjoys nothing more than relationship drama, and when she can't find it, she will create it. Though she can't take credit for all the drama, she certainly seems to have a hand in the majority of it, encouraging love affairs and directing Eros to break a few hearts when it's a slow week or she's bored or it's a day ending in Y. But while wrecking other people's lives is good clean fun, Aphrodite's own love life is a rather complicated and fraught affair, pun intended. Early attestations from Homer in the Iliad describe her as happily unmarried and a consort to Ares, god of war, Natch. But then Homer's Odyssey cites her as married to Hephaestus, god of the forge and brother to Ares, while still consorting with Ares on the side. This is a bit jarring for several reasons. Aphrodite is the universally desired goddess of lust and attraction, while Hephaestus is, shall we say, not the most polished hammer in the forge. He's a very skilled artisan respected for his craft, but he's also often characterized as cunning, rude, and alienated from the rest of the Olympians, especially his mother Hera, who in several tellings chucked him off Olympus shortly after his birth because he had a congenital impairment and she was kind of a jerk like that. This isn't actually consistent though. In other versions, including the one in the Iliad, it was Zeus who drop-kicked him off Olympus because he was trying to protect Hera from Zeus, and injuries from the fall are what led to him becoming disabled rather than it being something he was born with. This lack of singular canon is very common in Greek mythology, so instead of looking for a single true narrative because there is no point, we kind of have to look at the general vibes. And in general, the vibe is not great. Hephaestus is broadly respected for his work and very little else, while Aphrodite is loved for her beauty, while generally feared and disliked for how much trouble she causes. Pairing them up is inobvious, to put it mildly, and Homer doesn't really explain how it happened. Later stories eventually came up with explanations for how the odd couple came to be and how a goddess who could have any husband she wanted ended up with the guy it kind of felt like nobody would ever pick. One popular explanation was that Hephaestus trapped his mother Hera with a trick throne and then demanded Aphrodite's hand in marriage in exchange for setting her free. In other anecdotes, Zeus was apparently tired of everyone fighting over Aphrodite and married her off to Hephaestus to make the yelling stop. You may note that while these stories explain how the marriage happened, they don't really explore their relationship or how they feel about each other. The general consensus is they're not very functional, but we rarely get a look into how dysfunctional they actually are. One story that gives us a rare glimpse at the mess is recounted in Homer's Odyssey, so let's talk about it. Now, our story begins very efficiently by laying out the status quo. Aphrodite and Hephaestus are married, but Aphrodite is carrying on a pretty steamy side romance with Ares, who's been wooing her with presents and flowers and squishy stuff like that. This is all kept very hush-hush and down low, but doesn't escape the attention of Helios, who has a pretty good view of everything on account of being the sun. So he decides to let Hephaestus know what's been going on in his bedroom while he's off in his kick-ass volcano lair making robots and stuff. Hephaestus is, unsurprisingly, very displeased to hear this, and responds in the same way he solves most of his problems, by inventing something. Specifically, he fires up the forge and hammers out a huge lattice of incredibly fine chains, nearly invisible but totally unbreakable. Then he scoots back home and drapes them all over the bedroom, creating an invisible net of unbreakable chains. Then he loudly announces that he's going on a business trip to Lemnos and won't be back for a hot minute, and scoots around the corner to wait. Ares, naturally, pops out of the bushes and scoots inside so he and Aphrodite can finish their Monopoly game, but they very quickly find the fun times scuttled by the golden net, which tangles them up and leaves them completely trapped. Hephaestus pops out of the woodwork and summons all the other Olympians to come see what he's caught. Poseidon, Hermes, and Apollo pop down to see what all the fuss is about, but the rest of the gods catch one glimpse of exposed god booty and decide they've probably seen enough for one night. So Hephaestus is, unsurprisingly, pretty pissed about the whole situation. He knows he's not exactly a prize in the looks department, while his brother Ares is a chiseled specimen of masculine vigor, but just because he gets it doesn't mean this isn't a pretty spectacular violation of the marriage agreement, and he's not about that. So his plan is to keep them in the net until Zeus agrees to refund the dowry he paid when he married Aphrodite. The fact that this implies that he bought his wife and is now requesting a refund is just a smidge fucked, but it's not like the rest of this situation is any less fucked, so Now, Apollo and Hermes think this situation is absolutely hilarious, but Poseidon is taking the whole thing a bit more seriously and asks Hephaestus to let them go. Poseidon tells Hephaestus he'll get Ares to pay the damages instead of Zeus, since it's more Ares' fault, but Hephaestus is reluctant because what if Ares doesn't pay? So Poseidon just promises that if Ares goes back on the deal, he'll just cover the price out of pocket. Hephaestus, satisfied that he's getting his refund either way, releases the lovers. It's unclear if any lessons were learned that day, but the world certainly never forgot Hephaestus' great innovation of using chains in the bedroom.
Aphrodite, being the goddess of love, gives her a pretty good reason to be getting up to hijinks of the relationship variety, but Zeus has much less of an excuse. In fact, since Zeus is married to the goddess of marriage, you'd think he'd be a little less cavalier about everything. But I guess when you're uncontested king of the universe, it's easy to get pretty blasé about the status quo. Maybe we just don't get what Zeus and Hera have got going on. I mean, every relationship is complicated, right? And sure, centuries of mythology and fighting and trickery and murder don't exactly paint a flattering picture, but maybe we're the assholes here. Maybe we just can't judge a 2,000-year-old highly symbolic dynamic between the all-powerful Lord of the Skies and Guardian of Hospitality and the Goddess of Women and Family by the same metric we'd use to deem a bestie's new boyfriend a serious red flag. Zeus and Hera are fascinating characters, but they're also gods, and that means their actions and relationships have meaning beyond the surface level. Hera punishing Zeus's lovers/victims for Zeus's infidelity is, of course, a victim-blaming dick move, but Hera is more than a garden-variety woman scorned. She's the goddess of marriage and family. Of course she punishes people who break their vows, no matter the context. And why doesn't she punish Zeus? Well, in lore it's because Zeus is more powerful than her, but the practical reason is because Zeus is not a person. Zeus is a story and a god. Hera's vengeance on infidelity was a social pressure on the people of ancient Greece. Stay faithful to your spouses and respect the bonds of marriage, or Hera would strike you down for defying her domain. Be a good host and keep your guests safe, because violating the laws of hospitality would bring down Zeus's wrath on your head. When we retell myths, it's easy to focus on the gods as characters, because they are. But it's easy to forget that they were also more than that. We can get hung up on the canon of the mythology not holding together, but that means we're approaching the mythology with the wrong set of expectations. We read a novel or watch a movie expecting the story to hold together because that's the point of those stories. But the point of the mythology was not to tell a set of stories that was internally consistent, it was to establish who the gods were and what they meant to the people of ancient Greece. So we can judge Zeus and Hera's wacky red flag bonanza all we want, and we should because it's hilarious, but we shouldn't forget that those stories existed for a reason. In fact, today we're going to be talking about a story that both ties directly into a real historical celebration and paints Zeus and Hera's relationship as more mutually affectionate than average. Don't get too excited, it's still a pretty low bar. Now this story comes to us from Pausanias' Descriptions of Greece, and the story begins, like so many do, with Hera pissed off at Zeus. The actual reason is unspecified, feel free to spin a wheel on that one, but this time she's
more than just cranky, she seems actually willing to break things off. She dips out of Olympus and crashes on the island of Evia to sulk, and nothing Zeus says can change her mind. Faced once again with the terrifying specter of the consequences of his own actions, Zeus seeks help from King Kithaeron, a mountain god with a startling amount of experience in romantic shenanigans. One can only assume he's seen his share of lovesick young people looking for picturesque environments to wax poetic in. Kithaeron suggests that Zeus can win Hera back with a wacky hijink by playing to her jealous nature, and proposes a scheme where they spread rumors of Zeus's upcoming marriage to Platea, daughter of Asopus and granddaughter of Kithaeron. For the record, bonus fun fact, all of these people share names with major local geographical features in Boeotia. Kithaeron is a mountain range, Asopus is a river, and Platea is the name of the whole city. So this is most likely a situation where all parties involved are gods, nymphs, and other anthropomorphic personifications of the kingdom and its natural environs. Anyway, Kithaeron suggests they really sell the bit with a celebration parade where Zeus can show off his new bride. True to form, when Hera hears about Zeus gallivanting around with some brand new squeeze, she gets in a right twist about it and flies up to Boeotia in a furious rage, finding Zeus heading a lavish bridal procession with someone dolled up in a beautiful wedding dress. Hera storms the procession in all her glory and rips the dress away, finding nothing underneath but a wooden statue. Hera is shocked to learn that, at least in this specific case, Zeus genuinely only had eyes for her, and in Boeotia they say that the heart of the queen grew 3 sizes that day. Zeus and Hera reconcile at a reunion so beautiful it was commemorated in the Daedala festival for centuries, where wooden statues were carved from sacred oaks and carried through marriage ceremonies up the peak of Mount Kithaeron, where a huge offering to Hera and Zeus was prepared and burned to celebrate the one time their relationship actually kind of made sense. So remember, folks, if you and your partner are having a tough time, they're gonna absolutely love it if you replace them with a doll.
With so many affairs and heartbreaks and threats of divorce, it can be easy to see the Olympian gods as a serial telenovela that's gone on way too long. I mean, if our most functional marriage is the one where the husband opened things up by kidnapping the bride and accidentally triggering Armageddon, things are dire. But they don't have to be. Sometimes, very rarely, the love story is actually rock solid all the way through. After all, who better to star in a real, proper love story than love himself?
This is a true story. Last year, spring quarter, for my 3rd quarter of Greek thought and literature, I took a course on love. My teacher was an absolutely gorgeous man with a beautiful accent and the most piercing of eyes. And one of the things he taught us was that, for the Greeks, love had many different meanings. There was agape, the unconditional love of one's fellow humans, phileo, platonic love of one's friends, storge, love of family, and eros. Now, of these 4, eros is definitely the most well-known. It's the deep, passionate love one feels for a romantic and/or sexual partner. And, not so coincidentally, it's also the name of the Greek god of love. Eros, as far as gods go, has been through many, many incarnations. There's the aspect of Eros that's an ancient primordial deity older than the gods themselves, and in that incarnation, Eros is characterized as a being even more powerful than Zeus, in part because he can jerk the guy around like a puppet. See every myth where Zeus couldn't keep it in his pants, also known as every myth. There's the aspect of Eros that's the child of Aphrodite, representing love as a consequence of beauty. And then there's Cupid. We don't like to talk about him. Now, typically, those first 2 representations exist concurrently in the same character. Eros will simultaneously be Aphrodite's son and a powerful and ancient force that even the gods fear. I say typically, but really there's only one data point to draw from. There's one major legend about Eros, and that is the myth of Eros and Psyche. So, Psyche is a princess, but not just any princess, a beautiful princess. Plot twist? But she's not just any beautiful princess, she's a lonely beautiful princess. Plot twist? But she's not just any lonely beautiful princess, she's a lonely beautiful princess even more beautiful than Aphrodite! Oh, that ain't good. In fact, since Psyche is so incredibly beautiful, people have started worshipping her instead of Aphrodite. My god, it's just like high school. Now, those of us familiar with Aphrodite through the Golden Apple, the Iliad, or just Greek mythology in general, know that she doesn't really handle people being prettier than her very well. But Aphrodite has just the plan to take Psyche down. She'll make her fall in love with a hideous monster. Aphrodite, you are a goddess. Why don't you just kill her? Aphrodite knows just the guy to call and summons her son Eros to make Psyche fall in love with something gross. Eros scoots down to the mortal world to do the thing, but when he sees the beautiful Psyche, he's startled by her gorgeousness and accidentally stabs himself with one of his arrows. Way to go, smart guy. But meanwhile, back in the mortal world, Psyche is, we recall part 2 of her characterization, very, very lonely. See, she's beautiful, but in a way that people worship from afar. She wants to be loved, but she's just too beautiful for this sinful world. And it's really starting to get on her nerves. So she goes to the oracle and asks her if she'll ever find true love, and the oracle responds that she will, but she'll fall in love with a terrible monster that even the gods fear. So Psyche is taken to a big scary cliff and left there so her monster boyfriend can find her, and Zephyr, the west wind, carries her off to her monster boyfriend's gorgeous and luxuriant palace. Man, Greece has way classier monsters than we do. Anyway, turns out her monster boyfriend is invisible, and he tells her that she'll be totally safe and provided for by his many invisible servants, but she can never see him, not even when they do the sex thing. So Psyche's totally chill with living in luxury with her invisible monster boyfriend, but one day she's paid a visit by her 2 sisters, who are jealous of her living situation and convince her to find out the identity of her monster boyfriend, and if he really is a monster, to kill him before he kills her and her unborn child. So that night, Psyche sneaks into her monster boyfriend's room with a lantern to see him and a dagger to maybe murder him with. But as soon as the light touches him, she sees that her invisible monster boyfriend is actually a very visible, super hot boyfriend, none other than Eros himself. Surprised by his gorgeousness, Psyche, say it with me now, accidentally stabs herself with one of Eros's arrows. Damn, that's hard to say. And is now double in love with him. But the lamp boy also thinks Eros is super cute and a little bit tries to get closer to Senpai and ends up splashing on him. That's not hyperbole, the book actually says that. Not the senpai part, but you know. So Eros wakes up because ow, and flies off because betrayal, leaving Psyche alone and regretting her life choices. Eros flies back to Aphrodite to nurse his minor burn and feel sorry for himself, and Aphrodite, now like twice as mad at Psyche, scoots over at her and tells her that if she wants her boyfriend back, she needs to accomplish 4 tasks for her. So Psyche agrees, and after Aphrodite slaps her around for a minute to make herself feel better, she gives Psyche her first task. She throws a mixed assortment of grains on the ground and tells Psyche she has 1 day to sort them all by type. This is obviously some BS, but Psyche is basically an archetypal Disney princess, so while she's sitting there pondering the BS-itude of her current situation, a nearby nest of ants take pity on her and sort the grains for her. So obviously Aphrodite's pissed that Psyche managed to do the thing, so she makes the next task even more problematic and tells her to go get some golden fleece from the sun sheep that live across the river. While Psyche's busily trying to drown herself, a local spirit tells her that the sheep will kill her if she's not careful, so rather than try and rip a chunk of their fleece off, she should just gather fleece that got caught on the nearby thorn bushes. So she does, and Aphrodite gets even more pissed. So she tells Psyche to take this goblet and go get some water from the river Styx, which is a problem because there's a cliff face and several dragons in the way. But this time, Zeus himself helps her out and sends down an eagle to beat up the dragons and bring her the water. So last but not least, Aphrodite gives up on the subtlety and literally orders Psyche to go to hell. Specifically, to bring a fancy box to the underworld, take a little bit of Persephone's beauty, and put it in the box, and then bring it back and give it to Aphrodite. By the way, at this point Eros is all better and has long since forgiven Psyche for the whole betrayal of trust thing, but Aphrodite is having none of that and keeps him confined to her palace while she tries to do the vengeance thing. So again, with help from various household objects and noted landmarks, Psyche makes her way to the underworld and gives the box to Persephone, who does something to it and then gives it back. So Psyche leaves the underworld with the box, but then it occurs to her that if the box has pure beauty in it, and she's about to go see her boyfriend again, she might as well use the magic beauty box to freshen up a little. Unfortunately, as soon as she opens the box, it turns out the only thing in it was murder. So Psyche low-key dies, but Eros escapes Aphrodite's palace while his mom is distracted and flies to Psyche, casually fixes the whole dead thing, and flies up to Olympus with Psyche to be properly married. Zeus is cool with it, tells Aphrodite to back off, and gives Psyche some ambrosia, which makes her into an immortal goddess. She and Eros are married as equals, and when their kid is eventually born, they name her Hedone, which roughly translates to joy.
Oh man, memories. You know, this is the first myth video that really popped off in the algorithm, and that, in turn, kicked off the first real serious spike in channel growth, which hit like a truck back in 2017. No idea why, the algorithm just kinda does that sometimes, but this video going so wild is what turned my college hobby side project into a viable job, and nobody was more surprised by that than me. This channel has been so many different things for me since I started it back in December of 2012. It's always been an outlet for something. It gave me the tools to unpack and analyze the books I was struggling to get through in high school, and then again in college, and then it turned into a way for me to share these fun stories I grew up with while I explored more deeper study of what made them work in the first place. And then it branched out into a space where I could unpack the individual building blocks of these stories I liked and compare and contrast the execution and the impact and figure out why they did what they did and how it worked or it didn't. But through all these iterations, it took me a long time to zero in on what I was actually driving at, and like a lot of things, it was really obvious in hindsight. It's all storytelling. Always has been. And wouldn't you know it, they have gods for that too. If you have a creative person in your life, or are a creative person in your life, or spend any amount of time on the internet watching the artists and writers toil away in the posting mines to someday fulfill the dream of affording hamburger, you are definitely more than familiar with the epic highs and lows of the artistic process. Creativity is one of life's great can't-do-it-on commands, and creative inspiration frequently strikes like a bolt out of heaven and far more frequently does not do that. I've seen the creative process described as being possessed by an idea you are constantly arguing with, and boy if that don't sum it up nicely. An artist can hone their craft over years and years of practice and refinement and grueling, rigorous training, but on some level they'll always be at the mercy of inspiration, and that is the one part of the creative process that no artist has figured out how to control. In my personal experience, nobody feels or acts more like the plaything of a cold, uncaring god than an artist wrestling art block. It's an unpredictable roller coaster that drags the hapless bard from the epic highs of I am a shining golden god and the master of making sense to the dismal lows of I will surely never have another good idea in my life, and then right back
back again 3 days later. So it's not too surprising that in many mythological models of the universe, this unpredictable and fickle ingredient in the lives of so many is the domain of an unpredictable and fickle deity, or in some cases, several deities. So today let's talk about the ancient Greek gods of inspiration, the 9 Muses. Now, not to name names, but some mythologies have a habit of playing pretty fast and loose with their use of simple numbers. When they say something like, there's this many of this thing, sometimes they're lying. But thankfully, when it comes to the Greek Muses, this is not the case. Kind of. More on that later. Basically, every piece of ancient Greek literature agrees that there are 9 muses, and as far back as Hesiod's Theogony, which is one of the earliest ancient Greek sources we have access to, we get a solid list of them, names and all, and there are, in fact, exactly 9. Not only that, but Hesiod doesn't just slap him into the family tree. As a card-carrying bard type, Hesiod talks about the muses a lot, from a pretty personal standpoint. The entire framing sequence of the Theogony is that Hesiod was minding his own business, shepherding sheep on the slopes of Mount Helicon, when the muses rocked up and divinely ordained him to lay out the whole cosmological family tree in vivid and comprehensive detail. Not too surprisingly, ancient Greek poets evidently had a lot of reverence for the muses, and while the muses don't really feature as characters very often, they get woven into narrative framings quite a lot, with the Iliad famously starting with a prayer to the muses asking them to play that one about Achilles making his bad day everyone else's problem. When it comes to the casting of these myths, the muses aren't usually the talent, they're the directors behind the camera. There are a couple minor exceptions, one of which comes up very early in the timeline in Homer's Iliad, where the muses get to star in a classic tale of hubris gone wrong. Thamris the Thracian is a talented musician favored by the muses, but one day he brags that he could outperform the muses themselves in a contest of the arts, and in response they smite him divinely and take away his performing ability and also his eyes, in case he didn't get the message the first time. Anyway, Hesiod's Theogony doesn't just invoke the muses, it also lists them in a nice numbered fashion, which is such a rare treat for me that we're just gonna go down the list. I don't get to indulge this very often, alright? Let me have this one. Hesiod lays out that the muses are the daughters of Zeus and the Titaness Mnemosyne, the goddess of memory, and he starts off his list with the boss of the muses, Calliope, which means beautiful-voiced. She's generally seen as the inspirer of epic poetry and has the distinction of being basically the only muse with a consistent mythological presence. She's always listed as the mother of Orpheus, and while she doesn't really show up in his story, it's thematically pretty clear that she's why his music is so overwhelmingly magical. Hesiod distinguishes Calliope from her sisters in one more key way. Calliope is the muse delegated to inspire kings. If Zeus approves of a king and thinks he'll make a good leader, the muses grant him the power of rhetoric and make him real good at public speaking and stuff. This feels like a bit of a correlation-causation fallacy, but I love the vibes on this one. When it comes to the many sides of showbiz, politics somehow manages to be even more unforgivingly carnivorous than Hollywood. Now after this, Hesiod basically just lists the muses by name, and the names all have pretty blatant literal translations, but the idea that they're each in charge of specific domains of individual slices of creativity are kind of a later development. It's clear from their naming conventions that they were already thematically subdividing the creative inspirational process, but the ancient Greek writers that talked about them mostly just referred to them as a unit. So while we do have a nice numbered list, and I'm gonna say what every muse is classically considered to be in charge of, because otherwise what is the point of doing it as a numbered list, it's important to note that this sort of hard world building around them seems to have been a retroactive thing. Anyway, next up, Clio's name means to recount or to celebrate, and appropriately enough, she's generally framed as the muse of history, and she also gets a minor credit in a myth. Way down in the 2nd century CE, Pseudo-Apollodorus' Bibliotheca says that Clio made fun of Aphrodite for her love affair with Adonis, and Aphrodite love-beamed her in revenge to make her fall for this king Pyrrhus. Things happen, and the end result is Clio and Pyrrhus' son, Hyacinthus, who would go on to date Apollo and then die about it. Talk about not learning from history. Next on the list is Euterpe, whose name just means delight, which is pretty unspecific, but she mostly gets featured in a musical context and is sometimes credited as the inventor of the double flute. In the Bibliotheca, again, she's also listed as the mother of King Rhesus, whose primary claim to fame is getting his horses stolen by Odysseus and Diomedes in the Metal Gear chapter of the Iliad. Next on the list is Thalia, whose name means the joyous or the flourishing, and she is unsurprisingly the muse of comedy, while her sister Melpomene is the muse of tragedy. The Bibliotheca gives more details and says that Thalia, by way of Apollo, is the mother of the Corybantes, which were a Phrygian cult of Cybele worshippers, while Melpomene is credited as the mother of the Sirens. Of course, not every ancient Greek source agrees with the Bibliotheca, so the parentage gets a little fluid. Terpsichore, whose name means delight and dancing, is the muse of dance and the chorus, exactly what it says on the box. Terpsichore is also a very good example of that flexible parentage thing, since she also gets credited as the mother of Rhesus and the Sirens by a few different authors. We're starting to see the effects of the muses basically always functioning as a matched set. It's easy to start mixing them up. Erato, whose name is a spoiler, is the muse of erotic poetry, and apparently also mimicry. I don't see the connection, please do not explain it to me, and as a pretty handy illustration of that thing I said about the muses not having concrete themes themes, she's the muse Virgil specifically invokes when he kicks off the second half of the Aeneid, which, to be frank, isn't the steamiest bit of poetry around. So that tells us even by Virgil's Roman times, the muses hadn't been pigeonholed. Polyhymnia, whose name means many praises, is the muse of hymns and sacred poetry. And finally, rounding out the cast, we have Urania, the muse of astronomy. She's usually portrayed holding a globe and sometimes gets her role expanded to be the full-on goddess of the heavens themselves. Gotta be honest, I personally wouldn't classify astronomy as an art form. Maybe I should. Maybe the world would be a better, more whimsical place if I did. And that's the list of 9 muses. Man, that was quick. I don't know how the clickbait channels do it. That was definitely not enough time for a mid-roll ad. But there's really not much else to say about them like that. The muses just don't really show up in many myths. They have a name that usually literally means what they represent, they have a favorite accessory they're usually visually portrayed with, and that's kind of it. If we wanted to flesh them out further, we would need to start writing fanfiction. There's just not many stories there. And that might be because the set of myths we have access to are a pretty small slice of the full corpus of ancient Greek literature that used to exist, since there's a heavy element of randomness in what curds of history make it through the cheesecloth of time into the present day. But the muses were so widespread and so universally worshipped, at least according to all the storytellers, who I cannot imagine being biased in this regard, that I think it's legitimately noteworthy that they very rarely take any sort of starring role. And that kind of brings up an interesting thing about the muses specifically. When it comes to the Greek gods, sometimes it feels like the myths we have about them make it easy to forget that they're gods. They played a complicated role in society beyond just having fun stories about them. And I'm not saying this is a bad thing. I love those fun stories. Unpacking them or goofing on them is a lot of good fun times for me. But this is an angle of approach that works when we have those stories to work on. We can focus on the hijinks and shenanigans and the Zeus putting his wiener where it doesn't belong and not really think about what depth these stories might have had for people steeped in a cultural context that we're 2,500 years late to understand. The myths kind of provide this buffer around that idea. It gives us something to focus on and be goofy about. The muses don't really have those fun stories. Instead, they have poets talking about them like the way modern artists talk about creative inspiration. It's a much more present, personal kind of thing, and the conversation about them is often very candid about the fact that the muses aren't characters in a story with a canon, they're components of a living religion, which is basically the same thing as saying they're parts in a constantly developing working model of the universe. And this conversation really starts to get interesting after the Romans show up. Around 45 BCE, Cicero wrote a philosophical dialogue called On the Nature of the Gods, where, in classic philosophical dialogue fashion, Cicero gave several characters philosophical stances and had them argue with each other for 3 whole books. One of the characters is an academic skeptic whose position is basically, the gods are ridiculous stories that don't make sense if you think about them, and when he's listing his evidence, he mentions some interesting things about the muses. The first relevant claim he makes is that some people say there were 3 Jupiters, who we remember the Romans used as a syncretized synonym for Zeus. So he says the first Jupiter was born in Arcadia as the offspring of Ether, aka Chaos, and was the father of Bacchus and Proserpine, aka Dionysus and Persephone. Jupiter number 2 was also born in Arcadia, but this one was the kid of Calus, aka Uranus, and the father of Minerva, aka Athena. Ugh, dealing with the Romans always gives me a headache. Anyway, the dialogue continues that Jupiter number 3 is the son of Saturn, aka Kronos, born on the Isle of Crete. Then, having laid out his multi-Jupiter hypothesis, he gets to the muses, starting off with the claim that the second Jupiter had the first group of muses as his daughters. First group? What do you mean first group? Yup, he says there were originally 4 muses, and gives them the names, oh boy, Thalciope, Aeide, Arche, and Meleti. And then he says after that, Jupiter number 3 got with Mnemosyne and produced the 9 muses we already know about. This is a baffling conversational flashbang to drop, and he's not even done, because for good measure he says some poets claim there's another set of 9 muses, with the same names as the second set, obviously, otherwise it would get confusing, who he lists as the daughters of Pyrrhus and Antiope. And I know what you're thinking, but no, this is apparently not the same Pyrrhus that Clio had that fling with. Second, unrelated Pyrrhus. And if you just can't get enough of the guy, don't worry, there's more where that came from. Now, this is very convoluted, probably intentionally. Cicero wrote this barely 2 years before he got assassinated, and doesn't seem to have done any copy editing before he bit the big one, and as a kicker, when he interjects a little author's note at the end of the spiel, the dude firing off these hot takes is not the dude he says he personally agrees with. But this is already a really interesting framing, even from the potentially cartoonishly exaggerated perspective of the enlightened skeptic. The fact that the number and grouping of the muses was the subject of active debate is neat. It was pretty clear that the Romans were aware that the ancient muse worshippers had not always worshipped the same set of muses that they were familiar with. A very similar framing turns up in Plutarch's Questiones Conviviales, written somewhere in the 1st century CE. This is also framed as a philosophical argument between a diverse set of characters, but it's additionally framed as a big question and answer challenge, where the characters pose brain teasers to one another and try to unravel them to everyone's satisfaction. The muses get referenced off and on, getting petitioned to make their performances good, and broadly functioning as one expects deities of creativity in the arts to work. But question 14 is specifically about the muses and kicks off a really interesting conversation. Basically, all the participants in the dialogue start arguing with each other over which of them gets which muses. The rhetorician makes the claim that while certain haters will tell you that Calliope only keeps the company of kings, real ones know that rhetoric is a very Renaissance skill that every muse wants a piece of. A discussion breaks out over why there are specifically 9 muses and why 9 is such a nice number in general. One of them pipes up that it's common knowledge that in ancient times there were only 3 muses, but, and this is not a joke, citing his sources on that would bring down the party vibes, so he won't. Honestly, fucking power move. I wish they could put that on Wikipedia. Citing my sources would make me a narc. Anyway, this idea comes up in the conversation that initially there were only 3 major fields of study that the muses were in charge of, but as the arts and sciences advanced and were subdivided, the domains of those original 3 muses were also split into 3s, and the speaker proposes that an initial trifecta of philosophy, rhetoric, and math was subdivided into 3 smaller trifectas. Philosophy gets split into logic, ethics, and physics, rhetoric gets demonstrative, deliberative, and judicial subtypes, and math gets split into the 3 genders of music, arithmetic, and geometry. Ta-da! Everything important is broken into 9 clean parts and everybody gets a muse, except for the large crowd of poets and doctors and astronomers who immediately kick up an enormous fuss about having their designated muses confiscated by this asshole of a paradigm. And of course, the one farmer in the bunch tries to explain how he should still get Thalia because when you think about it, crops growing is a little bit like comedy. The conversation goes in more weird directions. Other possible muse classifications are proposed, including one that puts the 3 muses in charge of the entire universe in a series of basically concentric spheres, with one called Hypati in charge of the fixed stars, one called Mezi in charge of the planets, and one called Niti in charge of everything under the moon. After a few more fascinating hypothetical cosmological models, the narrator eventually puts forth his own opinion on the muses. Letting all the heavenly stuff be the domain of Urania, he basically proposes the idea that the other 8 muses don't belong to specific professions, but instead have a role in absolutely everybody's lives, providing rules and regulations and a guiding system to help Joe every Roman live a healthy and well-balanced life. It's not like only comedians ever experience the joy that Thalia is in charge of, and it's not like only kings need to use those good leadership qualities that Calliope doles out. The narrator of this dialogue basically suggests that the muses exist to regulate and essentially civilize those natural universal parts of life. Oddly, the breakdown of the muses' role in this model doesn't super line up with their traditional artistic inspiration domains unless you really squint, and this is pretty late in the timeline for the muses to not have their quote-unquote classical roles locked in, but the concept is there. According to this slice of the dialogue, Calliope helps with logical reasoning, Clio inspires nobility and lofty aspirations, Polyhymnia guides people to seek out and retain knowledge, Euterpe inspires curiosity and speculation into the workings of the natural world, Thalia regulates physical hunger and transforms it from a simple animalistic desire for food into a regulated, civilized social ritual, Erato tempers wild lust into the concept of orderly marriage, and Terpsichore and Melpomene work together to temper the excess out of exceptionally beautiful sights and sounds, so they're only very pleasant and not enchantingly overwhelming. In this model, the muses are present in literally every aspect of life, not just for the poets or the astronomers. It's a very elegant model, and Urania is the only muse left unaccounted for in the daily life of Joe every Roman because she's much too busy handling all of space. And the vibes of this dialogue carry pretty smoothly into the 2nd century CE, where Pausanias' descriptions of Greece also brings up the sheer scope of the worship of the muses, going so far as to say that basically every temple he's visited in his travels has had the muses represented in them, usually backing up a major deity like Apollo. He also references the apparent common knowledge that before the 9 muses, there used to be a set of 3 muses worshipped in certain regions, listing them with some of the same names Cicero did, along with an explanation of their meanings. Meleti, meaning practice, Nemi, meaning memory, and Id, meaning song. He credits some random Macedonian named Pyrrhus, that's right, it's this fucking guy again, with popularizing the 9 muses model, and goes so far as to say that some people speculate Pyrrhus himself had 9 daughters with the names commonly ascribed to the 9 9 muses. This is basically what Cicero had his enlightened skeptic saying on the nature of the gods, so that lines up pretty well. There used to be 3, or maybe 4, now there's 9, and some dude named Pyrrhus and his 9 daughters were involved at some point. And following this thread, Pyrrhus and his daughters turn up in another one of our old standbys, Ovid's Metamorphoses from right around the aughts CE. In a framing device of a conversation between Athena and the muse Oronea, she recounts a story where the king Pyrrhus had 9 daughters, who, in another classic display of mortal hubris, falsely compared themselves to the muses and challenged them to a contest of performance. One of the girls told the story of Typhon in a goofy and ridiculous manner that made the gods sound like fools. I wouldn't know anything about what that's like. While on the muses' side, Calliope recounted the tale of Demeter's search for Persephone after her abduction to the underworld, and the compromise that led to the division of the seasons. The nymphs judging the contest found Calliope's performance much more compelling and awarded the victory to the muses, which did not sit well with Pyrrhus's daughters, and instead of gracefully taking the L, they kicked up a big fuss about it, to which the muses responded by turning them into magpies. And honestly, this is almost a relief. This is such a classic formula for Greek god misadventures. Someone slights the gods turn them into something nasty. I went so far into the research process before I found a story the muses actually participated in. I was almost worried we had another Hestia on our hands. In the space of Greek mythology, some of the gods seem so universally revered on such a personal level that they don't get stories told about them. They're more like natural laws than characters. Researching this made me start pondering a question I've never given much thought to before. Why do these myths exist? Why are these stories told about some gods and not others? Why were these primordial forces of nature embodied as the stars of their own little goofy sitcoms where the god of the horrors of war gets stuffed in a jar for a year, or the guide of dead souls steals a herd of cattle by putting their hooves on backwards? And there are a lot of explanations that get proposed. Oh, the myths exist to explain things in the natural world, like why that mountain is there, or why the stars are that shape. They get told as allegories to explain the social and political order, like why that city is where it is, and why the king's godly heritage means he deserves to be in charge. This simple explanation really likes proposing the idea that stories get told because the world must be explained. And tempting as they are, I've learned to be very suspicious of a simple explanation. I don't think there's any one reason stories get told, and I think the sheer universality of the muses is proof of that. The one consistent through line through the texts we've unpacked here is that the muses are confounding. What is their role? What's their place in the natural order? Do they guide the hearts and reason of humanity, or do they turn the heavens themselves? How many of them are there? What's the point of them? Who gets them and why? Even by Roman times, the muses aren't locked into their classical domains. That farmer in the Questiones Convivalis says Thalia should be the muse of farmers, and that doesn't make any sense from a muse of comedy standpoint, but it does make sense if we go back to the literal meaning of her name. Flourishing. Only Uranea's role as the muse of astronomy is even halfway consistent, and even then, is she the god of those who study the stars, or is she the god that moves the stars themselves? The Orphic hymn to the Muses, written sometime between the 3rd century BCE and the 2nd century CE, so a pretty wide spread on that one, described the Muses not as gods of the arts, but as gods of knowledge and truth. Their domain is framed as teaching humanity divine knowledge, inspiring with truth and guiding away from error. If the Muses are gods of storytelling, then this angle suggests that the purpose of storytelling is to reveal truth. Storytelling is how we make sense of both the world around us and the world inside us and turn it into something we can share. It's a foundational pillar of communication, of society and history. It introduces causality and pattern recognition into what was originally just a big pile of things that happened. Of course, gods of artistic inspiration and creation feel universal, filling every aspect of life from the literal heavens down to the farmer's fields. They haven't yet invented a thing that can't be thought about, can't be talked about, can't have art made out of it. What's the difference between being a god of telling stories and being a god that moves the heavens themselves? Both of those things still need to be turned into stories before we can understand them. The arts become the largest, most universal domain by default. Every myth we have belongs to the muses. No wonder they feel more godly than the rest. They can't be contained by their own framing device. Inspiration isn't just about making creative brain go burr. Its oldest meaning is divine guidance, being breathed into a mortal from an unseen and unknowable source. We've circled back to the foundational truth that inspiration can't be fully understood or controlled. Why are these stories told about the gods? Why do we tell the stories we tell? Why do the ideas that we get come into our heads the way that they do? I don't know. Maybe the muses will tell me if I ask real nice. It's fitting that the ancient Greeks gave names and faces to the arts, because I've always thought of stories as basically living things. To retell a story is to spawn a new generation, one that inherits some traits of its parent narrative but expresses them in a different way. Lineages of folktales can be geographically traced across the world, followed as they were told and changed and adapted to new environments. A local folk figure gets picked up and carried to new frontiers and becomes a hero, becomes a legend, becomes a god. A bedtime story becomes the groundwork for a saga. Stories live and grow, but
Like the gods, stories are also immortal. As long as they're cultivated in collective memory and told over and over again, stories and gods can endure forever. And they also reinforce each other. From a certain perspective, the gods are fuel for the stories of the mythology. Their strong personalities and symbolic meaning feed the myth's conflict and characterization and pathos, and in turn the myths sustain the gods, reinforcing their presence in the lives of the everyday ancient Greeks. The gods took form in the world through the stories shared by Homer and Hesiod and the Athenians and the Achaeans overall, brought down from the heights of Olympus into the human everyday, carried by the stories that humans shared. Greek mythology is one of the first spaces of stories that I was exposed to, and I think part of what's always fascinated me about it is that these tales of gods and heroes are the ancestors of so many stories we're much more familiar with now. But unlike biological ancestors, stories don't naturally die of old age. We have these ancestral stories here, now, today. With a little translation or a few years of language study, they can be directly compared with their cousins and descendants. We can hold up Eros and Psyche next to Beauty and the Beast and East of the Sun, West of the Moon and see them resonate with each other. And by unpacking and understanding these foundational stories that so many writers have internalized and reimagined and retold, we can start to see how their traits are manifested in the new stories that are branching out of the family tree. I love tracing a theme or a motif or a trope through a chain of different stories and seeing all the different ways it can be expressed. I've been doing it for a while now, and I really hope I get to keep doing it for another while yet.
Face with their